What led Nazis to use gas chambers in order to conduct one of the most brutal genocidal campaigns in human history? There's no lighthearted way to approach this shockingly gruesome and tragic historical event, so let's get right to it. Here's how Nazi gas chambers actually worked. In 1939, trouble was brewing in Europe. Adolf Hitler had by now become a full-fledged dictator, and the Nazi Party ruled Germany with an iron fist. Being a raging anti-Semite backed by other raging anti-Semites, Hitler had succeeded in convincing a fair amount of people that the Jewish population of Germany, and Europe at large, was to blame for most of society's ills. Of course, there were other groups Hitler wished to be rid of as well. Besides his political adversaries, he believed Roma, homosexual people, and the mentally or physically disabled, just to name a few, had no right to exist in German society. The Nazis wanted to capture and eventually exterminate these people. This meant that they were searching for the most efficient methods with which to do so. Enter the euthanasia program in 1939, a program of mass murder targeting institutionalized patients that was far from euthanasia as anything we can imagine. According to Webster's, euthanasia is the painless killing of a patient suffering from an incurable and painful disease or an irreversible coma. Though it is still a highly contentious practice illegal in many countries, euthanasia requires either the consent of a mentally able patient approaching the end of their life or a medical professional's assessment that a patient's comatose state is irreversible. What the Nazi Party did instead was a trial run for murder on a mass scale. Calling the start of their genocide a euthanasia program was one of the many ways in which they attempted to cover unthinkably evil actions with misleading euphemisms and language. Nazis believed those who were severely physically, mentally, or neurologically disabled were a financial burden on the German state, a genetic burden on German society, and should be eliminated. And because the Nazis were truly trying their hardest to ensure an express ticket to hell, they started this elimination with the mass murder of children. Hitler's private chancellery director, Philipp Buhler, and his attending physician, Karl Brandt, hatched an initial plan for what would become the euthanasia program in the spring of 1939. On August 18, 1939, the Reich Ministry of the Interior decreed that all medical professionals were to report any infants under the age of 3 who showed signs of physical or mental disabilities to the state. A couple of months later, parents were encouraged to admit their disabled children to special pediatric clinics in Germany and Austria. The reality, as anyone who has read World War II history can imagine, was light years from what the parents were told. The special pediatric clinics were in fact killing centers. Staff hired specifically for this purpose would murder the children in their custody, either by starvation or lethal overdose. As time went on, older and older children were admitted to these centers. At least 10,000 disabled German children were murdered through the euthanasia program, though the true numbers are likely higher and may never be known. However, the methods of killing disabled children, we hate that that sentence exists in the world, were time and energy consuming, according to the sociopaths spearheading the extermination. And they were about to extend their cruelty to adult patients as well, under the guise of a T4 campaign, meaning a rapid increase in the amount of people targeted for murder. This led to the first use of gassing for mass murder. The Nazi Party quickly established 6 gassing centers throughout the country: Bernburg, Brandenburg, Grafeneck, Hadamar, Hartheim, and Sonnenstein, though they clearly weren't called gassing centers in the press. Questionnaires were distributed to the hospitals, with patients filling in information about their health issues. Special emphasis was placed on any effect the conditions had on the patient's ability to work. Anyone considered unable to fully participate in the labor force was transported to these camps and killed. The first camps used pure carbon monoxide gas. As in most killing camps, the gas chambers were disguised as showers, so patients wouldn't know the fate that awaited them. The bodies of their victims were then burned in adjacent crematoria, and ashes were placed in urns at random in order to be delivered to their family members. Physicians and administrators hired by the Nazis would list fictional, most often natural causes of death on any death certificate sent to the surviving family. Though the Nazi Party tried to hide the reality of what was happening in these gas chambers, it quickly became an open secret to the German public. Protests took place throughout Germany, and several members of the German clergy spoke out against the practice. Due to public pressure, Hitler very temporarily, halted the euthanasia program in August of 1941, but it was too late. Between January 1940 and August 1941, approximately 70,723 institutionalized patients had been gassed. For the Nazis, the program had been a success. They'd found a brutal and grotesquely efficient killing method they would perfect and use throughout the course of the Holocaust and World War II, the gas chambers. And unbeknownst to most of the world at large, they were already employing this method elsewhere. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units of the SS or Schutzstaffel, were tasked with the mass shooting of civilians. As the invasion continued, members of the Einsatzgruppen complained that shooting so many women and children was causing them mental anguish and fatigue. In order to make the jobs of the Einsatzgruppen soldiers easier, the Nazi command gave them gas vans, which had occasionally been previously used in the invasion in Poland, but not systematically. These vans were vacuum-sealed trucks, where the engine exhaust in the form of carbon dioxide could be diverted and pumped into the van's interior. This method quickly suffocated the people the Einsatzgruppen soldiers locked inside. The use of gas vans, thanks to the fact that they were both an efficient and cost-saving method of mass murder, quickly became widespread, with civilian communities on the front lines. However, at some point in 1941, the SS decided that in order to achieve the final solution, the horrible euphemism given to the Nazi Party's decision to exterminate all Jewish people on the continent, larger and more efficient gassing methods would need to be implemented. The SS had already started sending Jewish people and Roma to killing centers such as Chelmno, where they were rounded up and killed in the aforementioned gas vans. To accelerate the genocide of the Jewish population, stationary gas chambers were now built into the extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in Poland. By 1942, these gas chambers were fully operational. Carbon monoxide gas was still the poison of choice, pumped into the chambers by diesel engines. Victims were often told to pack in tightly with arms raised in order to fit in more people to the chamber and accelerate their suffocation by carbon monoxide. The final and deadliest of many attempted methods would be used at the most infamous and destructive extermination camp of all, Auschwitz. To improve the efficiency of their killings, the SS had started experiments with other toxins for suffocation, including Zyklon B. The chemical came in the form of amethyst blue pellets and was originally used for fumigation of pests. The Nazis realized that when the pellets came into contact with the air, they became exceptionally lethal gas, known as hydrocyanic or prussic acid. After conducting an experiment in September 1941 by gassing 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 256 prisoners, they concluded that Zyklon B killed people more rapidly than any toxins the SS had experimented with before. Thus, Zyklon B was chosen for use in Auschwitz. The killing machine that was the Auschwitz death camp worked frighteningly well. Members of the SS would march people chosen for death to the gas chambers. Anyone disabled or too weak to walk would be transported in trucks. Initially, only Crematorium 1 was used, though by 1943, captured people were being escorted to Crematoria 2, 3, 4, and 5. Jewish people, Roma, and other victims would be ordered to disrobe, either in wooden barracks, an antechamber, or outside, depending on how many people were being transported to Auschwitz that day and how crowded the camp was. The SS soldiers kept up the charade of the chambers being showers, where the prisoners had to bathe and disinfect themselves before entering camp. Afterwards, men, women, and children were locked into the chamber as the large door of the entrance was sealed off. A masked soldier would then open a vent on the roof to pour Zyklon B pellets into the chamber. He would then immediately close the vent to seal off the gas chamber completely. The victims, who were packed in tightly to begin with, had no way out, as the gas from the Zyklon B pellets filled the air and inevitably their lungs. They would quickly, usually in a matter of a few minutes, suffocate and die. After the soldiers outside believed everyone to be dead, the toxic air was pumped out of the chamber for approximately 15 minutes. During the biggest mass deportations to Auschwitz in the years of 1943 and 44, the Nazi-operated gas chambers, with the use of Zyklon B, killed an average of 6,000 Jewish people and others per day. Some Jewish people who were deported to the camp were made members of the Sonderkommando. Though they avoided being killed right away, the enslaved Jewish members of the Sonderkommando underwent another kind of hell. The Nazis had observed the mental toll close contact with dead bodies had taken on the German soldiers unloading the gas vans after the victims had been murdered. To avoid their soldiers being negatively affected by such sights as much as possible, the Nazis forcibly tasked a group of Jewish prisoners with entering the gas chambers after each gassing. The Sonderkommando members were made to pry apart the dead bodies using poles and hose down the gas chambers. They were also forced to burn the bodies of their fellow murdered Jewish brothers and sisters, collect any gold fillings or jewelry they came across, as well as women's hair, and throw the ashes of the victims into a nearby river. If any bones hadn't burned down completely, the men of the Sonderkommando had to grind them down and also throw them in the river or in a landfill. One of the Sonderkommando members, a Greek Jew and former resident of Thessaloniki by the name of Marcel Nanjari, wrote down a very accurate description of what took place in Auschwitz, a gruesome reality the Nazi Party tried to hide from the eyes of the world. Nanjari describes the gas chamber facilities as such. The crematorium is a big building with a wide chimney and 15 ovens. Under a garden, there are two enormous cellars. One is where people undress and the other is the death chamber. People enter it naked, and once about 3,000 are inside, it's locked and they are gassed. After 6 or 11 minutes of suffering, they die. Due to his forcible conscription to the Sonderkommando, Najari had to escort victims to the chambers and saw many groups enter and die. He knew exactly what the gas chambers were. However, the Nazis, in order to keep up the ruse that the chambers were showers to potential victims, even went so far as to install pipes and fake shower heads into the room. In fact, the Nazi plan to hide the atrocities being committed at Auschwitz extended to almost every aspect of the gas chambers, including the hidden delivery of the Zyklon B itself in hermetically sealed canisters. As Najari writes, the gas canisters were always delivered in a German Red Cross vehicle with 2 SS men. They then dropped the gas through the openings, and half an hour later, our work began. We dragged the bodies of those innocent women and children to the lift, which took them to the ovens. Najari wrote 13 pages of letters detailing the horrors of Auschwitz, which he stuffed into a sealed thermos flask and buried near one of the crematoriums. Miraculously, Najari would survive Auschwitz, though many of his fellow Sonderkommando members didn't. At one point, Najari describes a revolt of the Sonderkommando who attempted to blow up the crematoria at Auschwitz using gunpowder stolen from Nazi soldiers. The revolt failed and all participating members were executed. Gas chambers led to the death of millions of Jewish victims, Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, and others in Auschwitz and many extermination camps. Though accurate numbers may be nearly impossible to collect, historians estimate that approximately 6 million Jewish people and 5 million others were killed during the Holocaust, the vast majority of those in gas chambers. Though this was not one of our easier videos, we hope it was an informative one, because it's important to remember even the darkest parts of our history. It's a warm, sunny day in August 1944. Hans Eppinger is sitting in his office jotting down some notes in a well-worn book. He pushes his spectacles further up the bridge of his nose, exhales, and puts down his pen. Just a few feet away are a group of emaciated Romani people. They are his subjects, his human guinea pigs. Some of them are already close to death, so dehydrated that they're on all fours licking water that was just used to mop the floor. Suddenly, the door to their hut opens. In walks Eppinger. Pointing with his finger, he says, "You, and you, come with me. They won't be seen again." That was the seawater torture experiment we just talked about, and as you'll see today, it was just one of many infinitely appalling experiments that happened in those camps. Number 5. Thirst. Let's finish that story we just started. Eppinger was an Austrian physicist whose name, among many others, is written in the annals of human depravity. He was employed by the Nazis during the Second World War to conduct odious experiments on human beings at the Dachau concentration camp. Eppinger used mainly Romani people, a nomadic group sometimes referred to as gypsies, a term they don't like. Back in the war, about 90 of them were chosen for the water experiments. These weren't exactly technical. The Nazis wanted to know what would happen if you deprived someone of food and drinking water and they had to survive on seawater. How long would it take to die? What would happen during the passage of death? In the war, this could happen to one of their pilots. We know the answer thanks to a survivor of those camps named Joseph Schofing. He watched the experiments with his own eyes, saying later the victims were so desperate they licked the floor and sucked on damp rags. The outcome was the people usually died. Prudence demanded that Schofing kept his mouth shut about this, with him not even showing sympathy to the victims when any German soldiers were around. He also pretended not to see anything. He later noted that he'd seen another worker in the camp take too much interest in an experiment, and for that, he was sent straight to the gas chamber. The experiment was related to how humans deal with extreme low pressure. Number 4. The Doctor of Death. The low-pressure experiments were conducted by a man often called a monster. This was Sigmund Rascher, an SS Doctor of Death, whose depravity seemed to know no limits. He'd been a pilot in the Luftwaffe, and that made him think about the effect of high altitude on pilots. The problem was, as he wrote in a letter to Nazi SS boss Heinrich Himmler, it wasn't exactly easy to get people to sign up for experiments. He wrote that he'd already tried using monkeys, but that didn't go down too well. He needed humans, he told Himmler, stating that the experiments would likely end their life. "No problem," replied Himmler. Humans he got, and during the spring and summer of 1942, he rounded up a bunch of prisoners at Dachau camp. One by one, he told them to enter a pressure chamber. Once they were in, Rascher played around with the pressure, making it so low that it corresponded with being at a very high altitude. He would then quickly change the pressure in an attempt to see what it might be like for a German pilot parachuting from a plane without any oxygen. According to reports, the people used in these experiments were mostly Poles and Russians. Some of them died and some of them survived. When Rascher told Himmler about this, the boss said if they survived, then spare them the gas chamber, just give them life in prison. Rascher then quickly wrote back reminding Himmler who these people were. Some of those letters survived the war. Here's part of one Rascher wrote to Himmler in April 1942. "Only continuous experiments at altitudes higher than 10.5 kilometers resulted resulted in death. These experiments showed that breathing stopped after about 30 minutes, while in 2 cases the electrocardiographically charted action of the heart continued for another 20 minutes. He said after 4 minutes the people started to wiggle and move their head around. A minute later they would cramp up in various parts of their body. Then their breathing would become rapid, and at around 10 minutes they lost consciousness. At around the 30-minute mark, the subjects would only be taking about 3 slow breaths per minute. Death came soon after. He wrote this in May of the same year. After relative recuperation from such a parachute descending test that had taken place, however, before regaining consciousness, some experimental subjects were kept underwater until they died. You can see just how little concern these people had for human life. But it gets even worse. Rascher, likely following the orders of Luftwaffe Chief Surgeon Erich Hipke, experimented on people just to see how cold you could make them. These were called the freezing experiments. They wanted to know what would happen if a German pilot survived his fall from the sky and landed in the freezing cold ocean. How best to warm someone up who had hypothermia. In a world not eclipsed by evil, you couldn't conduct such an experiment on humans. Rascher used people from the Dachau camp, this time putting prisoners in a tank of freezing cold water for up to 3 hours. Others he made stay outside in the cold weather while they were naked. Throughout their ordeal, they were monitored to see the effects of cold on the human body. One experiment was called warming up after freezing to the danger point. In a letter shown at the Nuremberg trials, Himmler gives his approval of the warming up experiments, signing off "Kind greetings, Heil Hitler." The victims were almost frozen to death and then they were warmed up. But we're not talking about being given a blanket and a steaming cup of tea. They were immersed in hot water, sometimes boiling water. This was of course a massive shock to the system, and some people subsequently died. Warming up by water was not a good way to treat people suffering from hypothermia, was the conclusion. So Himmler told Rascher to go and ask fishermen who worked in the cold North Sea what they would do. Himmler reportedly said that a fisherwoman could take her half-frozen husband into bed and revive him in that manner. After that, Romani people were frozen half to death and then placed in between 2 warm Romani women. They had to be naked, of course. The victims were monitored throughout, and if they died, autopsies were performed. You can see the actual reports. They state if a person is immersed in water at 5 degrees Celsius, it can usually be tolerated for an hour. When they raised the temperature to 15, the victim could tolerate the water for 4 to 5 hours. The reports also state that even after the people were taken out of the water, their temperature would continue to drop. They often died soon after, even when revival attempts were made. We now know about such things as rewarming shock and the after-drop effect, and we know you should not warm a hypothermic person up using warm water, but back then the science wasn't up to speed. The reports state that people whose body temperatures were reduced to 25 degrees Celsius and then warmed up to 28 degrees Celsius died. No number was written down as to how many died. One report just said they all died. They usually died anywhere between 53 and 106 minutes of cooling, but then those were the water experiments only. During the trials, 2 people who said they witnessed these experiments said 80 to 90% died. They said they saw only 2 people actually get through the experiment, but noted that they became mental cases as a result. Finally, the same doctor conducted what was called the blood coagulation experiments. Basically, the Nazis wanted to know if you took a pill made from beet and apple pectin, would the blood clot after being shot, therefore possibly saving the life of a soldier. Again, in a normal world, you could never conduct this experiment on humans, but the Nazis simply used victims of the camps. They shot them and gave them the drug. What's even worse is sometimes they amputated people's limbs. This was an attempt to try and duplicate a person losing a limb on the battlefield due to a bomb. They made it as real as possible, removing limbs sometimes without giving the victim any kind of anesthetic. After that, they got the blood-clotting drug. In his notes, Rascher wrote, "The tests of this medicine showed no failures under most varied circumstances." This got back to Hitler himself, who was impressed with the experiment. As for what happened to the dead, it was later revealed that Rascher had a thing for human skin, using it to make handbags, gloves, slippers, saddles, pants, and other items. He sometimes sold these things to his colleagues, according to the book Medicine, Ethics, and the Third Reich. Since those reports were released to the world, scientists have said that Rascher lied in them, and there were many contradictions and inaccuracies. The Nazis also realized he lied at times. Rascher was arrested in 1944 on the order of Himmler after it was revealed he'd kidnapped 3 children. He was accused of scientific fraud and even murdering his assistant. He ended up being a prisoner himself at Dachau, and then in 1945 he was executed by firing squad. Okay, now for something very short but extremely terrifying. Number 3. Head injury. This account of one single experiment was told by a Holocaust survivor named Martin Small, who wrote that one day he and another prisoner were working at the house of a Nazi doctor named Dr. Wickman. He said the doctor took off somewhere, so he did some looking around and at one point found himself looking into a locked room by a window outside the house. In his own words, he said, "I placed my hands on the ledge and put my face to the window. I was not prepared for what was inside, and at first sight, I could not find words to interpret what I was looking at. I put my hand to my mouth as if trying to muffle my own outburst. I nearly vomited. 60 years later, I still cannot erase the vivid, terrible image." Okay, so what was he looking at? He described seeing a young boy strapped to a chair. Above him was a mechanized hammer that struck the boy over the head every few seconds. It wasn't hard enough to break the skull, but you can only imagine what it must have felt like after, say, an hour, a day, 2 days, more. The guy said the boy was already driven mad, not dead, but not there either. He said the same doctor had actually saved him from being killed by another Nazi, so he was surprised he was torturing a little boy in the worst kind of way. I dropped to my knees in sickness and disgust, and I trembled, he wrote. It's hard to imagine a human doing that to another human, but of course you're about to hear something even worse. Sorry, that's just the way it's gonna be with this show. Number 2. Surgery. Surgery. It's an important thing during a time when many men are being shot to pieces on the battlefield. The best surgeons practice, of course, but who do you practice on besides victims on your own side? The answer for the Nazis was prisoners at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Without any anesthesia at all, people had their bones removed, their nerves pulled out, their muscles plundered, all in the name of medical experimentation. The Nazis had 2 reasons for this. Firstly, they wanted to know if you remove something, how does it regenerate, if at all? Secondly, they were interested in seeing how transplants worked. They didn't seem to give a damn about making people disabled and putting them through what must have been the worst kind of pain. Just imagine being tied down and having parts of you removed. That happened to a woman 2 times, and she survived to tell the story. Her name was Jadwiga Kaminska, and she said she was a young girl and she was sent into surgery, and they did something to her that led to crippling pain. She didn't exactly know what they did, but said after she was grievously injured and suffered from infections. It's hard to say how many people were mutilated like this, but research shows there was a lot of victims trying to claim compensation after the war. There were photos too, such as the one of a Polish woman named Bogawila Babinska-Drobowska. She had a bit of her leg removed. The National Institutes of Health wrote that in all there were 27,759 known victims, made up of many nationalities, with about twice as many male victims as female victims. The people suffered all manner of injuries and many died. Reports state that some of the victims were called rabbits by the Nazis given the nature of the experiments. Some were cut deeply so it could be seen how quickly infections ensued. Sometimes the Nazis would rub dirt, cloth fibers, wood shavings, and even broken glass into the open wound. This was to accelerate the speed of infection. The victims were then given experimental drugs to see if the infection could be dealt with. The NIH wrote they operated on Barbara Petersik 5 times in 1942 alone, causing left lower limb paralysis. At 16 years of age, she was the youngest of the rabbits. In another account, Nazi Professor Gebhardt used 24 Polish women for an experiment. He wanted to see what would happen if you cut the blood flow off in a limb, and so he just tied something really tight around a part of their limb. The result, of course, was the area became necrotic. Experimental drugs were subsequently administered to the women. Nazi reports that were unearthed said in one experiment 13 people died from gangrene, while 6 others were taken out and shot so they could never tell anyone about what had happened to them. There's data to back all this up, so as unbelievable as it sounds, it happened. There are names and photographs of survivors. Another NIH report stated the surviving victims were permanently disabled both physically and psychologically. 4 of the surviving Polish women, Maria Broel-Plater, Jadwiga Dzido, Władysława Karolewska, and Maria Kuszmerczuk, testified during the doctor's trial and exhibited the scars on their legs. Then there was Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. He was partly responsible for bone graft experiments using the tibias of victims. In some cases, the tibia would be harvested and then transplanted to another victim who also had their tibia removed. During those same experiments, they did something called myomectomy. That's removing the skeletal muscle, and as you know, nerves were also taken out. Again, there are names and survivors and photographs. One such person was named Władysława Karolewska. She went through 6 separate surgeries, each involving the removal of bone, muscles, and nerves. She testified later describing how people were slaughtered and how she was experimented on. This is what she said happened to her after she passed out from pain. I regained my consciousness in the morning, and then I noticed that my leg was in a cast from the ankle up to the knee, and I felt a very strong pain in this leg and the high temperature. I noticed also that my leg was swollen from the toes up to the groin. The pain was increasing and the temperature too, and the next day I noticed some liquid was flowing from my leg. One day, she and other rabbits stood in line to be executed. A German officer asked her, "Why do you stand so in line as if you were to be executed?" She replied, "The operations are worse for us than executions, and we would prefer to be executed rather than to be operated on again." She explained in her testimony what had happened after the final operation. "I stayed in the hospital 6 months. I was in bed. I could not stretch my legs. I could not move them. I could not walk either." A doctor named Fisher later admitted to taking off entire limbs, saying he was just following orders. He wrote of one limb removal, "I was ordered to go to Ravensbrück and perform the operation of removal on that evening. I asked Doctors Gebhardt and Schultz to describe exactly the technique which they wished me to follow." In a sworn affidavit, a Czech doctor named Dr. Zdenka Nedvědova-Niedla wrote, "High amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blades or legs were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick injection of Evipan. That's a kind of barbiturate that can kill in high doses." She said 11 people died or were killed during these operations, and she also stated that pain relievers weren't administered to the victims. "We know this because," she wrote, "after operations, no one except SS unless nurses were admitted to the persons operated on. Whole nights they lay without any assistance, and it was not permitted to administer sedatives even against the most intensive post-operational pains. Okay, so this is a really depressing show, but you all know the expression that history is doomed to repeat itself if we don't study it. We need to know the facts. You need to know that the Nazis purposely gave people malaria. They tested mustard gas on prisoners. They gave tetanus to others, and they conducted many awful experiments to see how people could be sterilized. They even poisoned people to the point of death or actual death, and they burned people to see how bomb blasts work out for victims. But even after hearing all that, there's one thing that sticks out. Number 1. Twins. These were called the twin experiments. The Nazis were obsessed with twins, and so they captured about 1,500 sets and imprisoned them at Auschwitz. About 200 of them survived, so that's how we know what happened. They separated them so they could monitor what happened to each twin without them knowing the same was happening to their sibling. Again, they did ad hoc surgeries on them, even trying to change their eye color using dyes. This was mostly the work of doctors Josef Mengele and Karen Magnuson. The latter made it clear how she thought, writing this in 1943. This war is not just about the preservation of the German people, but it's about the question which races and peoples should live on in the future on European soil. The Jew who enjoys life as a host in our country is our enemy, even if he does not actively engage with weapons in this fight. But why change the eye color, which was very painful, by the way? The reason was just to see if they could. One survivor said Mengele looked at her mother and saw what he said were perfect Aryan features and blue eyes, but her eyes were brown, which didn't impress the doctor. His thoughts? Try and change them. Survivor Jonah Locks said she saw Mengele remove one twin's organs without giving him any anesthetic. Others said he sometimes just killed twins by giving them injections to the heart. Mengele was obsessed with what he might have called pure blood, and so he was obsessed with twins and genetic inheritance. After all, the Nazis wanted to create a super race, partly and wrongly based on Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Superman. He even forced people to have sex to see what the child might look like if indeed one was born as a result of the forced encounter. A survivor later said he did this with a male dwarf and a Romani woman. Listen to this from a Jewish doctor who was a prisoner himself but had to work with Mengele. His name was Miklos Niesli. He said he worked on many experiments. Sometimes they just killed twins at the same time just to see if the autopsy revealed they were similar on the inside. He wrote, in Auschwitz camp, there are several hundred pairs of twins, and their deaths in turn present several hundred opportunities. One twin who survived was Eva Moses Kor. She wrote that Mengele tried to make boys into girls and vice versa. In her own words, she said he wanted to discover a way to change girls into boys and boys into girls. Many of these details I learned 40 years later, such as the twin teenage boys who had some of their private parts cut off in Mengele's quest to see if he could turn them into girls. She also said that when kids died in the camp, the doctor became very angry, but it wasn't because he was concerned for people's welfare. She wrote these deaths meant the loss of valuable guinea pigs for his medical experiments. But perhaps the worst thing, sometimes that sounds like a disgusting horror movie, was his experiment related to sewing people together. Yeah, you heard that right. Joseph Mengele tried to attach twins together in an attempt to make them conjoined. He used Romani children for this. It sounds so outrageous you could understand people thinking it's not true, but again, there's evidence. Although not much in this case. We have at least one piece of evidence, and again, it's from the twin Eva Moses Kor. We'll let her tell you in her own words what she saw. A set of gypsy twins was brought back from Mengele's lab after they were sewn back to back. Mengele had attempted to create a Siamese twin by connecting blood vessels and organs. The twins screamed day and night until gangrene set in, and after 3 days they died. During World War II, the horrors that occurred at the concentration camps such as Auschwitz shocked the world, and continue to be a tragic historical lesson in man's inhumanity to man. However, Auschwitz was part of a much more complex and widespread system of concentration camps that, if anything, even more thoroughly demonstrated the Nazis' appalling lack of humanity, based on their deep disdain for other races, religions, and classes of people. Today, we'll take a thorough look at SS concentration camps, because history must be examined thoroughly to never again be repeated. We know it's a hard video, so pull up your favorite puppy photos if you need a short break, and let's dive into this somber topic. One of the first camps the Nazis built way back in 1933 was Dachau. It became a blueprint for the concentration camp system in general, which grew rapidly after the SS, the Schutzstaffel, under Heinrich Himmler consolidated control over the whole system in 1934. The Reich approved funding for the camps from their official budget in 1935, which secured the future and development of the camps until the end of World War II in 1945. Known as concentration camps, these buildings were not at first explicitly constructed to kill prisoners, but rather to incarcerate them all in a designated area. However, the brutal, degrading realities of these camps meant a shocking amount of prisoners, millions, died while being held there. In fact, many prisoners died even before arriving. Most were transported on trains over a period of days or weeks and packed so tightly that there was rarely room to even sit down. Food and water were scarce, bathrooms non-existent, and the trains arrived at concentration camps with plenty of dead bodies alongside those who had survived. What was the process of entering a concentration camp like? And what was daily life like? Prisoners would be separated into men, then women and children, and given a prison number. Most people are familiar with the infamous numbered tattoos given to Auschwitz inmates, but in most camps this number was sewn into prisoners' clothes, a striped uniform they were forced to wear after all their belongings had been taken. Before being assigned to their barracks and work details, prisoners were undressed in full view of everyone to humiliate them. Their heads were shaved, and they were forced to shower in front of all the other prisoners and the SS guards, who would hurl verbal and physical abuse at them. The whole process was designed to strip the prisoners of any sense of identity or human dignity, to depersonalize them completely and break their spirit, as the Nazis already viewed them as less than human. Though daily routines obviously varied from camp to camp, the general schedule seems to have been as follows. Prisoners would be forced to wake up between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. and had approximately 30 minutes to use the bathroom, get dressed, eat, clean their space, and make their beds. Guards would punish anyone who was too slow to finish this grueling morning routine. Considering the bathrooms at concentration camps would usually be shared by up to 2,000 prisoners, it was pretty much a no-win situation for those incarcerated, and an excuse for guards to abuse their fellow human beings. After the morning tasks were completed, the guards would shuttle the prisoners outside to perform a roll call, often in incredibly harsh weather conditions. We're talking about the northern parts of Central Europe after all. A roll call would also be performed in the evening. Almost always, some prisoners would miss roll call because they died in their sleep, or from overwork, dehydration, starvation, or a general failure of sanitation throughout the day. The bodies of these prisoners were simply brought out to count them alongside their still-breathing fellow inmates. The prisoners faced beatings and various tortures by the guards anytime they collapsed, failed to respond, or honestly, anytime the guards felt like it. After the morning call, prisoners set off on foot to work details. Even on this march, the SS officer would find ways to additionally degrade the prisoners, often forcing them to sing songs, insulting themselves or fellow inmates. And once again, anyone who failed to keep up with the march to work was brutally beaten and tortured. If you're beginning to get the idea that SS officers were often monsters who just like having excuses to beat and torture people, you're correct. Perhaps now would be a good time to close your eyes and picture a koala bear or a kitten and lower your blood pressure. The day ended at around 5 or 6 p.m., and after evening roll call, which would sometimes purposefully be dragged out to exhaust them, the prisoners were sent to their barracks so they could enjoy their free time, an incredibly generous way to describe passing out from exhaustion or bartering for additional food to avoid starvation. Finally, at 9 p.m., it was lights out to prepare for another grueling, miserable day. These conditions led to 1 million people dying in concentration camps alone, while the Nazis were in power. So, who was being put into these concentration camps? Originally, in 1933, the camps held political prisoners, mostly communists who the Nazis deemed enemies of their ideology. From 1934 onwards, the camps also started to hold asocials. This was not a term for people who preferred to read a good book rather than go out on weekends, but instead a polite term for anyone the Nazi Party deemed undesirable in society. You might not be surprised to learn that this covered a pretty large group of people. Asocials included members of the LGBTQ+ community, prostitutes, homeless people, Roma, and the work shy. This last term didn't necessarily mean unemployed people, but anyone the Nazis deemed as not conforming to social norms regarding work type and ethic. Shortly after, in 1935, Jehovah's Witnesses and pacifists were also given one-way tickets to concentration camps for refusing to fight in the Nazi army. In 1937, apparently running out of people to arrest for the crime of being themselves, the Nazis decided to add criminals to their list. Not those currently committing felonies. Oh no. Himmler and his goons loved arresting anyone who had criminal convictions in the past, to round them up and send them off to the concentration camps. Just one of the many raids he conducted resulted in 2,000 people arrested in a single day. In 1938, Jewish people were rounded up en masse after years of intense suppression and persecution under the Nazi regime. In fact, intense is definitely an understatement. Between 1933 and 38, at least 400 anti-Semitic laws were passed in Germany, whose politicians couldn't seem to get enough of them. One of these laws, the Reich Citizenship Law, declared that only Aryans, aka non-Jewish white people for the most part, would be classed as citizens of the Reich. We could delve into the discredited genetic theories that led to Hitler using the term Aryan, originally referring to prehistoric people of ancient Iran and northern India, to describe some of the palest people on the planet. But the choice can be best summarized by saying that Hitler's ideas about race were not only outright false, but also incredibly stupid. Thankfully, no one clings to such ridiculous racist nonsense today. However, under this citizenship law, the Nazis ended up classifying a whole lot of people as Jewish, who had never even considered themselves as such. Even if a German citizen was born and raised Christian and had one Jewish grandparent, even one who had converted in their lifetime to Christianity, they would be viewed as Jewish. This would be like classifying every drunk person on St. Patrick's Day drinking green beer as ethnically Irish. In 1938, two major events intensified the roundup of Jewish people: Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, and Kristallnacht, a horrifying night in which Jewish businesses were destroyed, and the SS, with the assistance of some German citizens, physically attacked and humiliated Jewish men, women, and children in the streets. Just in the first week after Kristallnacht, over 25,000 men were sent to concentration camps such as Buchenwald and Dachau. Sensing that things were going from bad to worse to terrifying, many Jewish people tried to leave Germany. But as few countries increased their refugee quotas, only around 120,000 Jewish people made it out before the outbreak of World War II. In the camps, the SS officers established a system of badges, usually triangles under the prisoner's assigned number on their uniform, to identify the prisoners as belonging to separate groups. We assume this was so the officers in the camp would know exactly what kind of verbal abuse and slurs to throw at each prisoner. Jewish prisoners were given two yellow triangles that formed the Star of David. Roma were identified by brown triangles. Homosexual people had pink triangles. Jehovah's Witnesses had purple triangles, political prisoners had red triangles, and general asocials had black triangles. As the number of prisoners in concentration camps skyrocketed, Hitler was well aware that he also had to prepare for war. Thus, the construction of forced labor camps accelerated swiftly from 1937 onward. Though concentration camp inmates were also made to perform manual labor, forced labor camps were specifically started to help the German war effort. As German men signed up for or were drafted into the army, Germany faced big labor shortages. After Germany kicked off World War II with the invasion of Poland, and especially after the invasion of Russia, the use of forced labor to keep the economy afloat intensified rapidly. However, the invasions of European countries, especially Poland and Russia, also meant that the Germans had whole new populations of people to incarcerate and exploit in these camps. They named the forced labor camp prisoners Ostarbeiter, Eastern workers, and Fremdarbeiter, foreign workers. Even though the Nazis needed forced labor to keep the war effort going, they viewed the prisoners as totally replaceable, and therefore completely neglected their health. Conditions at these camps were squalid as those in concentration camps. Because of the strenuous work and long hours involved, death rates at forced labor camps were tragically high. All in all, up until the end of the war, over 14 million people had been forced to work in these camps. After the start of the war in 1939, two new categories of camps were created: prisoner of war camps and transit camps. While foreign nationals were sent to forced labor camps or concentration camps if they were Jewish, homosexual, Roma, or many other things, foreign soldiers and officers were held in POW camps. Not that they had much better conditions than any other concentration camps, though Geneva Convention rules had been in effect since 1929, and Germany was a signatory. The Nazis cared little about upholding standards for humane treatment of prisoners of war. Most of the inmates were given few supplies for survival, and many were forced to perform manual labor as well. However, the Nazis were especially harsh on the Soviet and Polish inmates. In the messed-up racial ideology of the Nazis, Polish people were viewed as racially inferior, and Soviet citizens were enemies due to their communist beliefs, or just the simple fact that they lived in a communist state. The Nazis captured 5.7 million Soviet soldiers during the course of the war. By the end of the war, around 3 million of these prisoners would die. The other camps that were built during the war were transit camps. These were established in European countries the Nazis invaded to hold prisoners temporarily before they could be transported to concentration camps. See, when Nazis invaded a country, they would carry their rampant racism and ethnic cleansing with them. This meant that locals of the country who fell outside the Nazi standards were rounded up and subjected to the same policies German minorities had put up with. Depressingly, some transit camps were run by local authorities or equally racist local groups collaborating with the SS who were imprisoning their own people. The last type of concentration camp built during the war is the most infamous and horrific: the extermination camps. The first was Kulmenau, in which genocidal operations started in December 1941. These camps were built to implement Hitler's final solution, aka the ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people, Roma, and other minorities he detested. The 6 main extermination camps were Auschwitz, Kulmenau, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Treblinka. Many of those transported to the camps would be killed almost immediately in gas chambers. Those who weren't killed on arrival were forced to work in the camp, either sorting out prisoners' belongings, performing manual labor, or doing administrative work for the camp. Over 3 million people were murdered in extermination camps. This, of course, doesn't even come close to covering the horrifying scale of genocide and mass murder the Nazis engaged in. Over 6 million Jewish people were killed during the Holocaust, with over 2 million being killed via shooting operations, raids in Jewish ghettos, and gas wagons. Between 250,000 and 500 Roma were also killed, around 1.8 million Polish civilians, and 7 million Soviet civilians as well. The Nazi system of concentration camps was the end result of years of discrimination, oppression, racism, and systemic violence against the groups of people they hated. The deliberate dehumanization of prisoners in order to enable the Nazis' genocide of fellow human beings resulted in one of the most horrific tragedies of the 21st century. However, we must always learn about and understand the worst that mankind has been capable of in history in order to make sure we never head down that path again. A young girl, Eva, looks up at the doctor. He's furious today, stamping his feet and shouting, which makes many of the youngsters cry. He's angry because 2 of his kids, his prisoners, died before he had a chance to work on them. He needed all the guinea pigs he could get. Eva has seen things she can hardly comprehend. Soon, she'll witness something that will sear her mind until she's an elderly woman. That is the doctor's attempt to make conjoined twins. Her name was Eva Moses Kor, and she was one of the survivors. A twin herself, she and her sister were experimented on at Auschwitz concentration camp. 2 of her other sisters, as well as her parents, died in the gas chamber. The Nazi doctor was Josef Mengele, a man who would become known as the Angel of Death. We'll tell you a little bit about him before we get to the experiments. As you'll see throughout this video, he was something of a shapeshifter. During his student days, he was into music and the arts. He was studious, he was bright. He also developed increasingly nationalistic beliefs as he got older, in line with traditional values characterized by the Volkisch movement. In short, he was racist. That racism would define his entire life. The bright young chap went on to study medicine, showing a particular interest in human genetics and physical anthropology. In case you didn't know, the latter is related to the development of humans through evolutionary history. You can already see how this man began to embrace the Nazi ideology of a superior race. In 1937, he joined the Nazi Party and later became part of the SS, a paramilitary organization which in German was called the Schutzstaffel. He served in the armed forces for a while after the outbreak of the war, later joining the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. This division was tasked with safeguarding the racial purity of those in the SS. His responsibilities there were to ensure genetic health and also administer genetic health tests. The Nazi Party did not want its own procreating with people it deemed impure. Wives and fiancés of SS members were investigated to ensure this didn't happen. Mengele firmly believed in genetic superiority. He embraced the study of eugenics, which, if you're not familiar with it, relates to the attempt to create a healthier future generation by condoning selective interbreeding with people who have certain genetic characteristics. The doctor believed he could further his study of genetics by experimenting with humans. All he needed were test subjects, and those he got when he was made chief physician at Auschwitz concentration camp in 1943. When he got there, masses of people had already died in the gas chambers. Around 75% of them were those deemed unfit to work. They were mainly women, children, frail, and the elderly. Part of Mengele's job was to select which people went to the gas chamber and which people didn't. The vast majority of the 960,000 Jews that were sent there went to the gas chamber, as did the majority of the Roma and ethnic Poles and the Soviet prisoners of war. Many not immediately slaughtered were forced to work. They were also experimented on along with the children. Part of Mengele's job was treating sick inmates and Nazi personnel, doing what doctors generally do. He was more than just a demented Nazi archcriminal. One historian wrote, Mengele's outsized reputation as a medical monster is inverse proportion to what is known and understood about what he actually did. There's no question that inmates endured horrendous tortures and often died when they were experimented on. They were subjected to deadly air pressure, they were left out in the freezing cold and dangerously heated up. Women had their muscles and nerves removed. Children had limbs removed. People were deliberately given deadly blood infections. All manner of indescribable things happened to them. This was at the hands of many different people, but it's Mengele's name that has stood the test of time. This is mainly down to his experiments on children and his obsession with twins. To us, he was a beast, but he believed he was riding on the cutting edge of medical science. The camp gave him the opportunity to do what he thought were great things, albeit with the parameters of depraved Nazi ideology. In his own words, after the war, he said he didn't invent the camps, he just worked in them. His son even said he couldn't help anyone. On the platform, for instance, what was he to do when the half-dead and infected people arrived? But get this, his son also said the twins owe their lives to him. He did choose twins for his experiments, which may have saved them from the gas chamber. It's now understood that he founded a kindergarten and played violin for the kids there. That's one reason he was sometimes called Uncle by the kids. They couldn't have known about medical experimentation at the beginning. A former inmate doctor later said he could be playful, jumping about to please them. The twin children frequently called him Uncle Peppy. This is what another inmate doctor once said about him. He was capable of being so kind to the children, to have them become fond of him, to bring them sugar, to think of small details in their daily lives, and to do things we would genuinely admire. And then, next to that, the crematoria smoke, and these children tomorrow or in a half hour, he's gonna send them there. Mengele didn't work alone, far from it. When kids' hearts were injected with chloroform, or when children were purposefully infected with disease, or even when young ones had their eyes injected with dye, he was part of a team, sometimes working under the auspices of Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. It would be a mistake to blame him for all the atrocities committed in the name of medical science, but when it comes to experimenting on twins, that was certainly his very own sphere. But why twins, you might think? No one's exactly sure, but it's thought that Mengele was interested in learning a few things. He believed twins might teach him more about the inheritance of genes. He was also interested in how twins reacted individually to specific experiments. It's thought the overarching reason for the experiments was simply the Nazis' view that there was a superior race. Some people have said Mengele wanted to understand if there was a possibility of giving what the Nazis thought were racially superior couples more of a chance of having superior twins. Around 200 pairs of twins survived from as many as 15,000 pairs. Others died when their hearts were injected with phenol so they could subsequently be dissected. Survivor Jonah Lax said Mengele removed organs from people without anesthetic, and if one twin died, the other would be murdered. The reason for that was the doctor wanted to know not only how they compared in life, but what happened to each of their bodies after they died. At one point, according to the testimony of an inmate assistant, he killed 14 twins in one night. The testimony read, he injected the Evapan into her right arm intravenously. After the child had fallen asleep, he felt for the left ventricle of the heart and injected 10 cc's of chloroform. He said the twin twitched and died soon after. All 14 went the same way that night. In another case, Mengele took 2 gypsy twins aged 7 and studied them. They had problems in their joints, which he said was tuberculosis. The radiologist didn't agree. Enraged, Mengele took the twins into another room. When he returned, he said to the radiologist, "You're right, there was nothing." He shot them both and dissected them. Prior to that, the twins arguably had the best life of any prisoner at Auschwitz. Not that that was saying much. Those twins had been favorites of Mengele. As one man later said, they were spoiled in all respects, and they fascinated him considerably. Some kids were able to play soccer, and even most were well fed compared to the other prisoners in the camp. Some of them got to keep their own clothes as well as the hair on their heads. One twin survivor later said he felt completely elevated, segregated from the hurly-burly of the camp. These reports conflict with others, though. For instance, twins Ephraim and Menashe Reichenberg said they were transported in a packed train. And when the train stopped, they heard the call Zwillinge raus, twins out. They were told to stay in a certain line, and they would stay alive. At the camp, they were stripped, shaved, disinfected, and given prisoner uniforms with the numbers B10506 and B10507. They said there were about 1,000 kids at the time, mostly twins and dwarfs. The boys had noticeably different voices. This piqued the interest of Dr. Mengele. Their necks were injected with an unknown substance in one experiment, which led to swelling, high fever, muteness, and a state of exhaustion for several days. Menashe died as a result of the experiments in 1946, after he was freed from the camp. Ephraim later moved to Israel after returning to Budapest to discover all his family was dead. He became a bus driver. Life was okay, but because of the experiments, he had a continual breathing and swallowing problem, which led him to not being able to talk at all. In later life, he told his devastating story through an artificial voice amplifier. All the children were subject cases more than they were humans. Identical twins were always being measured and analyzed. For hours at a time, they had to sit through various procedures, including having material inserted into their spines and spinal taps. This is what Jonah Lax said when she saw that it was her first time to be experimented on in Mengele's lab. "I was looking at the whole wall of human eyes. A wall of blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes. Those eyes were staring at me like a collection of butterflies, and I fell down on the floor." Mengele was obsessed with inheritance of eye color. Lark said she was given injections in her back, but she never knew why. She and many other twins were also injected with the gangrenous condition Noma, after which making some kids very sick killed them. Eva Moses Kaur said she witnessed young boys who had their sex organs removed. She later said she believed it was Mengele's attempt to change the sex of boys. She also said this: "A set of gypsy twins was brought back from Mengele's Mengele's lab after they were sewn back to back. Mengele had attempted to create a Siamese twin by connecting blood vessels and organs. The twins screamed day and night until gangrene set in, and after 3 days they died. No one is going to doubt that the twins were horrifically experimented on in those camps, and some of them died, often in agony. But an article published in 2020 by the New York Times asserts that there is as much fact as there is fiction when it comes to Mengele. Here's a snippet from that article. Given his alleged omnipotence, grotesque and untrue accusations that Mengele had attempted to create Siamese twins by sewing together a pair of twins, or that he had attempted to make boys into girls and vice versa, were circulated. That same newspaper back in 1985 told a story that involved Mengele shooting a mother and a child when the mother refused to be separated from him. Mengele was reportedly so mad he had a change of mind and sent all the people he'd previously chosen to survive to be sent to the gas chamber. That certainly sounds like someone capable of other horrors. But were some of the stories exaggerated? Here's another account from Eva Moses Kaur. One of the twins, who is 19 years old, told of experiments involving a set of teenage boys and teenage girls. Cross-transfusions were carried out in attempts to make boys into girls and girls into boys. Some of the boys were castrated. Transfusion reactions were similarly studied in the adolescent twins. In 1992, the U.S. Department of Justice released a lengthy report on Mengele, alleging he had done such terrible things and a lot more we haven't discussed today. The report states an exchange of blood was repeatedly made between the individual twins of a pair, adding that some twins died as a result. We could find no mention of experiments involving sewing twins together. A survivor and camp warden named Vera Alexander can maybe fill in some gaps. She once said of the doctor every day Mengele came, and every day he brought some toys, sweets, chocolates, and new clothes. She also said she witnessed how Mengele had impregnated one twin with the sperm of another twin. He pampered her, and he was there at the birth. Alexander said when he saw only one baby and not twins, he threw the baby in the incinerator and just walked away. Part of Alexander's job was taking care of 50 sets of Romani twins. This is what she said she saw one day about one particular pair of twins. Mengele took them away. When they returned, they were in a terrible state. They had been sewn together back to back, like Siamese twins. Their wounds were infected and oozing pus. They screamed day and night. Then their parents, I remember the mother's name was Stella, managed to get some morphine, and they killed their children in order to end their suffering. There was also this account from Eva Kaur. A set of gypsy twins was brought back from Mengele's lab after they were sewn back to back. Mengele had attempted to create a Siamese twin by connecting blood vessels and organs. She said they screamed day and night until gangrene killed them. These are the only two accounts we can find which talk about Mengele trying to make conjoined twins. The experiments are perhaps the very nadir of what the doctor did. Nonetheless, details about them are very scant. We found more testimony from the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, a man noted as being a significant influence behind the final solution to the Jewish question. In the testimony, Vera Alexander is asked about Mengele and what experiment she saw him conduct. She tells the judge she saw only one. He asks her what that was, and she replies, "There was a set of twins, gypsies, whom he took away one day from the block where I was. That was the Zigeunerlager, the gypsy camp. Some days later, he returned them with veins in their arms and their backs sewn together." The judge then says he doesn't quite understand. Alexander simply says again he sewed them. The judge asks if they were turned into Siamese twins, to which Alexander said he sewed their arms together. They were already full of pus and full of wounds. She said she didn't know what happened to them since she was transferred to the women's camp after that. Since the accounts don't include many details, we're not sure what really happened to those twins behind closed doors. We also can't be sure what Mengele had intended to discover from the experiments. What we are sure about is those experiments were never going to result in conjoined twins that survived any length of time. Mengele, for all his faults, was a trained professional. He must have known that. Mice have been sewn together in modern labs, but even that often leads to the death of the animals after their immune systems went into hyperdrive. The process is called parabiosis, which Mengele would have heard about because it's been around since the 1800s. He also knew the outcome of doing it on humans. It was likely not of any concern to him. He had the expendable human resources at hand to experiment. Mengele managed to escape trial. Unlike many other leading Nazis after the war, despite being a wanted man, he lived out his life in South America. His son Rolf visited him in Sao Paulo in 1977, the first time he'd seen his father in over 20 years. He told Rolf he was unrepentant, stating that he'd never personally hurt anyone and only followed orders. His diary and some of his letters were later found. In one letter he wrote, "Brazil is a nice country to live in despite the mixing of races, but there are many people who, like me, believe and are sympathetic to the Nazi movement and racial ideology." In another he wrote, "Weaker humans should not be permitted to reproduce. This is the only way for humankind to exist and sustain itself." In yet more of his writing he claimed, "If the inferior morons are not eradicated from society, society will destroy itself." In 1979 he had a stroke in a swimming pool and drowned. His personal history might have been somewhat embellished over time, but more than 100 people he experimented on testified in 1985 about what they had experienced at Auschwitz. Here's Here's a snippet from one man's testimony, which sounds quite different from how Mengele felt about what he did during the war. Dr. Mengele pulled me out of a queue as we were on the way from the Sea Lager camp to the gas chamber. I was the only one picked out that day, personally by Mengele and his assistant. They took me to his laboratory where I met other children. They were screaming from pain. I was injected with drugs and chemicals. My body most of the time was connected to tubes which inserted some drugs into my body. Even if his monstrousness has been overemphasized at times, there can be little doubt that he was a sadistic ideologue, foremost a racist, also a narcissist and a murderer, and above all human, all too human. World War II was a time of terror that brought out the worst in many. Yet even in the darkest, most desperate times, people joined together to fight against the wicked in positions of authority, even when the consequence they would face was often certain death. Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler are two such men who fought for what was right, even when all of the odds were stacked against them. They wanted to save others from execution, but first, they'd have to escape from the Nazis' camp they were imprisoned in. They knew that if they were caught, they'd be executed, because they were trying to escape from a Nazi death camp. Today, you can say the word Auschwitz and pretty much everyone will know exactly what you're talking about. The concentration camp in Europe, the biggest of those used by Hitler and the Nazis during World War II. A sight of unspeakable horror. The unsuspecting Jewish population from surrounding areas was systematically brought to Auschwitz in the cattle cars of trains. Here in the death camp, they were murdered in gas chambers by the thousands upon thousands. As the Nazis expanded their territory over the war, so too did the concentration camp's operation to accommodate the further influx of victims. It's estimated that in 1944, up to 12,000 Jewish people were killed at Auschwitz every day. These were men, women, and children, husbands and wives and sons and daughters, all surrounded by barbed wire and Nazi guards and killed mercilessly and without hesitation. Those who made a run for it but failed were publicly executed. Many people entered Auschwitz. Few would leave alive. What's hard to grasp now is that even as late as 1944, many of the details of what went on in the concentration camps weren't well or widely known by the outside world. In fact, massacres carried out in concentration camps were kept secret from almost everyone except those who directly participated in them. Much of the world had no idea just how evil Hitler's final solution was. As Jewish prisoners, though, Verba and Wetzler knew exactly what was happening. They had watched as innocent Czechs were brutally and systematically slaughtered right in front of them. Then came the rumors that the Nazis wanted to start exterminating Jewish Hungarians. Verba and Wetzler vowed to prevent this. They believed that it was their duty to spread the word of the mass killing and to stop the Nazis' genocidal plans. They wanted to warn people, the people boarding the trains to Auschwitz, who often had no idea what awaited them inside the barbed wire fencing. But how would they be able to escape and tell the world what they knew? They searched the camp for a point of weakness and explored plan after plan. Unfortunately, none of them seemed even remotely likely to succeed. Until one day Wetzler told Verba of a possible way to escape based off the ideas of 4 other prisoners. Those 4 intended to hide inside a hollowed-out place in a pile of wood in an area where construction was being done on the camp, where they would wait out the 3 days that guards would be searching for them. Then, once the coast was clear, the prisoners would run toward the south and over the Slovakian border. The 4 prisoners put their plan into action. It went seamlessly and they fled Auschwitz into the country. However, they were caught in a village to the south. Still, it proved that hiding in the wood worked. Wetzler and Verba bided their time, waiting to see if the men who were captured would reveal their exit strategy and set them back to square one. In time, it became obvious that they hadn't. The stack of wood remained untouched and unnoticed. So 2 weeks later, Wetzler and Verba made their own attempt. Once inside the stack of wood, Verba scratched off a message left by the men who had used it in the escape before. The note they had etched into the wood of "kiss your you-know-what" would certainly get them executed. The scratching also helped serve as a minor distraction while waiting out the 3 days. Roll call took place at 5:30, at which time they expected to be missed and to have the guards come looking for them. They waited in the darkness, concealed completely. Then 5:30 came, and no siren went off signaling that anyone was missing. 5:45 passed, and then time ticked on further to 6. The 2 men began to fearfully consider what this could mean for them. They wondered if their location had been given up and those in charge knew exactly where they were hiding. Nervously, they waited longer as the silence continued. Then finally, much later than they had expected, the siren ripped through the night. They heard the sounds of men running and of dogs scampering on the wood piled on top of them. It was a while before it was silent again. They stayed in the wood for a full 3 days and nights without eating or drinking, growing sore from never moving. Finally, the third day was done and they heard the guards giving up on their search. Now was their chance, and they eagerly pushed on the wood. It refused to move. They frantically pushed some more and shoved on it as hard as they could. As they grew frantic, it finally gave way, and they lifted it up off them. They were free in the night, but this was only the very beginning. Over 80 miles of enemy-held territory lay before them before they could make it to their final destination. They took off and promptly got lost in a hostile area. Their plan was to cross the Beskid Mountains to the south of the camp. They ran into a village instead. Day was almost breaking before they could find their way out again, and as it grew light, they found themselves in another small inhabited area. They were out in the open without any shelter, so they were forced to turn to someone living there for help. They knocked on a door and a Polish peasant came who knew exactly who they were and what they wanted. She fed them and gave them advice on how to find the mountains they were searching for. One of her sons was in a concentration camp, and she gave the men what little money she had to spare, which amounted to only about a single British pound. She also wished them luck, which she knew they'd need more than anything. They soon found themselves walking close to Promka, a village filled with soldiers and where the men who escaped before them had been caught. Shots suddenly rang out and bullets hit all around them. They realized that they too had been spotted. The Nazis gave chase and pursued them, their dogs howling alongside them. Wetzler and Verba ran for their lives along the mountainside until they ran into a stream. Despite its freezing temperatures, they jumped into the water, hoping it would conceal their smell. In time, as the two prisoners hid in their terror in a ditch, the sounds of the search grew fainter and eventually stopped. It had been a very close call, but they had to continue on. Soon, they came face to face with another peasant. All could be lost in a minute if she chose to turn them in to the Nazis instead of helping them. They had no choice but to trust her though, as they needed directions. With their fate in her hands, she left them and promised a man would return to help them later that night. As she walked away, they waited uneasily. They had no way of knowing her true intentions. They hoped they hadn't just made a big mistake that would cost them everything. Finally, under the cover of darkness, a man appeared. He was carrying a gun and was accompanied by the same woman. The two prisoners eyed his weapon uneasily. Then the woman presented Wetzler and Verba with food and they unabashedly dug in, having hardly eaten since they left camp. They were confused when the man started laughing. He explained that judging by the way they ate, he was convinced they really were prisoners who escaped the camp and not undercover Nazis trying to test their loyalty. Wetzler and Verba followed the couple home that night. Verba had to cut his boots off as his feet had become so incredibly swollen. The man who had taken them in offered him slippers and then led the duo, including the slipper-clad Verba, right to the edge of the Slovakian border. They thanked the man for all he had done to help them, and he wished them luck and said he hoped the slippers would last for the rest of their journey. They waited until a German patrol passed before they made a run for safety. It was 2 weeks after their escape from Auschwitz before they made it to Slovakian territory. Here, a third peasant put them in contact with a well-known doctor who listened to their story and agreed to take them to the Jewish leadership of another town whom he believed would handle the matter in the best way possible. He couldn't have been more incorrect. Verba and Wetzler, who had braved 80 miles of treacherous terrain and undoubtedly risked their lives, soon found out that the message they so badly wanted to share would not be heard after all. Both men told the Jewish Council of the atrocities being committed at Auschwitz. Their goal was for the official documentation of their story that had become known as the Verba-Wetzler Report to be given to those in positions of power. In the hands of the right people, they believed the deportation and executions would be stopped. So it was sent to the Allies. Copies were given to the British, the Americans, and even the Pope. Change, however, did not come. This was for many reasons. Some copies of the report didn't make it to their intended destinations for months. There was also the problem that the head of the Hungarian Jewish underground actually failed to share the report with the right people, as he was in the process of making an agreement with the Nazis, and he believed its contents would destroy his chances. His train to freedom did end up saving 1,600 people. However, without the contents of the report being known, it also resulted in the deaths of what is suspected to be multiple hundreds of thousands. Verba and Wetzler had escaped in April of 1944. As time passed, they waited in frustration and disbelief as the weeks and months passed, and still nothing was done. It was not until June when British intelligence finally got a hold of their report. That same month, the BBC aired its contents, and days later, it made headlines in the New York Times. The world was in shock. Allied forces threatened action against those deporting Jewish Hungarians, and the Pope gave his condemnation. However, the admiral in charge of Hungary allowed deportations to continue nonetheless, having no intention of going against Hitler's wishes. It was just a coincidence that the US Air Force attacked Hungary in July, as it was not intended to specifically send the admiral a message. He took it that way though, and the trains to Auschwitz finally came to a stop. It's estimated that 300,000 Hungarian Jews had been gassed to death by this point, and just 20,000 were rescued. This was many more than were saved by the Freedom Train Agreement that delayed the message that Wetzler and Verba risked their lives to deliver. Together, Wetzler and Verba are credited with saving more Jews at one time than any other person during the war. However, they had to accept the haunting fact that due to the interference of others, thousands more who could have been saved were not. The total death toll was staggering, with estimates being that as many as 1.5 million people died at Auschwitz. Wetzler and Verba are heroes, but they couldn't have done what they did alone. It took the 4 men who had escaped before them and the 3 peasants who helped guide, shelter, and feed them for their ultimate success. Not to mention the British intelligence who helped finally spread the message to the rest of the world. War is cruel, and many people do cruel things. But as we've seen in this true account, when people come together despite the obstacles, there's always a chance. A chance for good that's worth fighting and even dying for.
All night long, the female prisoners heard the groans and screams. They didn't know what was happening to the other women, but they knew they likely wouldn't see them again. Every day they put up with the sadistic guards and malicious nurses, and then, once the doctors got another idea in their heads, off the prisoners disappeared one by one, like bleeding lambs to the bloody slaughter. We're talking about Ravensbrück concentration camp, a place you'll become acquainted with in the video today, a place you'll never forget. It was just one camp of 23 main concentration camps. Each of these had sub-camps, but it's Ravensbrück where we'll spend most of our time today. Between 1942 and 1945, the Nazis conducted a myriad of medical experiments on the thousands of inmates at various concentration camps. Even though millions of people died in the gas chambers at these camps, and many more were worked to death or starved to death, the experiments with humans elicited a particular revulsion for the citizens of the world when they became known at the doctor's trial and the other trials after the war. This is how we got the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles aimed at preventing unethical medical practices. We'll talk more about the trials later. Right now, we want to show you a letter written on June 23, 1942 by SS Oberfuhrer Viktor Brack. Brack was one of the main people behind the Nazi euthanasia program, Action T4, in which as many as 300,000 people were euthanized, mostly because the Nazis deemed them mentally or physically sick beyond help. They called these mass murders mercy deaths. These physically disabled or mentally unwell people were deemed defective and a burden to society. In 1939, Adolf Hitler signed a top-secret authorization that would protect all physicians and medical staff taking part in the slaughter. You'll hear about the victims of this mass genocide later in the show. In 1942, Brack sent that letter. It was addressed to the bespectacled architect of the Holocaust, Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler. Himmler worked toward what was called the final solution to the Jewish question. Millions of Jews would be executed, worked to death, and experimented on. Brack wrote, "According to my impression, there are at least 2 to 3 million men and women well fit for work among the approximately 10 million European Jews. In consideration of the exceptional difficulties posed for us by the question of labor, I am of the opinion that these 2 to 3 million should in any case be taken out and kept alive." He added that they should not be allowed to procreate, and he suggested brutal methods of sterilization. The murder and experimentation also extended to Romani people, Soviet POWs, POWs from other nations, Polish political prisoners, ethnic minorities, and many more people the Nazis believed were expendable or dangerous to their idea of the Aryan race. The ones kept alive were considered useful. The Nazis were engaged in a world war, dying in the many thousands, millions by the end of the war. German soldiers froze in the waters when their ships sank. Men lost limbs on the battlefield and required ad hoc surgery to save their lives. Pilots passed out due to a lack of oxygen. Soldiers died from disease and infections. Some needed bone and muscle transplants when anesthesia wasn't available. Some were poisoned by chemicals, and others suffered burns all over their bodies from bombs. The Nazis wanted to recreate these situations in the camps and see what they could do to save German lives. The camps gave the Nazis the opportunity to conduct medical experiments which they believed would advance healthcare and surgery for their men on the front lines. They had more than guinea pigs, rats, and rabbits. They had the perfect specimen in their hands, humans, whose lives didn't mean anything to them. Having human test subjects was highly unethical, but it was also very useful. One experiment was titled Warming Up After Freezing to the Danger Point. The doctor, Sigmund Rascher, froze people close to death and then tried various methods of heating them up. The methods could then be used on German soldiers suffering from hypothermia. Rascher wrote after his experiment, Subject 11:57:63, naked, time of death 64 minutes. Subject 11:53:06, clothed, time of death 102 minutes. In another report he wrote, these cases ended fatally without any successful results from resuscitation efforts. At least 8 women from the Ravensbrück camp were used in what the Nazis called animal warmth experiments, in which the method of heating up the freezing body was sexual intercourse. Rascher was also behind the altitude experiments, in which he put prisoners, mostly Poles and Russians, in a chamber where he changed the air pressure to mimic what it would be like for a German pilot to parachute from high up without oxygen. He wrote, only continuous experiments at altitudes higher than 10.5 kilometers resulted in death. These experiments showed that breathing stopped after about 30 minutes. During the trials, it was later explained, under low-pressure conditions, disturbed behaviors were observed. Prisoners would tear out their hair, scratch their faces with their nails, beat their heads against the wall, or howl until they became unconscious. Even if they survived, cerebral hemorrhage often resulted in mental issues. In the blood coagulation experiments, the Nazis wanted to see how effective their new medicine was, which they thought would help blood coagulate after someone had been injured on the battlefield. Prisoners were shot in the neck or the chest after being given a tablet called Polygol 10. It was also given to prisoners who'd had an amputation. It seems the drug worked. One letter states, as regard to the effectiveness of Polygol, one can say it was absolutely evident how little the tissues bled. But there were deaths, as this next document from the trials explains. Experiments on human beings were carried out and death followed as a natural result of the use of Polygol drugs. Over 2,000 prisoners, many of them Polish Roman Catholic priests, were infected with malaria. It said about 450 of them died, often due to the toxic effects of antipyrine and pyramidon, the medications they were given. Other prisoners were subjected to operations they didn't need, often without anesthesia. Their stomachs were cut open. They had operations on their gallbladder, thyroid, lungs, appendix, kidney, urinary tract, and nervous system. Let's now concentrate only on Ravensbrück. One victim of such operations was a former Polish schoolteacher named Władysława Karolewska. She later testified what happened when she was picked out of a lineup, saying, "We were called at a time when usually executions took place, and I was going to be executed because before some girls were shot down. But she wasn't killed. She was taken to a room and given something that knocked her out. Dr. Fritz Ernst Fischer was in charge, working with Dr. Szydlowski and Dr. Rosenthal. You'll know about all of their fates at the end of the show." Karolewska woke up with bandages all over her leg, feeling extreme pain down there. She said the pain was increasing and the temperature too, and the next day I noticed that some liquid was flowing from my leg. In the next experiment, Dr. Fischer put a sheet over her head before operating on her, but she wasn't made unconscious. Many of the women in these experiments couldn't walk after a while. They were in pain 24/7, and yet they kept being sent back for more surgeries. The purpose of these experiments was later revealed to observe bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and the possibility of bone and limb transplantation from one person to another. It's unclear just how many people died at Ravensbrück. One estimate is that there were 40,000 Polish prisoners and 26,000 Jewish prisoners, of which 28,000 died from overwork, starvation, beatings, and medical experiments. In total at the camp, there were something like 130,000 prisoners of various nationalities, of which about 50,000 died. And now we come to the main topic of the show, which is about the Nazis experimenting with infections. As you know, when it comes to battlefield injuries, infections are one of the deadliest things that can happen to a soldier, and that's why the Nazis deliberately infected prisoners at the camps. There is perhaps one man better known than any Nazi when it comes to this topic. His name was Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the Third Reich and the man behind many of the medical atrocities that took place at the Ravensbrück and Auschwitz camps. He was responsible for many of those surgeries without anesthesia we just mentioned, for needless transplants, but also for the tests where so-called rabbits were exposed to substances that would result in infections. This was explained in testimonies after the war, of which one explained, the criminal experiments consisted in the deliberate cutting out and infection of bones and muscles of the legs with virulent bacteria, the cutting out of nerves, the introducing into the tissues of virulent substances, and the causing of artificial bone fractures. Some of the experiments featured what is known as sulfa drugs, sometimes called sulfonamides. This is a range of medicines used to treat bacterial infections. There's a story about why these drugs were first used. After a high-ranking SS officer named Reinhard Heydrich was severely injured in a car bombing in 1942, Adolf Hitler was very upset. The two men were good friends, and Hitler was appalled when he heard about Heydrich's very serious injuries, including facial injuries from shrapnel and damage to his lungs and spleen. He got sepsis and died, which infuriated Hitler even more. Himmler's personal physician at the time was a Gebhard, who, it said, refused to treat Heydrich with those sulfa drugs. Hitler put the blame on Gebhardt, to which Gebhardt said the drugs wouldn't have saved Heydrich. He wanted to prove that point, so one way he could do that was to use it on those Polish prisoners the Nazis held in the camps. These were not injured women, but the healthiest specimens they could find. He injured them and in turn tried to fix them up. Gebhardt first tried this on male prisoners at Sachsenhausen camp, about an hour's drive from Ravensbrück, but the men were said to be difficult to control. It was Fischer that conducted those experiments, but under the orders of Gebhardt. In Fischer's affidavit at the trial, he explained the process, saying, "An incision was made 5 to 8 centimeters in length and 1 to 1.5 centimeters in depth on the outside of the lower leg in the area of the peroneus longus. The bacterial cultures were put into dextrose and the resulting mixture was spread into the wound. The wound was then closed. No serious illnesses resulted. So not only were the males a handful, but the doctors hadn't succeeded in causing infections in the wounds. We found out at the Nuremberg trials that the doctors then chose about 60 Polish women for further experiments. The idea was simple: cut open the body and apply bacterial cultures. The records show the doctors even put glass in the wounds. After that, they sewed the wound closed and hoped for the best, which was a full-on infection. Also applied to the wounds were cloth fibers, wood shavings, and dirt. The fragments of glass were to simulate the crust of dirt customarily found in battlefield wounds and to accelerate the process of infection. The bacterial cultures were a mix of Staphylococci, Streptococci, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium novii. These were known to cause deadly gangrene or tetanus. The women were in terrible pain, not knowing what the doctors had done to them. Many became very ill, coming down with severe fevers. They were in the midst of an infection. That's when the doctors treated some of them with sulfonylamides and left other women without any medications. Gebhardt was likely very pleased and felt vindicated after what Hitler had said to him. The women who were treated with the drugs didn't show any signs of getting healthier. Their infections continued to ravage their bodies. SS Chief Medical Officer Professor Ernst Robert Grawitz, the man who had once promised to eradicate the perverted world of the homosexual, also watched over some of those experiments. As these women were suffering, he looked at them and called the experiments a waste of time. He said they couldn't have properly replicated what happens in the battlefield, otherwise the women would be dead by now. The doctors then used the same women for the same experiment. Some of them went through this 8 times. Barbara Piecyk was operated on 5 times in 1942, which left her with left lower limb paralysis. She was just 16, making her the junior of all the rabbits. She survived her ordeal but died due to complications of the experiments in 1947. Some of the women who survived later said the Nazis would just execute women they no longer felt served a purpose. These women were very close. A historian later wrote that when they knew one of them was up for execution, they'd fix the victim's hair and spoil them as much as possible. The historian explained they would pinch their cheeks for color, do their hair, do the best they could to make themselves beautiful for that last walk. It was Grawitz who decided that if they were going to infect the women just like what had happened on the battlefield, they needed to shoot them and then try using sulfa drugs. One of the testimonies later explained, the normal result of all bullet wounds was a shattering of tissue which did not exist in the initial experiments. As a result of the injury, the normal flow of blood through the muscle is cut off. The muscle is nourished by the flow of blood from either end. When this circulation is interrupted, the affected area becomes a fertile field for the growth of bacteria. The normal reaction of the tissue against the bacteria is not possible without circulation. Gebhardt took 24 Polish female prisoners and tied their muscles off to prevent the circulation of blood. This led to necrosis, the death of the tissue. After this, the doctors introduced bacteria to the wound. 5 women died from serious infections, which the doctors saw as a great success. This was a much better way to ensure the parts of the victim's body got infected compared to the other experiments. Some of these women were given sulfanilamide powder, which was rubbed into their wounds. Others received sulfanilamide powder to be taken orally, and some were told to take the sulfanilamide tablets. To cover all their bases, the doctors gave some of the women sulfanilamide injections on top of the other treatments, while some women were left to die or cling to life without any treatment at all. Many of the rabbits became seriously ill, especially after they developed abscesses and life-threatening systemic infections. We might recall the woman we spoke about earlier who would see the doctor and later wake up in pain. A paper in the National Institutes of Health states post-operative care of the women was entirely inadequate. Many of them were not given any analgesics, and the wound dressings were changed inconsistently, if at all. As we told you, some were shot. This was to stop them from ever talking about what had happened to them. The Nazis knew what they were doing was highly unethical, but some did survive, and they testified. 4 of them were Maria Broel-Platter, Jadwiga Zido, Vladislava Karlewska, and Maria Kuszmierczuk. They all testified during the doctor's trial. Prisoner Dr. Sofia Maszka also testified, saying that many of those women could have easily been saved if the Nazis had amputated the infected area. Gebhardt was later asked why he had not done this. Why not save them? He replied, "As I remember the case histories, the most serious patient had a large abscess on the hip. Probably the corresponding glands had been affected. The infection on the calf and the abscess on the hip, what can I amputate? One can amputate when the infection is limited to the calf." It's believed he knew very well that sulfa drugs would not help with the gangrene. The Americans and the British doctors he knew had tried and failed in the past to use sulfa drugs. The long and short of it is that the women were expendable, just like animals that were routinely used all over the world for various medical experiments. Even worse is the fact that even if some of the women did survive the gangrene experiments, they were then used for experiments relating to bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. The Nazis tried to transplant bones and even limbs from one woman to another. Some experiments included harvesting a part of a person's tibia or fibula, the bones at the bottom of your leg, and transplanting them to another woman's leg. The doctors didn't care that such an operation had a high risk of resulting in sepsis. This was just insane, since the doctors were already aware of such operations. They knew they could work. There wasn't any pressing need to do this to the women. In her affidavit, a Czech doctor named Dr. Zdenka Nedvidova-Niedla, who worked in the camp, explained what went down. She said, "High amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blade or legs were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick ejection of Evipan." She added, "They lay without any assistance, and it was not permitted to administer sedatives even against the most intensive post-operational pains. 11 women died as a result of these experiments." We think you need to hear some testimonies from other women. Here are a few short excerpts taken from longer transcripts. "I saw the hangman, Dr. Rosenthal, coming toward me. From the corridor where I was lying on the stretcher, I looked through the window at the sky and thought I was looking at it for the last time. I was given an intravenous injection. I don't remember what happened afterward. When I awoke, I felt very bad pain in both legs, and the whole of my body seemed to be paralyzed." This was what another woman said. "The screams never ceased from the chamber of torture. The girls were not given any painkillers so that the course of the experiment would not be impaired in any way. Dogs that had undergone the same experiment received strong doses of morphine for 5 days. After a few days, the first pull, a girl of 17, died. Her leg was huge, swollen, monstrous, blue with red wounds, and the stench emanated from them was nauseating." In one of the most shocking pieces of testimony, it was explained, in order to carry out better and more detailed research, they removed some women's entire hips, shoulder joints, or whole upper extremity along with the shoulder blade. Then the professor or his assistants, also physicians from Hohenleichen, like Gravitz, Kogel, and Schultz, wrapped these in sheets and carried them to their car. Naturally, the women thus operated on were immediately after the surgery killed by an injection. Gebhardt was one of 23 men at the doctor's trial that took place from December 9, 1946 to August 20, 1947. This was a series of 12 trials during which 7 men were sentenced to death, 7 were acquitted, and the rest received a 10-year to life prison sentence. Gebhardt was hanged on June 2, 1948. Fischer was imprisoned and released in 1954, after which he had a successful career working for a chemical company. He died aged 90 in 2003. Victor Braque was also hanged in 1948, still saying that what he'd done to those people was a humane measure. Before he swung from the rope, he wished peace to the world.
When Ernst Robert Grawitz knew the Red Army was about to get hold of him, he did as many Nazis did and made sure both him and his family would not have to face the consequences of his heinous actions. After gathering his family in their home, he detonated a grenade, killing everyone inside. Other doctors involved in these bacteria and transplant experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp were Dr. Hertha Oberhauser, who was out of prison in just 4 years, Dr. Rolf Rosenthal, and Gerhard Scheidlowski, who were tried by the Brits at the Hamburg Ravensbrück trials and died at the end of a rope in May 1947. In this trial, 21 of the accused perpetrators were women. This was unusual. Many of these women weren't directly involved in the experiments. They were merely guards or nurses, so how much pain and murder they should be responsible for is questionable. A prisoner named Helena Esther Gaudschmidt later said, "The nurses were hardly any better than the doctors." In her testimony, she said, "The German nurses never had any professional activity. They looked on the misery of the sick with the greatest indifference and even sarcasm, and never made any effort whatsoever to help them, even though it was possible for them to do so." There were usually 6 nurses at the Ravensbrück camp, and also 3 female doctors. They were Hertha Oberhauser, Erika Johnson, and Gerda Wyand. Johnson and Wyand did not stand trial, and you know what happened to Oberhauser, just 4 years in prison. Women nurses were not let off easy, though, not if they'd been heavily involved in the torment and murder. Vera Salvikart, a nurse who'd inspected Jewish corpses for gold teeth, was also hanged in England. This was perhaps surprising, given the fact that she'd been in a German camp herself during the war for having a relationship with a Jewish man and subsequently refusing to give him up to the Gestapo. On another occasion, she helped 5 detained officers escape from certain death at a camp. In her testimony, she said she saved women and children from death by switching their identification numbers for dead people's IDs, but the Brits executed her, even though it turned out she'd spied for them at one point during the war. Greta Bossel, Ravensbrück camp work input overseer and also a nurse, was hanged. She was accused of leading prisoners out of Ravensbrück on a death march, as well as selecting prisoners for the gas chamber at Uckermark camp. She was executed just 24 minutes after Elizabeth Marshall, the head nurse at Ravensbrück, who it was said oversaw many experiments and selected women for execution. The most feared female was said to be Dorothea Binz, a guard at Ravensbrück. Prisoners said she would look out for the weakest women and then, with no provocation, just whip, stomp, and beat them. It was said she'd walk around the camp with her whip and German shepherd looking for someone to beat. She had a boyfriend guard in the camp, and together they'd stroll among the many horrors of the camp, watching the violence with glee. The British hanged her on May 2, 1947. Another guard, Carmen Mori, who was described as sadomasochistic, psychopathic, sexually voracious, and one of the camp's most notorious capos, would have been hanged had she not died shortly before her execution date. She actually worked as a spy for the Allies and was sentenced to death by the Nazis at an earlier date, but got off after someone put in a good word for her. Emma Zimmer was another sadist at Ravensbrück, who it said took great pleasure in telling women, "I will report you and then you will go away. You know where? Just one way up the chimney." She was hanged on September 20, 1948, along with Ida Schreider, who had selected women for execution at the camp. 17 people were hanged in total after the Hamburg Ravensbrück trials, and 2 died during the trial, while just 1 was reprieved. Poland, 1939. A school teacher named Władysława Karolewska becomes a courier in the anti-German resistance after the invasion of her country. In February 1941, she's arrested and, following interrogation, sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. There, she's selected to be part of one of the Nazis' medical experiments. She can have no idea what's in store for her. Neither can many of the other women who will share a similar fate. This is a tale of body transplantation, just one of the medical horrors prisoners at those camps faced. Let's stick with Karolewska's story for now. She survived and later testified against the Nazis. But before we get to what she said, here's how the medical professionals later described such experiments. The criminal experiments consisted in the deliberate cutting out and infection of bones and muscles of the legs with virulent bacteria, the cutting out of nerves, the introducing into the tissues of virulent substances, and the causing of artificial bone fractures. The experiments conducted showed no regard whatsoever for something called asepsis. This means a state in which the human body is free from dangerous microorganisms such as viruses or pathogenic bacteria. As you'll see in this show, some victims died as a result of infection. Others died during the operations, while some suffered major and extensive injuries to their organs of movement. There were also times that the Nazis, having injured the victims so devastatingly, just took them outside and shot them. At the beginning of Karolewska's testimony, she was asked, "Witness, were you operated on while you were in Ravensbrück concentration camp?" She replied, "Yes, I was." Here's what happened. On July 22, 1942, she and around 75 other Polish prisoners were ordered to stand before the camp office. In front of them were several high-ranking Nazi officers and Dr. Fritz Ernst Fischer, a man later imprisoned for conducting medical experiments at the camp. The all-female prisoners were inspected, and then 3 days later they were summoned to go to the prison hospital. Karolewska said in court, "On this day we did not know why we were called before the camp doctors, and on the same day 10 of 25 girls were taken to the hospital, but we did not know why." She said a few of the girls went into the hospital, they were given injections without being told the reason, they were called again, and they didn't return to the hut. Karolewska learned that the women were still in the hospital, their legs now in casts. Then she and some other girls were summoned. This was incredibly frightening. In her own words, she explained why. "We were called at a time when usually executions took place, and I was going to be executed because before some girls were shot down." While she was in a hospital bed, a nurse gave her an injection without explaining why. Whatever had been put into her made her vomit, after which she was rushed off to an operating room. There, she said Dr. Szydlowski and Rosenthal intravenously injected her with something else, after which she fell unconscious. She woke up only to feel excruciating pain in her leg. Before she could try and understand what was happening, she was unconscious again. When she awoke, she said she was burning up. She felt an intense pain in her leg, and when she looked down, she saw that her leg was in a cast. She said, "I noticed also that my leg was swollen from the toes up to the groin. The pain was increasing and the temperature too. And the next day I noticed that some liquid was flowing from my leg." On the third day, she was moved to another room. Dr. Fischer was waiting for her, dressed in a white gown with rubber gloves on his hands. This time she remained conscious, although the nurse put a sheet over her eyes. She said in court, "I had the impression that something must have been cut out of my leg." In the days and weeks that passed, she went back to the hospital on many occasions, each time not knowing what was happening to her. At times she was blindfolded but conscious of the pain the doctors were causing her. She said, 2 weeks later we were all taken again to the operating room and put on the operating tables. The bandage was removed, and that was the first time I saw my leg. What she saw was a giant incision, so deep she could see bones. She and other girls who'd been experimented on were sent back to their huts. She couldn't walk at this point. The doctors weren't done yet. On another day, she was carried back to the operating room. That day, she saw an ambulance outside, so she thought she was going to be executed. But the doctor operated again, although she'd been administered a drug that knocked her out. She woke up in pain. The symptoms were the same. The leg was swollen and the pus flowed from my leg, she said. The hut she stayed in was now full of women who couldn't walk, who each night cried in pain. At one point, they were told to go back to the operating room, but this time some of them could only hop, which caused more pain. During her testimony, she was asked, "Do you remember when you got out of bed and were able to walk?" She replied, "I stayed in bed several weeks, and then I got up and tried to walk. It still wasn't over, but the girls had had enough. Once they were able to stand, they stood in the line that was usually for people headed to the gas chamber." This is what she testified. "We went out of line and stood before the 9th block in line. Then Benz, officer, said, 'Why do you stand so in line as if you were to be executed?' We told her that the operations were worse for us than executions and that we would prefer to be executed rather than to be operated on again. The next time she was operated on, she woke up with both her legs in iron splints and bandages, from her toes right up to her groin. She was, of course, one of the fortunate people to make it out of the camp. Her legs were a mess, as she showed people who attended her testimony. We'll come back to more victim testimonies, but first, we need to know what the Nazi doctors were doing to Miss Karolewska. In a paper published in the National Institutes of Health, the author said that he spent 3 years looking through the National Archives in Germany in an effort to try and understand what actually went on in the camp's hospitals. He wrote that one study found that 27,759 people were victims of Nazi medical experiments in all the camps, and 4,364 of them died as a result. For the most part, these experiments were conducted in an effort to bolster the German campaign on the battlefield, in the ocean, and in the skies. We won't go into it today, but as far as the ocean is concerned, sometimes deadly experiments used prisoners to understand better how to treat someone for hypothermia. As for the air, some also deadly experiments featured victims being forced into a special chamber where they experienced changes in air pressure. But it was on the battlefield where most injuries happened. German soldiers routinely lost limbs and had bullets fired into them. They suffered terrible burns, and frequently they almost succumbed to their head injuries. These people had to be operated on quickly, sometimes without much time or expertise at hand. Untold number of German soldiers were getting seriously injured. and that's why the army demanded that the medical corps conduct experiments on the prisoners they had in those camps. According to NIH, experiments were carried out to observe bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration, and the possibility of bone and limb transplantation from one person to another. Now, you likely have a better understanding of what happened to Miss Karolewska and many of her comrades. Just so you know, Ravensbrück was the biggest women's concentration camp, in total holding something like 40,000 Polish prisoners and 26,000 Jewish prisoners. It's thought about 28,000 of them died in all, from overwork, hunger, disease, beatings, but also medical experiments. Other sources state that there were about 130,000 from various countries, of which 30 to 90,000 died. Women, of course, weren't the only ones experimented on. In the NIH paper, it says 20 men from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp were used and abused. Just to give you an idea of what sometimes happened, we'll talk about them. The Nazis wanted to understand if they could treat an infected wound with a certain drug on the battlefield, or if that infection needed to be treated surgically in a field hospital. To understand this, they used guinea pigs, the prisoners. They sliced open their legs and purposefully infected them with bacteria. They then sewed up the wounds and administered the drug. Here's what the actual report said. An incision was made 5 to 8 centimeters in length and 1.5 centimeters in depth on the outside of the lower leg in an area of the peroneus longus. The bacterial cultures were put into dextrose, and the resulting mixture was spread into the wound. The wound was then closed. No serious illnesses resulted. Success! But had it not been, those 20 prisoners could have been in serious trouble. Who knows if they survived anyway. The women at the other camp were not known as guinea pigs, but as rabbits. They became known as the rabbits of Ravensbrück, and many were victims of transplantation. That wasn't always the case, though. The reports state that because success had been achieved at the male camp regarding infections, the Germans upped the ante at the female camp. They rubbed many things into their wounds, hoping to simulate what might happen on the battlefield. Not that it'll mean much to any of you, but the bacteria introduced into the wounds included Staphylococci, Streptococci, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium novae. So when the women woke up with wounds in their legs and their temperature was high, it was sometimes the consequence of one of those experiments. Sometimes they endured numerous operations, and the experiment could differ each time. Take, for instance, the story of Barbara Peterzik. This 16-year-old went through 5 separate operations, which resulted in paralysis of one of her legs. We don't know exactly what happened to her each time, but it's said she underwent bone operations. Simulation of the battlefield, as we said earlier, could include many different types of injuries. One of the most common injuries was getting shot. Bullets pierced through skin, wrecked muscle tissue, destroyed major organs, broke bones, and left infections. That gave a lot of scope to doctors working at the camp. Thankfully for the women, when it was proposed to Dr. Fisher that to better simulate real life the women should be shot, he turned his head up and instead said there must be a better way to simulate injuries. Maybe that's why he wasn't hanged after his trial. He actually became a doctor many years later and died aged 90, a free man. At the Nuremberg trial, 16 doctors were found guilty, 7 were executed, while others received lengthy prison sentences. They did stuff like stop blood circulation in the legs by tying off muscles, which led to deaths and severe infections. The doctors later admitted that with some experiments they knew that a number of women would die. It was all for the greater cause, or as many Nazis later said, they were just following orders. Some German soldiers were so badly wounded on the battlefield that they lost limbs, but at times they perhaps needed to borrow tissue or nerves to heal their wounds. That's why the Nazis were interested in bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration and the possibility of bone and limb transplantation. This is why many women woke up with bits of them missing. Some had nerve tissue removed, which was transplanted to another prisoner. At times, the doctors would remove part of the leg, the fibula or tibia, and then they would try to graft that part onto another woman, who now was missing some part of her leg. Muscles were also removed and moved. We'll give you some scientific language now, only because we don't have much medical acumen ourselves. The NIH paper said about muscle experiments, these involved repeated myomectomies, removal of parts of skeletal muscle, from the same anatomic locations, so that the legs got thinner and weaker over the course of the experiment. The vast majority of the time, the doctors were working with bone grafts and tissue grafts, but on some occasions they tried to transplant an entire bone. Accounts of this are scant, but it did happen. In one account, Dr. Fisher said, "I returned to Hohenleichen as quickly as possible with the bone, which was to be transplanted. In this manner, the period between removal and transplantation was shortened. At Hohenleichen, the bone was handed over to Professor Gebhardt, and he, together with Dr. Stumpfeger, transplanted it. Limbs of women were sometimes amputated, and those limbs were used as, well, spare parts for German soldiers. Dr. Zdenka Nedvidova-Neidla later testified to this, saying high amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blade or legs with iliaca were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick injection of Evipan. All specimens gained in operations were carefully wrapped up in sterile gauze and immediately transported to the SS hospital nearby. What's perhaps even worse is this doctor said not all women were taken outside and shot. She said sometimes they were just left on the operating table. The nurses weren't allowed to assist them, and they were not permitted to administer sedatives even against the most intensive post-operational pains. Now we need to hear something from the survivors again. Here is just a snippet from a former inmate named Zofia Sokulska. She talked about the kind of professionalism, or lack thereof, the women endured. She said, Dr. Rosenthal dressed the wounds. He tortured the victims terribly, ripping open the wounds with instruments, vented his sadistic urges, half or completely drunk, flirting simultaneously with Gerda Quernheim, who was assisting him. Not surprisingly, many women died. Kazimiera Kurowska died from a tetanus infection. Anila Lefanowitz died from an edema malignum bacterial infection. Jadwiga Zito died from a pyogenic bacterial infection. Stanislava Tchaikovska was subjected to various muscle experiments, but she said surviving the camp itself wasn't easy. Just to give you an idea of life in the camp, she talked about the first few days. She said she and the other women received underwear, belts for our dresses, aprons, and white headscarves. For their first meal, they received 2 pieces of bread, a bit of sausage, and a spoonful of fat. They got up at 4 each morning, after which was roll call. They were subsequently sent to work for the day, or as you know, they awaited their doom in the hospital. They usually ate soup and potatoes, although she said on Sundays and holidays they got a special treat of a mug full of coffee or herbal tea, 100 grams of margarine and cheese, or 50 grams of sausage. If they ever got out of line, they were beaten and deprived of any food at all. She said any infraction, even just being accused of not working every second, could result in severe punishment. Sometimes they were incarcerated, but she also said some women were punished by being mauled by a dog. In her own words, she said, if I recall correctly, Josefa or Maria Bednarczyk was on several occasions beaten, battered, taken away to the bunker where she was subjected to various tortures, mauled by a dog, and ultimately finished off. Other women who were severely beaten included Stanislava Shevchik and Hanka Stark, who had an impaired leg ever since. She said these punishments and worse punishments were not meted out by German guards, but by other non-Polish inmates. We are sure you've all heard of the Stanford prison experiment. When given free rein, trustee prisoners can be particularly nasty to each other. She said they were worked almost to death, suffering from frostbite in the winter and dehydration in the summer. She said this was deliberate. They were slowly being exterminated, but then came the medical experiments, when they became more useful. Here's how. The following testimony is from Bogomila Bombinska, who was subjected to several different operations. One of them included an attempt to graft bone onto muscle, but her account revealed she endured more than that. She said one day she woke up from an operation and saw this. My right leg was in a plaster cast, and I saw that I had a piece of plaster near my appendix area. This was covered by gauze held in place by sticking plaster. The dressing was not tight, so I drew it aside and saw that my stomach had been cut open and sewn up in this area. She was given morphine on a daily basis. The wounds were also washed daily, although with petrol. She said sometimes she and others would hide the newer bandages. She explained that this was because they were at a premium. She said had they noticed that we had fresh bandages, there would have been a tremendous row. It was often the case that the visiting doctors were drunk. After weeks of pain, a high temperature, pus leakage, and the inability to walk, she finally felt better again. A female prisoner, who was also a doctor, inspected her wounds. She informed Bombinska that some of her nerves had been cut. Like the other women, Bombinska fought not to be operated on again. She said if that meant execution, then so be it. For that, she was locked up with the others. She testified, once again we declared that we would not go for an operation. The door to our cell was closed, leaving us locked inside. They weren't fed for 3 days after. She said one day something unusual happened. She managed to find a German newspaper, Josef Goebbels' propaganda rag, the Das Reich. It was dated August or July 30th, 1943. She said there was an article that described the extraordinary achievements of German scientists in the field of surgery. Shocked and sad, knowing she'd seen friends die and some rendered disabled, she read about how scientists had made extraordinary breakthroughs in bone transplantation, muscle and skin grafts, and more. In her own words, she testified there was no indication of where the experiments had been conducted.
You're woken in the night by the hatch to the attic being splintered open. Members of your family shriek in horror as men in long black coats pour into the enclosed space, barking furious orders in German and brandishing their pistols menacingly. On the lapels of their coats, the terrifying double lightning bolts of the SS gleam in the glow of their flashlights. This is yet another detachment charged with hunting down undesirables in Nazi-occupied territory. And despite years of hiding away, your luck has just run out. You and your family are manhandled out of the attic and dragged out into the street, kicking and screaming, before being tossed into the back of a military vehicle at gunpoint. If you try to escape, they'll kill you. But death may be a reprieve compared to what awaits you in the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp. As a Jew or one of the other many minority groups persecuted by the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s, if you were caught by the SS or the Gestapo, you were generally persecuted, beaten, captured, and then sent to a concentration camp. While the possibility of you being snatched off the streets for the simple crime of being a Jew is already a concern, what's more haunting is you never can tell when it'll happen. Your journey to a Nazi concentration camp is never a single clear-cut or straightforward route. It twists and it turns, influenced by your background and the shifting whims of the Nazi regime's arbitrary quota. To reiterate, perhaps you find yourself here because of your ties to groups opposing the Nazis, communists, socialists, trade unionists, or anyone suspected of dissent. Or maybe you were deemed undesirable for the Nazis' vision of society, homeless, homosexual, mentally ill, petty criminal, or simply seen as unproductive. Some unfortunate souls ended up here through random mass arrests when they were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others faced imprisonment for their religious beliefs, like Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused to bow to the new order. Or maybe you're simply one of the primary targets of Hitler's brimming hatred, a member of the Jewish faith and ethnicity, considered worth nothing more than the gum beneath a German boot. Even the journey to the camp is designed to rob you of your humanity and to instill fear and shame, to terrify you regardless of who you are. Man, woman, young, old, healthy, or sick. The arrival process is meant to crush your spirit, subjecting you to unimaginable abuse, all part of a system that seeks to dehumanize or destroy. The Nazis will do anything to break you. Once taken, you're forcefully loaded into vehicles, whether trains or trucks, and transported to a concentration camp chosen by the soldiers. In this vehicle, you'll meet other Jews of all ages, cowering in fear, eyes filled with terror. There's barely enough space in the vehicle, and chances are there will either be a very small window or no window at all. You are denied water, food, and even the basic decency of toilet facilities. If you or the many other prisoners crammed in the tight space like animals need to relieve yourself, you're provided a bucket and nothing more. Without food or water, you're starved and dehydrated, stuck in a claustrophobic square, filled with the smell of vomit, excrement, and the tangy smell of dread. The uncertainty of where you're being forcefully taken to grips you like a vice you cannot extricate yourself from. This journey you're forced on can take days, filled with suffering and an inability to do anything in the face of anxiety and terror that comes from the void of genocidal tyranny. Sometimes being transported in overcrowded freight cars often meant you lost sight of family members who were also captured along with you. Worse still, there's no hope whatsoever that you'll cross paths ever again. Perhaps they die in transit. Perhaps they're executed by the trigger-hungry German soldiers. Perhaps they simply get sent to a different camp. The truth is, you may never find out. You're also never told where you're being sent to. The situational blindness makes the entire process even scarier. If you were arrested in the later part of the Holocaust, you probably have heard rumors of concentration camps in the East. If you were privy to that information, maybe you already knew what your fate was. Maybe you were already aware of the dreadful living conditions awaiting you in the infamous East. Regardless of what you know, you can do nothing but wait with dread and painful agitation. Still, nothing can prepare you for the misfortune that waited for you within the barbed wire fences of the concentration camps. Like the many unfortunate souls being walked to Nazi concentration camps, the transport itself felt like a march towards certain death. However, whether by a stroke of bad luck or mercy, you or some other prisoners tightly packed into the airless freight vehicles or trucks may not make it to the dreadful camps. You see, transport conditions were often lethal and inhumane, without access to food and water, and with the only toilet facilities for long-distance trips being a bucket. The airless transport trucks where the prisoners are crammed in are filled with the aforementioned overpowering smell of vomit, urine, and excrement. Hence, many prisoners died en route to the camps due to dehydration, starvation, suffocation, or illness.
You may watch while this happens, or you may be the one being watched by other hopeless souls as you gasp your final breath on the cold floor of the stuffy vehicles. When you arrive at the camp, you're pushed off the vehicle, shoved headfirst into a rather despairing situation. At first, you're led as one big group. Then the soldiers split you and the other prisoners into two smaller groups of men and women with children. Afterward, you and the other terrified prisoners are subjected to a macabre welcome rite where one of the scary SS guards in tan uniforms barks commands at you, asking to provide your age, occupation, and health condition. As a prisoner who's just been ostracized from society, yanked from the grips of their family, denied access to basic pleasures such as good food and health services, and transported miles without food or water, it isn't unusual that your health might be hardly good upon arrival at concentration camps. Hence, depending on your answers to the questions asked by the SS officer, you're either deemed fit for work when the SS officer points his thumb to the right, or sent to immediate execution if his digit points left. As a prisoner during the Holocaust, the grim reality of having your fate sealed and being condemned to death with a simple gesture from a German soldier was a chilling fate that befell many, including you. The moment those fingers pointed to deem you unfit for work, your heart must have sunk as you realized the cruel destiny that awaited. Hundreds of thousands of Jews who were considered sick, too old, or too young to be of any economic importance in concentration camps faced this same dreadful verdict during those dark times. As you're led away toward the gas chambers, a building designed to be a killing machine, you may kick and fight and beg for mercy. However, there was never a means of escape. Your fate has been sealed by a German soldier whose remembrance of your face is nothing but a fleeting memory. The abruptness of this sentence, the finality of it all, is one final crushing blow to your spirit. What if you survived? Well, you just have to face and somehow endure the horrors awaiting you. After you experience the extremely dehumanizing process of being segregated into groups, surrounded by equally terrified strangers who shared your fate as a Jew and are deemed unworthy to coexist with Germans, you're put through another humiliating process. You're asked to strip yourself of your belongings. Every effect that's connected to your past life has no place in these camps. Clothing, valuables, personal items, everything was taken and piled on a platform, never to be returned. Passing the selection process might have meant escape from gas chambers. However, even that relief is short-lived. After being forced to surrender your possessions, you're dealt blows and pushed along as SS guards attempt to register you into the camp system. Registration means you're given a prison number that instantly replaces your name. In the past, before you were plucked off the street, you were forced to add Israel if you were a male Jew, or Sarah if you were a female Jew, to be easily recognized. However, in this camp, the entirety of your name is taken away, and you're assigned a number instead. The assigning of prison numbers was a deliberate tactic to erase individual identities, reducing you to mere numbers devoid of humanity. Sometimes this number is stitched onto your prison uniform, which is most likely a striped two-piece made out of uncomfortable fabric. Sometimes, especially at Auschwitz, the number is tattooed on your arms, branding you permanently. After the registration process is completed, you're asked to undress in the presence of hundreds of prisoners and the watching guards. There and then your head is shaved regardless of gender, and you're forced to shower in groups, while SS guards watch you with extreme scrutiny. Finally, you'll be given your prison uniform, one of the few belongings they would allow in their camp. Life in a concentration camp meant you were constantly surrounded by German soldiers placed to herd you like a flock. In a way, you have indeed become a flock, stripped of identity and subjected to the most barbaric treatments possible. The hierarchical structure in many concentration camps mimics the model established at Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. You'll soon discover that the German staff in your camp is led by the Lagerkommandant, or camp commander, and a team of junior officers. Besides these specially trained officers, there were also male and female wardens to whom you had to respond. Similarly, you'll also discover that prisoners have a hierarchical structure of their own, with prisoner supervisors, or capos, being considered your commander. Every other prisoner outside the capos, including yourself, will be assigned colored triangle badges to identify the reason prisoners were placed in camps and facilitate task assignment. Living conditions in the camps are nothing short of destitute. Soldiers, given absolute power by Hitler, believed that you and the other Jews deserved no better and thus offered the barest minimum they could spare. This means you'll most likely be assigned to barracks that were designed to hold far fewer people than those that ended up crammed inside. If you're unlucky, your barrack would be run down with problems such as leaking roofs,
that make life even more miserable and intolerable when it rains. Of course, the guards give you a bed to sleep in. However, these beds are tiny bunks that are typically several tiers high and placed directly on muddy floors. Don't get too comfortable thinking you get a bed to yourself. The limited space available in these camps meant you were required to share your already too small bed with other prisoners. Hence, while the bunks were designed to hold 3 people with 1 person per tier, in reality they hold up to 18 prisoners with 6 people per tier. When there weren't any more bunks to spare, you might have to sleep in tents made out of extremely thin materials, or even worse, damp tunnels without any covering. You're also provided no bedding or blankets beside the straw bedding placed atop your tiny cot. These straw mattresses, if provided, were rarely replaced when fouled with vomit or urine or infested by lice or ticks. As expected of anywhere with such awful sanitation, your barrack will probably be swarmed with lice, rats, or other vermin that facilitate the spread of diseases. Naturally, as one would expect, diseases spread rather quickly in this state. This means you're constantly surrounded by deathly ill prisoners. Or worse, you become one. In your barrack, heating came in the form of 2 small stoves, which were nowhere near sufficient for heating entire rooms, let alone the prisoners in them. Sanitation facilities were inadequate, leading to overflowing toilets, constant stench, and once again, the spread of disease. Still, this isn't all. Your daily battle for survival revolves around the constant struggle with hunger and the meager rations provided by the Nazis. The indifference toward your well-being is evident in the paltry meals that are meant to sustain you at a bare minimum, not to nourish or support your health. These meager portions, consisting of watery soup, stale bread, and occasionally a small piece of sausage or cheese, were far from satisfying or nutritious. The mealtimes, if they could be called that, are a stark reminder of the harsh reality of camp life. The gnawing hunger that eats away at your insides becomes a relentless companion, weakening your body, leaving you vulnerable to illness and perpetuating a cycle of deprivation and desperation. The struggle for even the smallest scraps of food become a daily trial, with many prisoners succumbing to the brutal living conditions they were subjected to, despite surviving the initial sorting process. Worse still, you're expected to provide labor in these conditions. The type of work you engage in while held in concentration camps varies depending on the camp. However, you may be asked to perform tasks such as heavy construction, rock quarrying, digging trenches, or factory work. You may also be assigned tasks related to expanding camps, manufacturing armaments, clerical duties, crafts, trades, labor on farms, factory work, mining, or chemical plants. In concentration camps, you're introduced to a life that involves working up to 14 grueling hours per day while being watched like hawks by guards. It becomes the norm for you to get beaten by wardens or capos when you move too slowly or go out of the line of duty without permission. If you manage to survive the living conditions, disease, and hunger, you may end up succumbing to stress and dying from being overworked. Or if you survive those, you're either beaten to death, executed, or sent away as guinea pigs for medical experiments. Inevitably, given the deplorable living conditions, sickness spreads rampantly around you. However, the anti-Semitic regime showed no regard for the well-being of those deemed unworthy of life, denying you even basic medical attention. Minor injuries festered untreated, while grave illnesses became fatal sentences, sealing the fate of many. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis were just a few of the deadly diseases that ravaged the camps, waiting to take you out. The combination of physical hardship, constant fear, and the loss of loved ones takes a devastating toll on your mental state. Depression, hopelessness, and despair become your common companions in the daily struggle for survival. Still, you have no choice but to suffer day after day. Life for the average prisoner held in Nazi concentration camps began with the Appell, a daily lineup that took place unfailingly every morning and evening. Whether it rained, snowed, or was bitterly cold, you and other prisoners are expected to always be present for the Appell. You wake up to the chilling reality of another day in the camp between the hours of 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. every day. The air is heavy with despair, as you and the other prisoners are roughly awoken in the barracks by the sound of a loud gong and capos yelling. As you open your eyes, the harsh reality of your surroundings hits you like a wave of darkness. You were just one among the countless souls trapped in this seemingly eternal hell. It wasn't unusual to find bodies of the many who didn't survive the night laying stiffly in their cramped sleeping positions, mostly ignored by the German officers, although now considered nothing more than husks needing disposal in the eyes of the Germans. These bodies were probably your family or friends, or simply a companion who shared the hard times with you. So you grieve. If you're unlucky, you get to experience Bettenbau or Bettenmachen, which roughly translates to the making of a bed following very strict rules. Following SS guards, you're expected to make your bed. However, given the limited space caused by overcrowding, your weakened physical state due to stress and malnutrition, and unnecessary bed-making regimens set by the SS, you most likely will fail. When this happens, you're beaten, sometimes to death, while other prisoners helplessly watch. In many cases, you knew this person. They could be your neighbor, your doctor, or a local clerk. If you somehow managed to make your bed, you were expected to clean yourself with the dirty water available in the camp, and of course, without access to soap or other toiletries. Afterward, you get breakfast in your mess tin, served by a capo. Dinner is an unappetizing meal of stale bread with watered-down tea or coffee, without the luxury of milk or sugar. On good days, you receive a thin slice of sausage or margarine. Like many things that went on within concentration camps, even the mere act of collecting food was tinged with maliciousness. Sometimes capos single you out as an act of wickedness, throwing your bread in the mud. Sometimes they'll push you, spilling your watery coffee or tea on the ground. When this happens, you either forfeit your meal or pick your muddy bread off the floor, dust it off best you can, and eat. After breakfast, you're expected to respond to the appel or appelplatz, the dreaded morning roll call. Regardless of the circumstances, except for those working far away or in the camp's kitchen, every prisoner was required to assemble for this daily count. Even the deceased were expected to be present, their lifeless bodies lined up at the front of the gathering. A gut-wrenching reminder of the harsh reality of camp life. During the appel, you and your fellow prisoners stood in rigid rows of 10, meticulously counted by the capos under the watchful eyes of the SS guards and officers. Any movement was met with swift and brutal punishment, with soldiers quick to mete out beatings for the slightest infraction. The counting process, often repeated to ensure accuracy, meant you had to endure hours of standing in formation. Sometimes in harsh weather conditions, the physical strain was immense, causing prisoners to collapse out of exhaustion, an action that carries severe consequences. Attempts to evade the appel were met with the same level of brutality, with those caught facing beatings, torture, or even death as punishment. Once the roll call was completed, to the satisfaction of the Nazi soldiers, you were marched off to your assigned work sites on foot, varying in distance from a short walk to several miles. Forced to sing degrading songs for the guards' amusement, you had to maintain a grueling pace under the threat of violence for any perceived disobedience. Falling behind meant severe punishment, reinforcing the constant fear and pressure to comply with the guards' demands. When noon rolls around, you'll be signaled to return to the camp for the afternoon roll call. It's like the morning roll call all over again, a seemingly unending tally where you're expected to stand at attention, this time under the scorching sun and exhausted from all the work they'd done. Afterward, lunch is provided, which is a small respite from the challenging daily routine. This was the norm in the earlier years. However, later the German soldiers arranged for lunch to be taken down to the labor sites to reduce the amount of time spent walking to and from the camp, thereby increasing the amount of time spent working. You're typically released from labor at approximately 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. daily, during winter at sundown. Sometimes you might even be forced to work through the night. However, when work ends in the evenings, you're marched back to the camp for the final roll call of the day. While you may manage to stumble back the distance you walked in the morning, other prisoners who had passed away during duty will be carried back to the camp by your mates to participate in the evening roll call. Once again, inaccuracies were unavoidable, and discrepancies in the number of prisoners counted meant that the roll call could take hours to complete. The process is often made longer as a form of punishment. If you endured the day's ordeal without collapsing from exhaustion or facing brutal punishment, you're granted a meager dinner ration, usually a thin and watery vegetable soup. Once again, the familiar routine of presenting your mess tin or risking going hungry for the night repeated itself, a reminder of the constant struggle for sustenance. Or maybe you wound up in the lesser fortunate camps where dinner is a luxury unknown to the prisoners. In this case, after backbreaking labor, you're sent straight to your barracks, where they're given free time. You and the other prisoners around you might use this free time to barter with each other, trading one item for another that you may need between yourselves. If you manage to get dinner, you're expected to retire to your barrack as soon as mealtime is over. Lights out is typically 9 p.m. in many camps, but it could be later. Once inside your barrack, leaving during the night was strictly prohibited. To ensure no prisoner attempts to sneak out, Blockführers and guards constantly paraded the grounds, keeping their eyes peeled for the sign of a defaulting prisoner. Blockführers were often also called death heads. They wore green triangles on their uniforms, an insignia that meant real criminals. These soldiers had the power to determine your fate if you were caught outside the barracks during bedtime. They decided who lived and who died as punishment. Retreating to the barracks at the end of the day meant you had managed to survive the hardships of the day. However, it also meant you had to live through these ordeals again the next day. The lack of essential medical facilities and life-saving resources meant that falling sick would lead you to a grim fate. While there were designated sick bays or infirmaries, they were often mere illusions of care and compassion. In some camps where fellow inmates were tasked with running the sick bays, there were valiant attempts to aid you and other ailing companions. However, the overwhelming challenges of rampant disease, horrid living conditions, and severe shortages of medical supplies rendered those efforts largely futile. Many diaries that survived the Holocaust featured prisoners' recounts of healthcare at concentration camps. Regardless of the camps where these diary entries were written, they all share the same experiences as you. The infirmaries, typically stationed in old buildings, like the rest of the camps, had no water, no plumbing, no electricity other than natural lighting, dirty cots similar to those in the barracks, a repugnant straw mattress covered in pus and blood. On each filthy mattress are at least 2 sick people, sometimes looking very skeletal and almost always covered with scabies, boils, devoured by lice, or simply completely naked. In cases where there's a disease outbreak and the sick bays are packed full, it isn't uncommon to find more than 2 sick people sharing a mattress. They lay shivering from cold, suffering and waiting for help, or at least waiting for death. Despite the lousy living conditions that you're in, you hold on to fragile strands of hope. Hope continues to flicker like an undying candle fights gusts of wind. You attempt to live life as you normally would, keeping cultural and religious activities alive. Maybe you keep journals and diaries that detail your throes at the hands of the German soldiers in the camps. Maybe you write about your daily life on scraps of paper, speaking about the degrading conditions you're forced to live in. Maybe you create artwork instead, creating illustrations and drawings that mimic life in a concentration camp. Or maybe you choose to produce jewelry out of copper wire. Regardless what medium you chose, your works, acting as testimonials to a life as a prisoner living in a concentration camp during the Holocaust, are nothing short of a grim reminder of the resilience and humanity that persisted in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Amidst the shadows of despair and suffering, you hold on to fragments of normalcy, finding solace in your faith, traditions, and artistic expressions. Amid such darkness, these small acts of defiance manage to keep your spirit alive and humanity intact. Life in Nazi concentration camps was a routine nightmare for prisoners, with basic rights stolen from you and nothing to call your own except the rough, striped prison uniform on your back. Nazi concentration camps leave prisoners with nothing but the stark reality of survival in a nightmarish experience. Your daily struggle for survival is marked by the relentless brutality of the SS guards, the dehumanizing routines of roll calls that went on for hours, and the constant fear of punishment or death for the slightest infraction. Irrespective of the pervasive darkness that engulfed you and the hundreds of thousands of Jews and other unfairly detained prisoners in the hands of the enemy, you continue to display remarkable strength and humanity in the face of unspeakable horrors. Through your artworks and pieces of writing, you retain shreds of your identities and humanity, despite the Germans' attempts at snuffing out the flame. These stories are haunting narratives that serve as a poignant reminder of the indomitable human spirit, the ability to endure even in the most extreme circumstances, presenting the power of spiritual strength and hope in the bleakest of times. Up until all prisoners were rescued through the combined efforts of Allied forces, the prisoners in Nazi concentration camps endured a living nightmare that tested their endurance, resilience, and general will to survive. Their liberation from the horrors of the camps marked the beginning of the end of a chapter filled with shocking cruelty, loss, and trauma, offering those who had faced the depths of human depravity a silver lining and a hope for a better life. However, even this liberation did nothing to wipe the charred stain from the minds of those affected, as well as the world at large. Following the liberation of Jews from the clutches of Nazi soldiers in concentration camps, survivors were faced with the daunting task of attempting to rebuild their lives, grappling with the trauma of their experiences, and pursuing justice for the atrocities they faced. The legacy of the Holocaust and the sufferings of Jews serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked hatred, uncontrolled bigotry, and inhumanity, urging future generations to remember the past, strive for a world free from such horrors, and seek leadership that works for the freedom and the safety of the innocent. A young Polish man named Simon Rosenkier has seen things a young man should never have seen.
In the concentration camp where he's imprisoned, he witnessed Dr. Joseph Mengele conduct a cold experiment on a Jewish man. The man did not survive his bath of ice. On another day in the camp, he saw the aftermath of what happens when doctors removed the hump from a hunchback. Rosenkirch could not believe what he was seeing. But something he saw on many occasions was the Nazi sterilization experiments. These programs encompassed hundreds and thousands of people, some of whom were subjected to powerful X-rays in their genital regions. And then they came for him. Rosenkirch was brought to the clinic one day and told he was going to have vitamin supplements injected into him. When he asked one of the doctors what the reason was, he got the response, "These shots will give you muscles to work." The doctor then gave him a mean look and added, "Do you understand that, you red-headed dog?" It seems the doctor did not like Rosenkirch's hair color. Perhaps it was thought to be a Jewish trait for some people in Germany. Maybe ginger wasn't seen as Aryan enough, although that's disputable. Rosenkirch survived the camp, and that's how we know about his story. In the 1950s, he and his wife tried to have a child. They couldn't, and they soon found out that he was sterile. Many years later, he filed a lawsuit against the German pharmaceutical companies Bayer and Schering. The lawsuit accused them of supplying drugs to the Nazis for sterilizations. "What they did to me is beyond right and wrong," Rosenkirch told the New York Times in 2003. He might have survived the Holocaust, but his parents and 4 siblings did not. To understand the Nazi sterilization experiments, we have to look at what happened before the war. In 1933, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was passed. This meant that if the Genetic Health Court said a citizen had some kind of genetic disorder, by law they should be forcefully sterilized. It was actually similar to the USA's Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924, which ruled forceful sterilization was lawful on people afflicted with hereditary forms of insanity that are recurrent, idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, or epilepsy. This hasn't been a good look for the US, since it was later said the program targeted minorities. The New Yorker wrote the story in 2018, How American Racism Influenced Hitler. Anyway, moving on, the German law covered many people, including the blind, the deaf, and even folks suffering from alcoholism. Then in 1935, after some amendments were made, it included Afro-Germans whom the Nazis referred to as Rhineland Bastarde. Adolf Hitler often talked about what he considered contamination of German blood. As you'll see today, this is why the Nazis went to great lengths to stop many people from having children. Now let's look at a letter that was written by SS Oberfuhrer Brock and addressed to Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler. The date on the letter is June 23, 1942. This is how it starts. According to my impression, there are at least 2 to 3 million men and women well fit for work among the approximately 10 million European Jews. In consideration of the exceptional difficulties posed for us by the question of labor, I'm of the opinion that these 2 to 3 million should in any case be taken out and kept alive. Brock said that it goes without saying those who are kept alive should not be able to procreate, but he added it was too expensive to sterilize people like they'd been doing for years to folks whom the Nazis said had genetic defects. He wrote, castration by means of X-rays, however, is not only relatively cheap, but can be carried out on many thousands in a very short time. Himmler wrote back, saying, I am positively interested in seeing the sterilization by X-rays tried out at least once in one camp in a series of experiments. Soon after, a memorandum was written. It contained this paragraph. The Reichsleiter SS has promised Brigade Führer Professor Klauberg that Auschwitz concentration camp will be at his disposal for his experiments on human beings and animals. By means of some fundamental experiments, a method should be found which would lead to sterilization of persons without their knowledge. On June 7, 1943, Professor Karl Klauberg wrote to Himmler, providing what he considered some good news. In the second paragraph, he wrote, the method I contrived to achieve the sterilization of the female organism without operation is as good as perfected. He meant, of course, that it worked, but his technique was barbaric. We now know that he took women from the camps and told them that he was going to give them a routine gynecological examination. He would first check to see if the fallopian tubes were open, and then he would inject a chemical irritant. This would cause swelling, and in time the tubes would grow together, thereby blocking them. This swelling could lead to something called peritonitis, which every medical resource on the web says if left untreated can infect the blood and cause death by sepsis. It can also infect the organs and lead to multiple organ failure and death. A website dedicated to the prisoners of Auschwitz wrote, while some of Klauberg's Jewish patients died in this way, others were deliberately put to death so that autopsies could be carried out. It said Klauberg sterilized 700 women this way, with many or most of them suffering permanent damage to their organs if they survived. The number is just an estimate, with some sources saying the number was much higher. As well as Jewish women, Romani women were victims of Klauberg's sterilization. After performing these simple but totally unethical procedures, Klauberg concluded in a letter to Himmler, 1 adequately trained physician in 1 adequately equipped place with perhaps 10 assistants, the number of assistants in conformity with the speed desired, will most likely be able to deal with several hundred if not even 1,000 per day. Another man who sent and received letters talking about sterilization was Horst Schumann. He sometimes worked alone and sometimes with Dr. Klauberg. We'll let the New York Times introduce him to you. On September 24, 1970, the newspaper wrote this in its lead. Dr. Horst Schumann, a Nazi concentration camp doctor, went on trial in Frankfurt today, charged with the killing of 14,549 mental patients under Hitler's so-called euthanasia program. Before we talk about his sterilization techniques, we should tell you a little about the Action T4 program. The Nazis believed that some mentally ill people were uncurable. Therefore, it was agreed that they should be subjected to involuntary euthanasia, which basically meant killing someone. Adolf Hitler referred to this as a mercy death. Hitler wrote that some mentally ill people were beyond help. He said some of them bedded on sawdust or sand and perpetually dirtied themselves. He said some of them even put their own excrement into their mouths. This, of course, was a massive exaggeration and also a dangerous one. It did not reflect at all on mentally disabled people nor the physically disabled. The mass culling wasn't about mercy at all. It was about the Nazis' obsession with a master race and also about freeing up hospital beds and having fewer mouths to feed. It meant people who were sick, young, old, male, female, in Germany, Poland, and other European nations were put down like animals. It's thought 300,000 people were killed in total. Horst Schumann was one of the many people involved in the program, but he's also notorious for his sterilization techniques. One of them was sterilization by radiation. In 1942, he set up a radiation station at the women's hospital in the Auschwitz camp. There, both men and women were told they were going to have an X-ray, although they were not informed why. Reports say they usually stood 5 to 8 minutes where the machine was pointed at the genital area. The process would sometimes cause radiation burns to the genital area and other parts of the body. At times, they would have surgery after to remove a woman's ovaries or a man's genitals. Some of them died, while the survivors, if unfit for work, would also usually be killed soon after. According to one report, roughly 1,000 male and female prisoners were subjected to X-ray sterilization, with about 200 of them undergoing follow-up extractive surgery. Another man who performed X-ray sterilizations was Victor Brack. Remember, he's one of those guys whose letters to Himmler survived. They were used against him when he stood trial. In one letter translated from German, Brack says a high enough dosage of radiation can make a man or woman sterile. He wrote, "Castration with all its consequences will occur, since high X-ray dosages destroy the internal secretion of the ovary or of the testicles respectively. Lower dosages would only temporarily paralyze the procreative capacity." He wrote that men needed to be hit with 500 to 600 R and women 300 to 350 R, each for about 2 minutes. He said that there was a problem, though, in that the high dose would cause them burns. Remember that the victims were not supposed to know what was happening to them, so the burns obviously gave it away. The Nazis did not want their enslaved workers to know just how awful things were for them in this respect. Brack wrote that he had one way to deal with the problem. He said they should let the person to be treated approach a counter where they could be asked to answer some questions or fill in forms, which would take them 2 to 3 minutes. The person behind the counter was actually the operator of the radiation machine. He or she would switch it on when the victim was filling in these questions. Brack said he believed one such installation could sterilize 150 to 200 people per day, but with 20 installations, that would be 3,000 to 4,000 per day. The victims would not know what happened to them, at least at the time. Although Brack wrote in another letter that in all likelihood the victims would sooner or later realize with certainty that they'd been sterilized or castrated by X-rays. During the Nuremberg trials, Brack was asked, "You were very interested in the question whether the people going to be sterilized would know whether they are sterilized or not, would gain knowledge of this procedure, is that correct?" He replied, "No, that was Himmler's wish." It seems that Brack had to concede back in the day that it was just not possible to perform the secret X-rays without the person finding out at some point what had happened to them. There are, of course, many survivors of the forced sterilizations, like the man we mentioned at the start of the show. One very outspoken survivor is Clara Nowak, who became a nurse in Germany after the war. She was also the activist behind the League of Victims of Compulsory Sterilization and Euthanasia. In 1991, she was asked how being sterilized had affected her later in life. She said, "I still have many complaints as a result of it. There were complications with every operation I've had since. I've had to take early retirement at the age of 52, and the psychological pressure has always remained." On top of that, she said it had hurt all her life to see her friends and neighbors talking about their kids and grandkids when the Nazis had ensured this could never happen to her. She said her union had 88,000 people in it who had suffered from the sterilization and attempted euthanasia. Another victim was the writer and sculptor Dorothea Buck. In 2019, she died aged 102. But many years before, when she was just 19, she became a victim of Nazi sterilization. She was the daughter of a German pastor, and while the Nazis didn't deem her to be essentially non-German, she had a breakdown in her teens when she heard about the advent of another war. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. In an asylum, she was treated to what we now call torture, although back then, doctors said they were curative measures. This included drenching her daily with ice-cold water as if that would suddenly make her better. One day she woke up with a scar on her abdomen, which she and her parents were told was from an appendectomy. She actually still had her appendix. The doctors had cut into her and sterilized her. This was terrible, but she could so easily have been a victim of euthanasia. Ima Spaniard also survived. She talked with the BBC in 2005 when she was aged 80. She said, "With little food and hard work, it was hard to survive for long in the camp." In her own words, she said, "Auschwitz was an enormous terrain, 40 kilometers on the ground. So you had to work there, building roads or barracks. To do that for 10 hours a day and stand up for an hour in the morning and in the evening, especially with the kind of food we ate, made it impossible to survive for longer than a few weeks." She said she met many girls who were sterilized at her camp. She called them beautiful young Greek girls, virgins whose ovaries were x-rayed. She said they all suffered burns, and she was the nurse who treated those burns. Some of them died from their injuries, especially when radiation treatment was exchanged for chemicals being injected into their ovaries. She told the BBC around 80 women were operated on like this. "I remember them well because I was told to administer their anesthetic. At that moment, I was not so afraid to do this, but later on, after the war ended, I thought to myself, what have I done?" It's now believed anywhere from 300,000 to 450,000 people were sterilized by the Nazis from 1933 to 1945, although we can't be sure just how many people survived and how many died. The Human Centipede is regarded by many as one of the most disgusting horror movies ever made. A film that the famous critic Roger Ebert was so horrified by, he refused to assign it a star rating, writing, "I am required to award stars to movies I review. This time I refuse to do it. The star rating system is unsuited to this film. Is the movie good? Is it bad? Does it matter? It is what it is, and it occupies a world where the stars don't shine." The film is based around one simple, deeply disturbing premise. A mad doctor abducts hapless tourists and sews them together in a, shall we say, particularly disgusting configuration intended to unify their digestive tracts. He turns 3 people into, in his words, a human centipede. The film arose from several different places, including a joke between director Tom Six and a friend concerning the type of punishment the most heinous sex criminals might deserve. But the primary bit of historical inspiration was one of the worst atrocities in human history. The mad German doctor at the center of the film, Dr. Joseph Heither, was inspired by and named after Nazi Dr. Joseph Mengele. And we're sorry to tell you in advance that the things the real Joseph Mengele did made the film look tame by comparison, and that Mengele was far from the only one. Joseph Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the city of Günzburg, Germany, the eldest son of a farming equipment manufacturer. In 1935, he earned his PhD in physical anthropology from the University of Munich. In 1936, he passed his state medical exams. The following year, he began working at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, Germany, where he became the assistant to the institute's director, Dr. von Verschurer, a geneticist known for his research on twins. When the Nazi Party first emerged in Germany, Mengele was not an active supporter. But then, in 1931, he joined a different right-wing party, the German National People's Party. By 1934, he was no longer actively participating, and the party had been absorbed into the Nazi Party. It was during his time at the university that Mengele first began to embrace the tenets of racial science, believing that Germans were biologically different from and superior to all other races in the world. This inaccurate racial science was one of the dominant ideologies of the Nazi Party, and in 1938 Mengele officially joined the party and the SS as well. This was only compounded by his mentor and employer's racism, and together the two men worked alongside higher-ups in the Nazi Party, providing their expert opinion on whether or not certain individuals qualified as German in a racial sense. If they did not qualify, then they could be forcibly sterilized or banned from marrying in order to prevent their supposedly inferior genes from being passed on. It was a pernicious ideology that would serve as the justification for some of the worst atrocities in human history. Mengele and his commitment to race science would only climb higher and higher through the ranks of the Nazi Party. In June 1940, Mengele was drafted into the Wehrmacht, the German army. 1 month later, he volunteered to join the medical service of the military branch of the SS. There, he continued his work of evaluating the physical attributes of citizens, determining whether or not they counted as, quote, real Germans. After being assigned to the Eastern Front, where Germany was battling the Soviet Union, he was promoted to SS captain and received the 2nd and 1st class Iron Cross. Mengele returned to Germany in January of 1943 and resumed his work for Verschuer, now the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics. Then, on May 30, 1943, the SS assigned Mengele to Auschwitz, where he became a camp physician at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Auschwitz camp. Among his responsibilities at Auschwitz was the selection process, where groups of Jewish prisoners arrived at the camp and medical staff, including Mengele, would sort them, picking out the people considered unable to work, including less physically strong adults and children. Anyone who wasn't selected for work would be massacred in the gas chambers. Whenever a prisoner became ill or injured, they would be selected for execution by methods including lethal injection and the gas chamber. Mengele was the most recognizable face amongst the staff responsible for the, quote, selections, earning him the nickname Angel of Death amongst the prisoners. Gisela Perl, a Jewish gynecologist imprisoned at Birkenau, recounted in her memoir I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz how the sight of Mengele in the women's infirmary was a source of terror. In her words, "We feared these visits more than anything else because we never knew whether we would be permitted to live. He was free to do whatever he pleased with us." As horrible as this work was, it was not what earned Mengele his reputation for one of medical history's greatest monsters. When he wasn't selecting innocent people for execution, condemning them to death on a whim, he was conducting authorized, deeply unethical, and frequently deadly human experiments on the concentration camp prisoners. When it came to his, quote, research, one of Mengele's primary areas of interest was twins. Twins played a large role in eugenics-based research, and in the study of which human characteristics were genetic and which were environmental. To eugenicists who were preoccupied with selecting for ideal genetic traits in human beings, twins were the perfect research subjects. Mengele shared this perspective and fascination but had no consideration for ethics or human rights while conducting his studies. Whenever a set of twins came into the concentration camp, he would have them removed from the general population and the research would begin. From 1943 to 1944, Mengele experimented on nearly 1,500 sets of twins. Twins in the camp would be forced to strip naked and lie next to each other, examined thoroughly, and measured to compare all of their shared and different attributes. Blood would be removed from one twin and transferred to the other and vice versa. Spinal taps and injections into the spine would be given without any anesthesia. In some cases, diseases including typhus and tuberculosis would deliberately be given to one twin and not the other, in order to see what would happen. When the sick twin inevitably died, the healthy twin would be murdered as well, so both bodies could be autopsied and compared. One of the twins taken for experimentation, Eva Moses Kor, survived her ordeal in the camps and was able to write out her experiences in a memoir entitled The Twins of Auschwitz. She described the experience of life as one of Mengele's research subjects. 3 times a week, we were marched to Auschwitz to a big brick building, sort of like a big gymnasium. They would keep us there for about 6 or 8 hours at a time. Most of the days, we would have to sit naked in a large room where we first entered, and people in white jackets would observe us and write down notes. They also would study every part of our bodies. They would photograph, measure our heads and arms and bodies, and compare the measurements of one twin to another. The process seemed to go on and on. Most of the time, they would take blood from one arm, and they gave us shots in the other. After she and her sister Miriam were taken from their mother, never to see her again, Eva witnessed the unspeakable horrors of some of Mengele's more extreme experiments. In one particularly gruesome case, Mengele was said to have sewn a pair of twins together, back to back, connecting their blood vessels and organs together in an attempt to turn them into conjoined twins. This failed, resulting in nothing but horrible pain. The twins screamed in agony for days before succumbing to gangrene and dying. In another experiment, Mengele attempted to connect the urinary tract of a 7-year-old girl to her own colon. Other twins were castrated, had organs removed, or had limbs cut off, all without anything to dull the pain. Another area of interest for Mengele was eyes, particularly eye color. He selected prisoners with heterochromia for study. Sometimes he would conduct painful experiments on their eyes,
but a lot of the time he would simply have them killed, removing their eyes and sending them to a colleague at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute that shared his interest. With living test subjects, often children, he would inject adrenaline directly into their eyeballs in an attempt to change their eye color. When he wasn't doing that, he would apply eye drops that caused swelling of the eyelids and intense pain. Mengele targeted other specific groups in his tests, including dwarves and people with other physical abnormalities. He would X-ray and measure them, extract their teeth, draw blood, and inject them with various unnecessary drugs. After a few weeks of testing, he would have them killed in gas chambers and send their skeletons to his colleagues in Berlin. Pregnant women would meet a similar fate. Men, women, children, no one was safe from Mengele's experimentation. In 1985, Moshe Ofer, a survivor of the camps and Mengele's experimentation, shared a memory. He visited us as a good uncle, bringing us chocolate. Before applying the scalpel or a syringe, he would say, "Don't be afraid, nothing is going to happen to you." He injected chemical substances, performed surgery on Tibby's spine. After the experiments, he would bring us gifts. In the course of later experiments, he had pins inserted into our heads. The puncture scars are still visible. One day, he took Tibby away. My brother was gone for several days. When he was brought back, his head was all dressed in bandages. He died in my arms. Another survivor, whose name has been kept private, described her experience as a child test subject as well. "I was about 5 weeks in Auschwitz alone, separated from my family, my parents, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers. When Dr. Mengele pulled me out of a queue when we were on the way from the sea lager to the gas chamber, I was the only one picked that day personally by Mengele and his assistant. They took me to his laboratory, where I met other children. They were screaming from pain, black and blue bodies covered with blood. I collapsed from horror and terror and fainted. A bucket of cold water was thrown on me to revive me. As soon as I stood up, I was whipped with a leather whip which broke my flesh. Then I was told the whipping was a sample of what I would receive if I did not follow instructions and orders. I was used as a guinea pig for medical experiments. I was never ever given painkillers or anesthetics. Every day I suffered excruciating pain. I was injected with drugs and chemicals. My body most of the time was connected to tubes which inserted some drugs into my body. Many days I was tied up for hours. Some days they made cuts into my body and left the wounds open for them to study. Most of the time there was nothing to eat. Every day my body was numb with pain. There was no more skin left on my body for them to put injections or tubes. One day we woke up and the place was empty. We were left with open infected wounds and no food. We all were half dead with no energy or life left in us. One day Russian soldiers tried to shake me to see if I was alive or dead. They felt a tiny beat in my heart and quickly picked me up and took me to a hospital. In 2009, a man named Yitzhak Gaganin was rushed to a hospital near Tel Aviv by his family after a viral infection threatened his life. There, the doctors discovered that he had only had 1 kidney. When Gannon woke up from his surgery, he explained why that was the case and why he had avoided doctors for the last 65 years of his life. He had been one of the prisoners at Auschwitz and an unwilling test subject of Mengele. When he arrived at Auschwitz, he was taken to the hospital, forced to lie down on a table. When he did, he was tied down. Next, Mengele cut him open, removing his kidney without any anesthesia. Gannon looked at the kidney in Mengele's hand and cried, screaming, begging to die, for anything that would stop the pain. His wish was not granted. He was sent to work right away, forced to clean bloody medical instruments. He spent 6.5 months in the hospital at Auschwitz, put through a gauntlet of experiments by Mengele following his horrific surgery. During one test, he was made to sit in a bath of ice-cold water for an entire night so Mengele could study his lung function. When they had no more use for him, the Nazis planned to send him to the gas chamber, but he just barely managed to survive, to see the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet Army, and to live to tell his story. In January of 1945, as the Red Army crossed western Poland, Mengele and the rest of Auschwitz's SS personnel fled the camp. At the end of the war, he dressed himself in a German army uniform and found a place in a unit, which then surrendered to the US military at the conclusion of the war. Mengele pretended to be an ordinary German army officer and was taken as a prisoner of war but later released. All the while, his name was on a list of war criminals wanted for their crimes against humanity. He eluded justice working under an assumed name on a farm in Bavaria from 1945 to the spring of 1949. US war crimes investigators attempted to track him down, but Mengele's family lied to protect him, convincing the United States officials that Mengele had died. Mengele assumed another fake name and a new identity, fleeing Germany and traveling to Argentina. In 1956, he achieved Argentinian citizenship, living under the name Jose Mengele. But West German officials were hot on his trail and had tracked him to Argentina. In 1959, he immigrated to Paraguay, becoming a citizen there until he fled that country in order to avoid Israeli intelligence agents. He eventually settled in Brazil, where he lived until suffering a stroke in February of 1979 while swimming at a resort near Bertioga. He drowned there, and his body was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. In May of 1985, the German, Israeli, and United States governments worked together to track down Mengele once and for all. Unbeknownst to them, he was already dead. German police searched the home of a Mengele family friend and discovered evidence of his death in Brazil. In June 1985, Mengele's corpse was exhumed and positively identified. The Nazi doctor responsible for so much suffering and death had managed to live out the remainder of his life without ever being held accountable for his crimes. Though Mengele was able to escape any kind of criminal justice, other Nazi doctors were forced to answer for what they had done. On December 9, 1946, 23 German physicians and administrators were brought before an American military tribunal in Nuremberg on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Brigadier General Telford Taylor, the chief of counsel in the doctor's trial, gave his opening statement by the prosecution. The defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The victims of these crimes are numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A handful only are still alive. A few of the survivors will appear in this courtroom, but most of these miserable victims were slaughtered outright or died in the course of the tortures to which they were subjected. For the most part, they are nameless dead. To their murderers, these wretched people were not individuals at all. They came in wholesale lots and were treated worse than animals. After nearly 140 days, which included the submission of over 1,000 documents and the testimony of 85 witnesses, the judges announced their verdict on August 20, 1947. 16 doctors were found guilty and 7 were sentenced to death. These 7 were executed on June 2, 1948. Among the crimes that were uncovered during the course of the investigation and trial were stories of giving prisoners wounds without any anesthesia to test the effectiveness of various antibiotics and medications. In other cases, doctors would cut the limbs off prisoners and attempt to sew them onto others, looking to see if limb transplants could be done successfully. At Dachau, Nazi doctor Sigmund Rascher placed more than 200 prisoners into a low-pressure chamber one at a time to simulate the effects of high altitude on the human body. 80 subjects died from altitude sickness and a lack of oxygen, and the rest were killed and dissected. At the same camp, Hans Eppinger performed an experiment in which he deprived 90 people of food and forced them to drink only seawater for days. Another Dachau experiment, one of the most infamous, involved the study of hypothermia. Sigmund Rascher submerged hundreds of prisoners in ice baths for hours at a time before attempting to resuscitate them via a variety of warming methods. Approximately 1/3 of the test subjects died of hypothermia during the process. During another study conducted at Dachau, several Nazi doctors deliberately infected over 1,000 prisoners with malaria. They used either exposure to mosquitoes or injections of extracts from the mosquitoes' mucus glands to force them to contract the disease. Once they were sick, the doctors tested several drugs on them to monitor their efficacy. Many subjects died during the process, and others were left in severe pain or permanently disabled. The history of human experimentation in Nazi Germany is an atrocity, to be sure. But it didn't only happen in Germany. Though the United States fought against Germany in World War II, the two enemies had some horrific practices in common, and unethical human experimentation occurred on U.S. soil too. Several doctors during the period from the 1940s to the 1960s believed the greater good for scientific research and medical advancement mattered more than the autonomy and safety of their prisoners, mental patients, and other marginalized groups. In their pursuit of advancement and uncovering cures for infectious diseases, the Hippocratic Oath was thrown out the window. In a series of federally funded studies in the 1940s, researcher Dr. W. Paul Havens Jr. exposed men to hepatitis without their consent. Using patients from mental institutions in Middletown and Norwich, Connecticut, no new understanding of the disease was gained, but 8 healthy men were infected with hepatitis. In the mid-1940s, researchers attempted to study the transmission of a stomach illness by having young men at a New York State reformatory prison swallow unfiltered stool suspensions. In 1957, during a flu pandemic, federal researchers infected 23 inmates at a Maryland prison, spraying the virus directly into their noses. There were other disturbing experiments performed on prisoners as well, beyond just the study of infectious disease. Around 1920, Dr. L.L. Stanley, resident physician at San Quentin Prison, would implant testicles into older male prisoners. These testicles came from farm animals or sometimes even recently executed prisoners. After the Nuremberg Code was put into place in 1947, providing international protections to human test subjects, many doctors in the United States ignored them. After all, they didn't see their work as anything like the atrocities committed by the Nazi doctors. They believed that, and yet in 1963, researchers injected cancer cells into patients at a Jewish chronic disease hospital in Brooklyn to see what the impact would be. The patients were not told that this was happening. Also in New York, in Staten Island from 1963 to 1966, a medical study was conducted at Willowbrook State School for mentally disabled children. These children were given hepatitis to test potential cures. With time, the public attitude toward this sort of human experimentation turned toward disgust, and regulations were implemented to prevent similar ethical transgressions. But for several decades after the Nuremberg trials, doctors in the United States carried on the tradition of unethical human experimentation, all the while convinced they were still the good guys. No one wants to think of themselves as the villain, even when committing crimes against their fellow man.
Former Luftwaffe pilot, now SS doctor Sigmund Rascher chooses two prisoners from the lineup. Russian men barely out of their teens. These strong men have no idea they're about to become test subjects in Rascher's profoundly unethical medical experiment, bearing the innocuous title, Warming Up After Freezing to the Danger Point. A few hours later, Rascher jots down in his notebook, Subject 115763 naked, time of death 64 minutes. Subject 115306 clothed, time of death 102 minutes. This was not unusual. Those that underwent the Nazis' freezing experiments rarely escaped with their life intact. We know a little bit about the experiments of a Dr. Rascher due to the fact that many of the letters the Nazis wrote while they were experimenting on prisoners were later used in evidence during the Nuremberg trials. Take, for instance, this letter dated October 9, 1942. The correspondence is between Rascher and Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer SS. After Adolf Hitler, Himmler was the most powerful Nazi that ever shouted Sieg Heil. The letter starts with, I ask for leave to submit to you the second interim report concerning the freezing experiments. Interestingly, lower down he also wrote that Professor Holzluner declined to perform the freezing experiments on humans out of shame. Rascher then added, I shall take over the exploitation of them, meaning the humans. It seems not all Nazi doctors were happy about experimenting on humans. In the testimony of SS officer Rudolf Brandt, he talks about Himmler, stating, he further asked Rascher to submit the names of the people who were opposed to experiments on human beings and stated that such peoples were to be considered traitors. Still, if there were such traitors, they were in a very small minority. They did exist though, with Himmler writing to Rascher in one letter, I regard those people as high and national traitors who still today reject these experiments on humans and would instead let sturdy German soldiers die as a result of these cooling methods. I shall not hesitate to report these men. Such was the mindset of the inner circle of Nazis. Being outside all day during the winter in some parts of the world could easily be lethal. Ending up in the bitterly cold waters could be lethal much faster. The Germans wanted to know how to treat their soldiers when they were suffering from hypothermia. These experiments happened at the Dachau camp from August 1942 to May 1943. They consisted of freezing a person to the point of death, although sometimes that part did end in death. This was useful information for the Nazis since such experiments gave them an idea of what a person could survive. Another part of the experiment was called warming up, in which the doctors used various methods to warm someone so they didn't just survive but were brought back to good health. It was almost as if the Nazis were playing God, trying to resurrect people from what looked like certain death. What's also interesting is that there seemed to be some competition going on between various doctors, with some medical personnel expressing that experimenting on humans wasn't necessary when animals could be used. In some cases, shaved cats. Rascher told Himmler that humans were indeed better, saying in one letter that he needed more Russians. You might wonder why Russians. The answer was the Germans had to fight on the Eastern Front, where temperatures could get very low. The Germans weren't used to this. The Nazis wondered if the Russians had a genetic advantage when it came to surviving the cold, and if they did, they wanted to know why. Further down the letter, he wrote, the experiments of rewarming by body heat, which were ordered, will be carried out as soon as the women necessary for this experiment arrive, in about 2 days. I shall report the results of this experiment separately. That didn't mean that Rascher was now freezing only women, but that he was addressing Himmler's contention that the best way to warm up a freezing man was to place him between the bodies of 2 women. It was Himmler's contention that animal warmth, in this case human warmth, was better than artificial warmth. He told Rascher that a fisherwoman could take her half-frozen husband into bed and revive him in that manner. This was actual testimony from a former Nazi during the Nuremberg trials. The man who said the words was again Rudolf Brandt. The report on the rewarming of an intensely chilled human being by animal warmth stated that the experimental subjects were cooled until they all lost consciousness. The test persons were then placed between 2 naked women in a spacious bed. It was noted that several of the subjects revived sufficiently to perform sexual intercourse. These experiments were supposed to emulate what it would be like when one of their pilots was shot down and ended up in the frigid North Sea. To replicate this, sometimes prisoners were dropped into a bath of ice-cold water. According to researchers, some of them were anesthetized and others weren't. Although we said that Professor Holzlerner might have felt some amount of shame regarding the human experiments, we found a report with his name attached to it that beggars belief. The other names were Rasher and Dr. Finke. The letter concerned giving narcotics to a person before they were forced into the ice bath. It started, if the experimental subject was placed in the water under narcosis, one observed a certain arousing effect. The subject began to groan and made some defensive movements. In a few cases, the state of excitation developed. This was especially severe in the cooling of head and neck. The report said that the person then suffered from a kind of rigor, after which the subject started twitching. The report concluded, with still more marked sinking of body temperature, it suddenly ceased. These cases ended fatally without any successful results from resuscitation efforts. Some subjects were naked, but others were fully dressed, usually in German Air Force uniforms to create a facsimile of natural conditions. Rasher's letters illuminate the details. He wrote in one report, "The experimental subjects were placed in water, dressed in complete flying uniform, winter or summer combination, and with an aviator's helmet. A life jacket made out of rubber kapok was to prevent submerging. In one experimental series, the occiput, or brainstem, protruded above the water, while in another series of experiments, the occiput, brainstem, and back of the head were submerged in the water." We'll come back to why he didn't always fully submerge the person. The doctors checked the person's body temperature throughout and also wrote down obvious clinical manifestations, which in simple terms just means the outward signs of what happened to the freezing person. They also checked for biochemical and physiologic changes, which again relate to the changes in the body. If the person died, an autopsy would reveal more information. So there was Dr. Rasher thinking he was doing his bit for the cause. During the Nuremberg trials, his experiments were called inhumane and criminal. And of course, they were. But what's also so strange about the man is he lied when he wrote down the findings of his experiments, or at least he lied from time to time. This didn't help the cause at all. It's now said that Rasher was operating under the orders of another person. That was Erich Hipke, the chief medical officer of the Luftwaffe. Together, they came up with the ice-cold water experiments, and they also left some prisoners outside in the cold during the winter months at Dachau, usually naked. The reports we have now state that when left outside, they were usually there for around 14 hours. As for the tub of ice, that could be up to 3 hours, although most people died well before that. The prisoners were usually male, but of various nationalities and ethnicities. We can't always be sure who was part of the experiments because the Nazis destroyed much of the evidence when the war was lost. But thanks to those letters, as well as a 228-page report from the investigator, Leo Alexander, we know some things. We know that the prisoners were forced to do the experiment most of the time, but sometimes they volunteered on the promise that they'd be awarded for their participation. It's reported that those rewards weren't given if the person survived. In total, there were between 360 to 400 experiments, which amounted to between 280 and 300 victims. The temperature of the bath that people were dropped into was sometimes between 2 and 12 degrees Celsius. During the winter, the North Sea's temperature is usually about 6 degrees Celsius. As for hypothermia, that occurs when the temperature of the body drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So if a person sits in a bath of water that's around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, very serious injury and death can happen pretty fast, within possibly 30 to 90 minutes or around the 1 to 3 hour mark, depending on various factors. It's these factors that the Nazis wanted to understand. In some of the reports, the Nazis wrote that when a person was immersed in water that was 5 degrees Celsius, they could generally tolerate it for about 1 hour. If the water was 15 degrees Celsius, they would usually last about 4 or 5 hours. One report said that no test subjects survived having their body temperature dropped to 25 degrees Celsius and then being heated up to 28 degrees Celsius. Some prisoners who later testified to seeing the experiment said they saw around 90 people die, but noted that some did survive after being warmed up. They also said 2 people became mentally ill, but we don't know when this mental illness occurred. The onset of severe reactions to the cold was fast, as was stated in another report. It said the rapidity of which numbness occurs is remarkable. It was determined that already 5 to 10 minutes after falling in, an advanced rigor of the skeletal muscle sets in, which renders the movement of the arms especially increasingly difficult. That report also said that these considerations had to be taken seriously given that German soldiers in cold water would likely lose most of their manual dexterity. The report noted it is certainly extremely difficult even at the beginning of numbness to climb onto a rubber raft, to blow up a rubber raft for one person, or to make use of instruments or to signal or call. One of the ways the Nazis warmed prisoners up was by immersing them in hot water, but that was too very dangerous. It produces a kind of shock, what we now call rewarming shock or the afterdrop effect. You can look at any medical website these days and it'll tell you that if you're dealing with a person suffering from hypothermia, do not put them in a hot bath. Instead, passively warm them using dry, unheated blankets. Dr. Rasher disagreed with this, stating that passive rewarming didn't work. He wrote in one report, "Rewarming by animal warmth, animal bodies or women's bodies would be too slow." He explained this by saying, during attempts to save severely chilled persons, it was shown that rapid rewarming was in all cases preferable to slow rewarming because after removal from the cold water, the body temperature continued to drop rapidly. According to research, the Nazis used at least 7 different procedures to warm a person. We know that in 2 experiments a warm bath was used, although some witnesses later said they saw someone being immersed into boiling hot water. We also know that massage was used in some experiments, as were heated light sources. But again, there isn't much data as to how they worked. We should say here that in Rasher's reports there are a lot of inconsistencies, which is one reason why things didn't end too well for that guy. Rasher's report also stated heart failure was the reason for freezing experiment deaths, but that's also come into question, as has his conviction that if a person is not immersed above the neck, he won't become hypothermic. Academics now state that Rasher was not even qualified to conduct such experiments, which is why it seems they were either botched or the results were made up or exaggerated. One scientist later wrote, "The Reichsfuhrer expressed special interest in the hypothermia project and traveled to Dachau several times to witness experiments. Thus, the study represents a private venture by 2 unqualified ideologues, conducted in a prison setting quite alien to the standards of academic environment." We now know that because Rasher was so close to Himmler, no other scientists dare question what he did, even though they knew full well he was somewhat of a charlatan. At the Nuremberg trials, it was said that their connections were so strong that practically every superior trembled in fear of intriguing Rasher, who consequently held a position of enormous power. When you hear this next bit of information, you'll agree that he certainly fitted the glove of what we call mad scientist. With so many dead bodies around him, Rasher made use of some of the human skin. With it, he created saddles, riding breeches, ladies' handbags, and other personal items. He sold what he made to some of his colleagues. But his end would come when it was discovered that some of his children weren't his, and he actually abducted them. He was also accused of killing his lab assistant and of being a scientific fraud. For these reasons, he ended up in Dachau himself. Himmler felt this guy he'd protected and supported for so long had not only lied to him, but made him a fool. On Himmler's orders, on the 26th of April 1945, Rasher was killed by firing squad in his cell. The last words that Rasher heard were, "You pig, now you've got the punishment you deserve." Well, that's if he lived long enough to hear them. In the 1980s, some scientists said the data might be useful to help save lives. Baruch Cohen, a Holocaust researcher, had something to say about that. He said, although use of Nazi data might benefit some lives, a larger bioethical problem arises. By conferring a scientific martyrdom on the victims, it would tend to make them our retrospective guinea pigs, and we their retrospective torturers. For some time, it was assumed that Rasher's experiments could be of some use, but academics were quick to state that there was great risk thinking these grotesque Nazi medical exercises yielded results worthy of consideration and possibly of benefit to humanity. It's thought the number of victims was around 27,000 for all the various experiments, with about twice as many men as women. About 20% of the victims were Jewish, with about 2% being Roma and Sinti. Other ethnicities were stated as other or unknown. When we look at the nationalities, there were many. The countries with the most victims of experiments were Germany, Poland, Russia, Hungary, and Austria, although over 6,000 cases were marked as unknown nationality. There were some countries' residents picked out for lesser-known experiments, such as a handful of British commandos who were captured in Norway. The Nazis tested new kinds of amphetamines on them in high-performance experiments. A German soldier sits in a muddy trench hoping for a hiatus in what's been constant shelling for hours. Unbeknownst to him, noxious gas wafting over no man's land will be over him soon. These so-called king of battle gases is about to change his life forever. Some years later, the Nazis didn't want to see a repeat of this. All sides during the First World War used mustard gas. It was potent and very effective in hurting your enemy. even when gas masks were worn. When they weren't being worn, soldiers would sometimes report smelling burned garlic or rubber or even dead horses. That's when they knew they were in trouble. The gas was also said to smell like horseradish, hence why it got the name mustard gas. You might have thought until now that soldiers were throwing pots of spicy Hellmann's mustard at each other, but the gas was actually a bunch of pernicious chemical compounds, not a delicious condiment. If inhaled in vast quantities, the soldier was always going to have a very bad day. The effects of the gas were not immediate, but if breathed in, there was no way out. At first, the victim's eyes would tear. This would intensify until it became very painful, sometimes leading to temporary blindness. Make no mistake, mustard gas could kill, but in warfare, almost blinding a complete regiment was certainly a way to get ahead. It also produced blisters on a soldier's skin, which weren't just irritable, they often popped and turned into oozing wounds, therefore putting the soldier at risk of getting a dangerous infection. If that wasn't bad enough, there were long-term effects of exposure. One of them was cancer. It was hard to get away from the stuff since it stuck to clothes. A soldier's body could then be severely burned, bad enough to cause immense pain, disfigurement, and over time death. This is how a wartime British nurse explained treating soldiers injured by mustard gas. They cannot be bandaged or touched. We cover them with a tent of propped-up sheets. Gas burns must be agonizing because usually the other cases do not complain, even with the worst wounds, but gas cases are invariably beyond endurance, and they cannot help crying out. Bear in mind, we're about to tell you how the Nazis used this gas on prisoners. There were other milder long-term effects too. As the British soldier Cecil Withers explained after the war, "I suffer badly from phlegm and from coughs and colds a lot. That all started when the British were shelling hard at the last Battle of Selma. One of the shells distributed the residue of mustard gas that had been lying there for months. They talk about secondary smoking, I got secondary gas. Mustard gas didn't just blister the skin, it also blistered the lungs. In a bad case, the end result was pulmonary edema, and sometimes death. In fact, just to give you a better idea of how dangerous this stuff was, making the shells in factories injured and killed people in Germany, Britain, France, and the US, the country that ended up making the most mustard gas weapons. One paper we found on this topic said, the most dangerous job, regardless of location, involved filling artillery gas shells. This produced even more injuries than normal chemical production, and German workers suffered as much as British, French, and American workers. As you can see, mustard gas was a useful weapon, albeit some folks thought it was unethical. Others said, hey, if you can blow a man's head off and shove a bayonet through his heart, why can't you kill him slowly with gas? The typical British response to mustard gas must have been, it's just not cricket, meaning it's not how things were done. Obviously, supporters of the gas likely never went within 100 miles of a trench. Mustard gas was first used by German troops on July 12, 1917, near Ypres, Belgium. The victims of the gas were British and Canadian soldiers. Chemical weapons were nothing new at the time. All sides were using them. But it was the Germans that got ahead with the king of battle gases. U.S. soldiers also suffered once they were in the war in 1917. Harry L. Gilchrist, medical director of the Gas Service, U.S. Army Expeditionary Force, wrote about what happened to some U.S. troops hit with the gas. He said, at first the troops didn't notice the gas and were not uncomfortable. But in the course of an hour or so, there was marked inflammation in their eyes. They vomited. Later, there was severe blistering of the skin, especially where the uniform had been contaminated. The men were virtually blind and had to be led about. On top of that, not knowing when some gas would waft into them really messed up soldiers' minds. Many suffered from kinds of PTSD called gas fright. By the time the war had finished, untold numbers of men suffered from psychological conditions. While only around 90,000 men died from chemical agents, about 1.3 million suffered gas injuries. Okay, so you don't need much more convincing that mustard gas was a formidable weapon that not only set back an army but also ruined a man's life. That's why the Germans were so dead set on trying to create something to protect their soldiers during the next war. But as you know, the Nazis didn't exactly wait for the German equivalent of FDA approval before using an agent. They also didn't have too many scruples about human testing during experimental trials. That's because they had concentration camps full of people they deemed enemies and generally just inferior to their master race. These people they thought were entirely expendable. They could be tested on, pulled apart, frozen, and when they did, they were useful for autopsy purposes. As always, years later, when it came to experimentation, everything had to go through Adolf Hitler's #1 man, the guy said to be the architect of the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler. Some of the letters written to him were discovered after the Nazis were beaten. We found one written by Ernst Robert Grawitz, a physician to Hitler, and before that, someone who was part of Nazis' mass euthanasia program. He also took part in experiments in which he tried to cure homosexuality. In the letter, he talked about experimenting with the N substance. This referred to chlorine gas, not mustard gas, which was very useful during the previous war, albeit not too effective when the enemy donned its gas masks. This is part of the original letter in translation. In accordance with these investigation experiments carried out on the 25th of September 1944, the necessity has now arisen to carry out several experiments on human beings for the final clarification of the physiological effect of N substance on and through human skin. He asked for 5 prisoners, stating that it was improbable that the experiment will cause any permanent damage. The Nazis maimed and killed many people in various experiments, so we don't know why exactly Grawitz stated that part. We do know such experiments were kept secret as much as possible from the people in the camps, and we also know that injured persons did not make good workers. We found another letter written by Grawitz again to Himmler, but this time about something called the LOST program. LOST was a kind of sulfur gas. It got the name from 2 people that invented it, Wilhelm Limmel and Wilhelm Steinhaus. The prisoners had already been purposefully injured by the gas, and the experiment consisted of trying to treat them, just as any German soldier would require medical help on the battlefield. The letter states, the persons experimented on suffered considerably under the wound caused by LOST. The arms in most of the cases are badly swollen and the pains are enormous. In 4 cases, the wounds became infected. We then find out that drug H did nothing to help the specific wounds caused by LOST. Drug H was otherwise known as the Holzmann remedy. The emphasis when using LOST was usually to burn the prisoner with the stuff until the horrible blisters formed. The Nazis then treated the burns with various drugs. Evidence tells us this happened at Sachsenhausen camp in 1939, at Natzweiler camp from 1942 to 1944, and at Neuengamme camp only in 1944. Also, as you already know, just making the shells that carried the gas was dangerous business, so the Nazis of course sometimes used camp inmates to do just that. On September 8, 1939, Polish troops hit German troops with mustard gas after blowing up a bridge at a place called Jaslo. 14 German soldiers were injured and 2 died. According to one researcher, the incident immediately led to an investigation by German chemical warfare experts. The Nazis were somewhat upset, so they took 31 prisoners and experimented on them. They did this at Sachsenhausen camp, which was mainly used for German political prisoners and Soviet prisoners. But other nationalities stayed and died there too. About 12,000 men died there from malnutrition and disease. Others were just shot or died in experiments. We know the prisoners suffering from mustard gas experiments were treated with the experimental drug Freskin, a powder codenamed F1000 and F1001. We also know various ointments were used for their infections. What we don't know is what happened to most of these guinea pigs. One survivor tells his story though. He was Hans Kargl, a German political prisoner. Kargl was a prominent anti-fascist in Germany, and so the Nazis convicted him of high treason and labeled him as an enemy of Hitler. He later wrote that at the camp he had a yellow liquid pasted over his arms. This was a liquid form of mustard gas. He said he came out in painful blisters which then became open wounds. He was then treated with 2 ointments, which caused intense pain. The Nazi doctors recorded the healing process with photographs and film. Later, another 8 prisoners suffered a similar fate, but 2 of them had Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, and Pneumococcus bacteria rubbed into the open wounds. This is what a researcher wrote about that. The infected prisoners developed sepsis with high temperatures, shivering, swelling of the glands, and enlarged spleens. The prisoners' suffering led to the insight that neither Holzmann's remedy nor the Freskin powder had any healing effect on the mustard gas wounds or the infections. Okay, so the experiment failed. The Nazis tried again, of course. They also performed more experiments with the substance LOST. 1 gram of it was smeared onto the arms of several prisoners. So much of it was applied to them that their wounds became necrotic, although it seems the Nazis were able to treat those. Later at the Natzweiler camp, things went a little different. LOST was still applied to prisoners, but now a Dr. August Hirt treated the prisoners by giving them injections of vitamins. He's better known for his Jewish skeleton collection experiments. He also stood out having severe facial injuries from fighting in the First War. On November 25, 1942, 15 inmates were picked out for testing. It turns out that the earlier tests done on animals were not applicable to humans. The application for vitamin A had worked on rats, but in humans it actually made the wounds worse. Then they conducted what they called a major rat experiment using 1,000 rats and 4 different vitamins. Humans came next, 15 of them. They were all German political prisoners, according to Hendrik Nails, a former Dutch inmate. All suffered terrible festering wounds over their entire bodies. Some of them went blind, 3 died in horrible pain just after, and 2 more died within a few days. The reason for death was edema of the lungs or pneumonia. Hurt then wrote up his report stating that vitamins A, B complex, and C by mouth seemed to work, as did vitamin B1 when injected with glucose. What he totally left out of the report were the severe injuries, the extreme pain, and the deaths. The Nazis also experimented with phosgene gas, which is similar to mustard gas. In June 1943, up to 150 prisoners at Natzweiler camp were dosed with some of this thin gas, and around 50 of them suffocated in agony. Although apparently scholars debate this today. More experiments happened, often using German prisoners, but also gypsy prisoners taken from another camp. They were gassed, and then doctors gave them a drug called urotropin orally, while others got nothing, and some received injections of urotropin. A survivor named Willy Hertzberg said he and others were led to the gas chamber where a Nazi doctor threw vials on the floor and smashed them with his feet. He then walked out and the doors were locked. In about 10 minutes, Hertzberg said that all he could hear was muffled splashing caused by what he assumed was bursting lungs. He said prisoners were on all fours, writhing around with foam coming out of their mouths. As for himself, he said the pain was as if someone was sticking needles into his lungs. He said on his chest he felt a pressure, as if hundreds of kilos were put upon it. 14 people suffered pulmonary edema, 4 German gypsy inmates died. They were Zirko Rebstock, 37, Adalbert Eckstein, 20, Andreas Holdowski, 32, and Joseph Reinhardt, 38. As terrible as it was a result for the Nazis, who worked out just how much urotropin could be used to limit the effects of usually lethal phosgene poisoning. We now come to the last experiments. These were conducted by Ludwig Werner Haas at the Neuengamme camp. He was trying to develop a drug that would help German soldiers who'd been poisoned with the blister agent lewisite. It also caused terrible burns that festered and got infected, but if soldiers swallowed the stuff, which was very possible, they could be looking at severe internal tissue damage after painful bouts of vomiting. Haas wrote to Himmler, and Himmler gave him the green light to start testing on prisoners. Notably, Haas was one of Hitler's favored physicians. Haas believed that adding hypochlorous acid to water could have a positive effect on men poisoned with lewisite. First, he had to see what happened when men drank water with hypochlorous acid in it. He had the water supply contaminated, and 10,000 prisoners drank the water. They were all okay. This was progress. So then the doctor and his associates took 150 men and laced their water with lewisite. They drank that and then had to drink water with hypochlorous acid in it to see if it affected their perhaps rapidly declining health. Other experiments used nitrogen mustard as the poison. According to research, low doses of these poisons in the water didn't seem to damage the unwitting prisoners. Haas then said he wanted to give the prisoners high, harmful doses and others smaller doses to work out the right amount of hypochlorous acid to put in the water. To this, Himmler actually said no. His reason was the current situation. That was the advancing Allied troops in Germany soon to lose the war. And that just about covers the chemical agent experiments at the camps.
Lines of emaciated, ragged-looking Soviet men sit down for their evening meal of potato and turnip soup at the notorious Buchenwald concentration camp. Some of them are already dying from starvation, and so are marked out for execution. These are the so-called Muselmänner. But on this day, the Nazis have something else on the menu, something as grotesque and heartless as anything in the annals of human depravity. As Nazi officers and doctors stand in the distance, their clipboards and pens clasped in their hands, one by one, 4 prisoners drop to the floor. What kind of wicked experiment is this, think the other prisoners, shaking their heads and dreaming of revenge. It's possible some of them would have heard rumors about the human experimentation in the camps. The fact that some people went to see the doctor and either came back in agony with sometimes serious injuries or didn't come back at all. Thousands of prisoners at these camps became guinea pigs for Nazi physicians, whose abject lack of medical ethics would one day lead to the development of the Nuremberg Code. Today, we'll focus on a few kinds of experiments that have happened at Buchenwald and tell you why they happened and the horrors the Americans saw when they liberated the camp on April 11, 1945. First of all, we mentioned something that you might not be familiar with, Muselmänner. The singular form of the word is Muselmann. While it might sound similar to muscle man, it was exactly the opposite. It was a word designated for prisoners who were so starved, so weak, so lost in apathy and meaning that they were unable to stand, never mind work. There are varying theories as to where the word came from, but it almost certainly has its basis in the word Muslim. A Musulman meant Muslim man, which may have been related to the Muslim practice of sujood, when Muslims prostrate themselves in prayer. The prisoners, their muscles atrophied, might have been bent over like this through sheer lack of energy. Another theory coming from Buchenwald says it relates to Islamic fatalism, meaning the men were resigned to thinking they could not do anything about their future. In any case, when prisoners started looking like this, it usually wasn't long until they were sent to the gas chamber, or shot, or became victims of some cruel experiment. It's the latter that interests us today. We also mentioned Soviet men who, like the Jews, were deemed as subhuman by the Nazis. They were treated with the utmost disrespect and hated by the Nazis, said to be a wart on the earth that needed to be eliminated. So, if they showed the slightest sign they were about to become unable to serve as a laborer, the Nazis wouldn't think twice about executing them. The Germans were involved in a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, and as Aryans, they thought it was their right to relieve the world of what they said were subhuman Slavs. Soviet prisoners of war, some 5.3 million of them throughout World War II, were fair game for torture and death, according to Nazi ideology. It's believed about 3.3 million Soviet POWs died throughout the war while in Nazi custody, although the exact number of how many died in the camps is unknown. At well over a 50% death rate, the number is startling when we compare it to the deaths of British and American POWs held by the Nazis. Of 231,000 Brits and Americans, about 8,300 or 3.6% died at the hands of the German captors. Since the Nazis came to power and up until their fast downfall, they operated over 1,000 concentration camps, known as Konzentrationslager, in Germany and all over German-occupied Europe. These were often split into subcamps, such as Mauthausen, often called a Russian camp, which had about 100 subcamps. Actually, the camps, including Mauthausen, held all kinds of prisoners. They held millions of Jews and Soviets, but also other groups of people, including homosexuals, Roma people, German anarchists, Czechoslovak socialists, Polish Boy Scouts, Jehovah's Witnesses, and just about anyone the Nazis deemed a threat. The camp we'll discuss in detail today also held regular German criminals who became a part of the medical experiments. One of the main motives behind the construction of this concentration camp network was to make money by using prisoners as slave labor. Well-known German companies such as the pharmaceutical giant Bayer made good use of these camps, as did companies working in heavy industries. At Mauthausen, many prisoners died of exhaustion and starvation working in the stone quarry, which prisoners said began with the stares of death. One of the prisoners who survived later said, "If you stopped for a moment, the SS either shot you or pushed you off the cliff to your death." But Mauthausen didn't have a gas chamber, so it wasn't what we'd call an extermination camp per se. The prisoners were there to work, and work they did, although their life expectancy was but a few months. While there were 6 main extermination camps with gas chambers: Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, at the concentration camps people often didn't last long either, and were also exterminated when they were no longer useful. Many Soviets died in the labor camps, while as much as 90% of the 6 million Jews the Nazis murdered died at the extermination camps. Let's now talk about the Buchenwald concentration camp. Opened in July 1937, it was one of the first large-scale concentration camps, and its unlucky occupants at the start were communists or suspected communists. During the war, it also got an influx of Poles, Slavs, Jews, Roma people, mentally ill, disabled, homosexual, and political prisoners who all lived and worked at the camp. It was notorious for its terrible conditions and lack of food, which is one reason, on top of the summary executions, why around 60,000 of the 280,000 prisoners died there or at one of its 139 subcamps. There was just one set of barracks set aside for the 500 to 1,000 women that were sent to Buchenwald, some of whom were forced to work as Nazi sex slaves. Buchenwald was partly a brothel, but as we said, the main reason for its existence was so private German companies could pay the SS peanuts and get the prisoners working for them. Work often related in some way to armament production. It was a rare thing during the war for Western POWs to end up in Nazi concentration camps. They almost always went to one of Germany's 1,000 POW camps. The two should not be mixed up. One was hell on earth. The others had rules about food rations, labor, and how much rest a prisoner should get. Conditions were sometimes tough, but the Germans usually adhered to the Geneva Convention that they had signed in 1929. Even when 169 Allied airmen ended up at Buchenwald, an unusual occurrence, only 2 of the airmen from the list, mostly American, British, and Canadian soldiers, perished during the 3 months they were there. Still, one of them, who died only in 2021, retired 2nd Lieutenant Russell Hilding, said they all endured hunger, thirst, and beatings. Even so, none of them were even close to becoming Muslemaner. For the Germans, the Soviets were a completely different breed. There were no rules, quite literally, where treatment of Soviet POWs was concerned. The camp also had a fairly large homosexual population. Homosexuality was a crime in Germany at the time under paragraph 175 of the law, which was amended under the Nazis to say homosexual love inclines people toward plague-like propagation. About 7,000 men were convicted of homosexuality under the Nazis, after which they either agreed to have their God-given sexuality re-educated out of them, or they ended up being sent to the front line or to camps. One of these camps was Buchenwald. In 1943, the so-called architect of the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler, issued an order stating that all incorrigible homosexual offenders should be sent to the camps. When they got to Buchenwald, they sometimes ended up visiting part of the camp with the fancy title, the Division for Typhus and Virus Research of the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS. This is where they were, as the name suggests, purposefully infected with typhus and other viruses. The barracks, Block 46, looked like a hospital block and was cut off with barbed wire from the rest of the camp. The person in charge was a chief physician who worked under the German bacteriologist and the chief of Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS, Joachim Mrgolgowski. Typhus was just one disease that prisoners were infected with. At Buchenwald, the Nazis also tested vaccines for other infectious diseases such as erysipelas, a skin infection, scarlet fever, or paratyphoid diarrhea. The pharmaceutical companies worked in tandem with the Nazis and their war effort, as getting ahead in vaccine technology could potentially save the lives of a lot of men on the front lines. As well as being poisoned, we'll talk more about that soon, homosexuals, Soviets, criminals, and political prisoners were all infected with diseases, so the Nazis could test experimental vaccines. A breach of the Nuremberg Code, if of course there was a Nuremberg Code at the time. As we said, it was created because of such experiments. The strange thing about Block 46 was that when prisoners were sent there, they first thought they'd gotten lucky. Inside, there were 4 large rooms, which had spotless floors, and the beds they were provided were actual beds rather than bunks, all contained in what was a very modern clinic. The prisoners arrived there after living in absolute squalor. In the journal of a survivor named Robert Waits, he wrote, "The bed linen was clean and had pretty coverlets and pillowcases in a blue and white check pattern." He said it was so quiet it reminded him of a monastery. The nurses were nice enough, and the staff, actual prisoners, were happy as the job provided them numerous perks. He wrote, "The meals served in this barrack were bigger and more varied, compared with the standard camp rations. Milk, half a liter per patient, butter, 50 grams, white bread, an egg, marmalade or artificial honey, sugar, sweetened porridge, semolina, or a milk noodle soup." Wow, jackpot! The prisoners thought they were onto a winner. Little did they know they were about to get a shot of typhus, although it must be said that some of them already had typhus. According to Waits' report, some even volunteered, knowing that if they survived, they'd live for 3 months in relative luxury. The incorrigible criminals, Russians, homosexuals, and political prisoners had no choice in the matter. So, Block 46 was a hospital both for patients who had caught typhus in the natural way and a station for research on human subjects with experimentally induced typhus. Either way, they were in trouble. Their life was now in the hands of a Dr. Erwin Ding Schuler, who was the head doctor at the camp and the main man at the Hygiene Institute, who, you'll remember, worked for Mrgolgowski. From January 1942 to March 1945, Ding Schuler led the program for 9 series of tests with possible typhus vaccines developed at the camp. 988 prisoners all took part, 1/4 died, with the rest becoming seriously injured. Here's what one report stated regarding just one experiment with typhus. 9 out of the 10 prisoners injected intravenously died. Only 1 of the 4 injected subcutaneously died. The most common cause of death was encephalitis or cardiovascular collapse. Working under Ding Schuler was the camp doctor, Waldemar Hoven, and the head prisoner nurse at the typhus ward, prison trustee Arthur Dietsch, as well as Ding Schuler's medical clerk, the camp survivor and future historian, Eugen Kogan. It was one big, unhappy family. It's thanks to Kogan, who'd been arrested by the Gestapo in Germany in 1936 for working for anti-National Socialist forces, that we know a lot about what happened in the camp. He said he saw many prisoners die from the experiments, but also said that he saw Ding Schuler actually save prisoners' lives at times. Kogan saved a few men too, by swapping their names for guys who'd already passed away from typhus. Both he and Dietsch later found out that the Nazis planned to exterminate them both when the experiments ended. The prisoners faced a lot more challenges than just disease, though. The Buchenwald experiments were also part of the Nazis' chemical warfare program. We now know the pharmaceutical companies paid the SS to test 2 neurotoxic substances, the nerve agents Tabin and Sarin. Poisons of the alkaloid group were also tested and given to at least 4 Soviet soldiers in order to see their reaction. When the doctors' trials took place after the war, one person testified that when the poisons proved not to be fatal, the men were strangled and taken to the crematorium and dissected. The same trial revealed that some men were given serious phosphorus burns so the doctors could treat them with experimental balms. They did this to test how to treat those injuries on the battlefield. Let's get back to the star of today's show, poison. At the beginning, some types of poison were secretly mixed into the prisoners' food. It was said in the trials that they died instantly, after which their bodies were taken for autopsy, where valuable information could be learned. It was also said that in September 1944, some test subjects at Buchenwald were shot with poisoned bullets, but we can't find much information about this other than people testified that it happened. On Wednesday, the 18th of April, 1945, The Guardian in the UK wrote, "Escorted by American military police, 1,000 of the citizens of the Weimar marched 6 miles through lovely country to the Buchenwald concentration camp yesterday." This was part of the early denazification process to show the German people what the Nazis had done in those camps. Many cried, some puked, and some fainted when they saw the horrors in front of them. When the Americans liberated the camp, they found what the Guardian said were blackened frames of bodies still in the ovens and 2 piles of emaciated dead in the yard outside. Through huts were living skeletons too ill or weak to rise, lay packed in 3-tier bunks. Men in the camp were still dying at a rate of about 40 a day. The Guardian wrote, "Doctors say this one will die today, that one tomorrow, and others may have a month to live. Such is Nazism." In all, an estimated 56,545 died at the camp, most from diseases and starvation, but over 8,000 were shot in the head. 1,000 were hanged, and hundreds died from the medical experiments. The survivors had lived so long on thin barley, potato, or turnip soup that it was dangerous for the Americans to give their emaciated bodies anything more than 300 grams of bread a day. Their stomachs had to slowly adapt to their new diet for several days after they were liberated. One of the Americans later remembered what happened when he had at first unknowingly given them evidently too much food. He wrote that a few of them devoured the items and then passed out and died on the spot. Another wrote, "The lesson was learned quickly. Feeding starving people in a spirit of compassion is a task that requires patience." It was such an awful sight, something that traumatized many of the American soldiers. A 23-year-old Army sergeant wrote home to his sister the next day saying, "I was there yesterday, and I still can't get the sight of those poor souls out of my mind." At least 70 of those U.S. soldiers donated their blood to those helpless people who were so sick they needed transfusions. One of the U.S. medics wrote, "The mental disturbance of the inmates was very apparent. It took anywhere from a week to 3 weeks for most of the inmates to realize the significance of the fact that they were now among friends and Americans who had liberated the camp." Another said he lived with it all his life, saying that after that day, the only thing that vanished was our innocence. But what happened to the doctors of the Buchenwald camp who were partly responsible for all the sorrow and pain? Gerhard Rose, a tropical medicine doctor who took part in the typhus experiments, said at trial he understood that the prisoners were going to be sentenced to death anyway, so what did it matter? In his defense, his lawyer argued that American doctors had experimented on prisoners in Manila because those prisoners had been sentenced to death, and one of them died in the experiments. "What's the difference?" said the lawyer. Rose, he said, was just a legally appointed executioner. But that's where other witnesses, including Kogan, said those prisoners were actually not sentenced to die. Most were merely guinea pigs. Rose was sentenced to life in prison. Like many Nazis, Ding Schuler ensured he was dead before he could be hanged. But other doctors involved with the Buchenwald experiments, including Joachim Muragowski and Waldemar Hoven, ended up swinging by a rope. The year is 1945 and the war to save Europe is over. The victorious Allies have crushed the Nazi war machine, and as the secrets of the Reich are leaked to the world, stories of the horrible atrocities they committed on Jews, homosexuals, people with intellectual disabilities, and prisoners of war lay bare the true horror that was the Third Reich. Yet in the shadow of Nazi atrocities, the British intelligence services would set up a camp whose human rights violations would mirror many of those committed by the Nazis, a horrendous interrogation camp that turned men into living skeletons. In an interview in the early 2000s, surviving German citizens spoke of August 1st, 1945, the day that the British arrived at the small resort town of Bad Nendorf. The town had until then been occupied by what the Germans called easygoing American infantrymen. But with the arrival of the British, the Americans left,
The British troops gave the orders to every civilian to be ready to evacuate the town in 90 minutes, leaving people with little time to gather what precious few possessions they still had after the long war. Many initially thought that the move was temporary and that they would soon be allowed to return home, but as the British troops began to put up barbed wire and tear out the fancy baths from the town's bathhouse, the realization that their former home was being turned into something else soon hit them. There would be no returning home, at least not for years to come. The British strung up barbed wire throughout the town center and tore out the doors to each of the bathhouse's cubicles, replacing them with large steel doors so as to turn them into cells. Even before the town had been evacuated fully, the first truckloads of prisoners had already begun arriving. Initially, most of the prisoners were former Nazi Party members or members of the much-hated SS, all rounded up so as to thwart any possibility of a Nazi insurgency in the rebuilding of post-war Germany. Many, however, were leading industrialists of the Nazi regime, tobacco importers, oil company bosses, and forestry owners who had benefited greatly from Hitler's rule. However, as the months passed, the prison population quickly grew to include a large number of suspected Soviet agents. As Germany was partitioned between East and West, and the first chills of the Cold War descended on Europe, many officers of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, were captured on spy missions and imprisoned in the camp. However, the anti-Soviet paranoia had also swept up a large number of German leftists and communist sympathizers. Others were simply German citizens who lived in the Russian zone and had been captured crossing the line. Some of these had come across offering to spy on Russians and were imprisoned on suspicion of being double agents. Others were normal people caught up in the great power struggle. One man who starved to death, Franz Osterreicher, had been arrested with forged papers while attempting to enter the British zone. His motivation? To find and be reunited with his gay lover. Another man, Walter Bergman, had offered to spy for the British, but because he spoke fluent Russian, he fell under suspicion and was imprisoned and tortured in an attempt to establish that he was a genuine defector. Bergman would die of starvation and lack of medical care. Yet other prisoners were locked up for no good reason at all. One prisoner who was a former diplomat remained locked up simply because during his incarceration he had learned too much about British interrogation methods. Fearing he would leave the camp and report on British methods to either the press or the Soviet intelligence services, the British decided instead to keep him locked up. Another person who was kept prisoner for 8 months had arrived there due to nothing more than a simple clerical error. A British inspector from Scotland Yard, Tom Hayward, would later be assigned to determine what exactly went down in this prison camp while being run by British intelligence, and his notes would go on to say that of the prisoners, there are a number against whom no offense has been alleged, and the only authority for their detention would appear to be that they are citizens of a country still nominally at war with us. Hayward's investigation would spill the secrets of Britain's most infamous prison camp and of its staggering human rights abuses. Observers noted that in his report to the government, anger and revulsion leapt from every page as he detailed the place where prisoners had been systematically beaten and exposed to extreme cold, starved to death, and tortured with instruments that the British intelligence officers had recovered from a Gestapo prison in Hamburg. During the British occupation, it was said that if you snuck up to the barbed wire fence at night, you could hear the screams of the prisoners inside. Others, however, say that the camp was the most sinister place on earth, precisely because of its dead silence, with one witness saying, "You never ever saw anyone, and you never heard a sound." Bad Nendorf quickly became known as Das Verbotendorf, the Forbidden Village. The commanding officer of the Bad Nendorf prison camp was Colonel Robin Tin Eye Stevens, who had previously commanded Camp 020 in Surrey, where the German spies had been interrogated during the war. Widely regarded as an authoritarian and a xenophobe with a legendary temper, Stevens boasted that interrogators who could break a man were born, not made. The camp would go on to employ 20 interrogators, 12 of whom were British. The other 8 were mostly German Jewish refugees, who were purposefully recruited because of their expected ruthlessness toward the German and Soviet prisoners both, given how much the Jews had suffered at the hands of both powers. The guards who secured the facility were also largely made up of British Army soldiers who had received suspended sentences for assault or desertion, and as Scotland Yard Inspector Hayward would comment, they were the sort of individuals likely to resort to violence on helpless men. It is clear that the camp at Bad Nendorf was carefully engineered to be as cruel as possible, down to the men who were employed to guard or or interrogate the inmates within it. Those imprisoned there were frequently starved on purpose, woken up during the night, and then forced to walk up and down their cells from early morning until late at night, with breaks only for meals. Driven to the very edge of complete physical exhaustion, the process was thought to break the will of the prisoners so they could be more easily interrogated. When moving between different areas of the camp, the prisoners were expected to run, and if they failed to move quickly enough, the soldiers would kick at them to encourage them to move faster. Some guards had also been instructed to physically assault certain prisoners so as to reduce them to a state of complete physical collapse and thus make them more amenable to interrogation. Frequent beatings coupled with exhaustion and starvation were all carefully used tools to ensure prisoners cooperated with their interrogators. Whippings also made up part of the guards' cruel repertoire of tortures, a fact that Inspector Hayward initially considered unbelievable until Scotland Yard interrogated former guards who corroborated the allegations. Along with the physical torments, prisoners were also psychologically tormented, with threats to arrest, torture, and murder the wives and children of prisoners being encouraged, so long as they were never actually carried out. To a prisoner who was being tortured and beaten daily, however, such threats were likely completely believable. Prisoners who were deemed uncooperative during their interrogation were taken to a special punishment cell, where they were stripped naked and repeatedly doused with freezing cold water. The punishment would continue for weeks, even as temperatures outside dipped well below freezing. Prisoners were also handcuffed back to back and forced to stand in front of open windows in the middle of winter. Frostbite became extremely common, and many prisoners lost several toes and fingers, as well as a more delicate appendage due to the torture. One victim of the cold water treatment was an anti-Nazi who had already spent 2 years in a Gestapo prison camp. After the British prison was broken up and its survivors sent for medical treatment, he would be checked into a hospital where he weighed barely more than a skeleton. This former anti-Nazi would go on to say that during his imprisonment by the Gestapo, he had never undergone treatment like he received at the hands of the British. One NKVD officer captured and interrogated by the British at the Bad Nendorf camp claimed that he had been strung up by his wrists during his interrogations, and weights were added to his legs. His toenails were ripped out, and British officers would beat him with rubber truncheons. While Inspector Hayward's investigation would not find evidence to support this, the dozens of skeleton-like inmates that were taken for medical treatment after the camp's closure in 1947 attest to the very real possibility that this story was as true as many of the other verified accounts of torture. The investigation into Bad Nendorf would eventually lead to the court-martial of Commanding Officer Colonel Tin-Eye Stevens, as well as Captain John Smith, the camp's medical officer, and interrogator Lieutenant Richard Langham. Many of the guards and interrogators who had carried out beatings and other punishments were given pardons in exchange for evidence or testimony against their former officers. The trials were held completely in secret, and to this day, the British government refuses to allow for the publication of photos of the inmates as they were being rescued from the camp. Information can be difficult to ascertain on this secret British torture camp, and given the extremes of the abuses that took place there, it's not surprising at all that the British government would continue to keep a very tight lid on one of the most shameful chapters of its post-World War II history. After Bad Nendorf was closed, another British interrogation center was opened at the military base at Gütersloh. The inmates were suspected Soviet spies, and when it was demanded that drastic methods such as those used at Bad Nendorf should not be used, its commanding officer complained that if each prisoner was to have his or her arrest justified and that torture was not used, then there was little point in having an interrogation center at all. A statement that perhaps best exemplifies the British attitude on torture in the years after World War II. In the end, 372 men and 44 women would pass through the Bad Nendorf interrogation center, with many dying from starvation, exposure, or torture. The atrocities had been preceded by an interrogation center in London known as the London Cage, where German POWs had been beaten, deprived of sleep, and even threatened with execution. As terrible as the abuses of London Cage were discovered to be, however, Bad Nendorf would stand in a league of its own, and as a shocking contradiction to the idea of a democracy-loving Britain fighting to conquer the worst evils Europe has ever endured.
A group of POWs huddles for warmth in a dense, wet jungle. They haven't eaten in days and are dying from disease and are still forced to work 12-hour shifts by their Japanese captors. As they try to get some rest before another grueling day begins, they hear the screams of one of their comrades. They close their eyes and pray that the soldiers don't come for them next. Every night someone is taken, and the smell of burnt flesh fills the air. The fire where the meat is cooked casts long dark shadows through the trees of the jungle as another human being is eaten by cannibals. War can turn men into monsters. Perhaps there's no better example of this than World War II.
In Europe, the Nazis were murdering Jews and people who didn't fit into their ideology by the millions. In the Pacific Theater, countless war crimes were committed by both sides, and it was here that a gruesome secret would be uncovered after the war ended. Not only were POWs being mistreated and tortured, but in some cases they were being eaten by other humans. We're about to investigate several cases of cannibalism during World War II. You might want to prepare yourself to be shocked and appalled, because there are no happy endings to these stories. On September 2, 1944, a squadron of American torpedo bombers flew towards Chichijima Island, located south of the main island of Japan. Each aircraft carried a crew of 3. As they approached the island, anti-aircraft guns let loose. Explosions filled the sky as shrapnel flew in every direction. A heroic pilot tried to evade the Japanese countermeasures, but the belly of his plane was struck by an enemy shell. There was a jolt through the aircraft as the engine began to fail. The pilot shouted back to the rest of the crew that they were going down. Before the plane went into a nosedive, the crew was able to drop their payload of 4 500-pound bombs. Their mission was complete, and they now needed to evacuate the aircraft, or they'd be killed on impact. The turquoise waters of the ocean could be seen on the horizon as the plane fell from the sky. There was no time to think. The crew strapped on their parachutes and jumped out of the aircraft while they were still over the island. The pilot kept the plane as level as possible so his crew had the best chance of making it out and deploying their chute safely. Once the last crew member was out, the pilot could bail. He was now over the ocean, but he had no other choice. In a split-second decision that would save his life, the pilot opened the cockpit and jumped. He landed in the waves of the ocean and engaged his life preserver. The plane continued gliding for a few more seconds, smoke streaming from its wings, and then crashed into the waters of the Pacific Ocean. The pilot looked to the sky and watched as his crew's parachutes descended toward the island of Chichijima and disappeared into its jungle. When the crew of the aircraft landed, they unclipped their parachutes and slowly made their way through the thick foliage. Unfortunately, the island was controlled by the Japanese, and enemy soldiers quickly located them. They held the American soldiers at gunpoint and led them to their encampment. It was there that the POWs were tied up and held captive. As the sun rose the next day, the Japanese soldiers began to torture the Americans for information. The war in the Pacific had been raging for almost 3 years, and both sides were looking for any advantage they could get. Throughout the war, POWs had been mistreated by Allied and Axis powers in an attempt to uncover valuable info, but this Japanese regiment would take things to a whole new level. The American airmen were stabbed with bamboo spikes, waterboarded, and beaten mercilessly. They didn't give up any information and refused to help the Japanese, which would cost them their lives. When the Japanese soldiers realized they would never get the information they wanted out of the Americans, they cut off their heads. The American soldiers' heroic actions would not become known until their remains were later found and their terrible fate discovered. It's unknown how much food the Japanese soldiers had on the island, but many claim that they were by no means starving, as there were plenty of resources available. This makes what happened next difficult to comprehend. When Allied forces took the island, the Japanese were forced to surrender. When the island was scouted and secured, the Allies found the remains of American soldiers that had been butchered and eaten. It was clear that the flesh had been cut from their bodies due to the knife marks on the bones. Japanese Admiral Kenisu Mori would later testify that their chef had pierced the livers of the American soldiers with bamboo sticks and cooked them with soy sauce and vegetables. It's been hypothesized by some that in certain Japanese belief systems, the liver is the part of the body where courage and power come from. By eating the liver of enemy soldiers, some Japanese military leaders believed that they would be given the power to defeat their adversaries. However, the liver was not the only part of the POWs that was eaten. Other Japanese soldiers stated that their commanding officer, Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, ordered them to consume the flesh of 4 American soldiers who had landed on the island. The most disturbing part of all was that this was not an isolated incident. It's not totally clear what the motives behind the cannibalism on Chichijima were. Some of the soldiers who ate the human flesh might have been starving, but several accounts do suggest that the Japanese officers planned this human sacrifice on the island. Either way, 8 men who crashed on Chichijima were all killed, and at least 4 of them were consumed by Japanese soldiers. The day the plane went down over Chichijima, the pilot who bailed out just before the aircraft hit the ocean watched his crew land on the hostile island. When their parachutes disappeared into the jungle canopy, he began looking around for any form of rescue. There appeared to be nothing else around but waves and the debris from crashed aircraft as far as the eye could see. The current dragged him further and further out to sea. Suddenly, something started to bubble from below. The ocean's waters began to swirl all around them. It was as if a giant creature were ascending from the depths to eat him. The pilot tried desperately to swim away just as the top of a submarine broke the water's surface. It was the USS Finback. The submarine had been dispatched to find survivors from planes that had crashed during the air raid. Filled with joy, the pilot began swimming toward the finback. He was worried about his crew, but there was nothing he could do for them at the moment. As sailors aboard the submarine pulled the pilot into their vessel, they asked what his name was. George H.W. Bush, the man replied. Unknown to everyone on board, they just rescued the future 41st President of the United States of America. George Bush continued on with the crew of the USS Finback to rescue more downed airmen, but the fate of the men aboard the plane wouldn't be known until years later. It wasn't until a researcher put all the pieces together and presented them to the former president in 2003 that Bush found out the gruesome fate he was saved from the day his plane crashed just off the island of Shishijima. This wasn't the only time that American soldiers would be tortured and eaten by the enemy. In another true horror story, 2 members of a downed B-29 bomber were captured and brought to a medical facility where they would undergo medical experiments. One medical student who was stationed at the facility recounted later that the men were brought into the lab blindfolded. They'd been injured when the bomber crashed and were led to believe that they were at the hospital to have their wounds treated. However, nothing could have been further from the truth. One of the U.S. soldiers was injected with salt water to see what effects it would have on the body. The other had his chest cut open and a lung removed. The doctors wanted to know how the respiratory system would respond with only one lung. These were only 2 of many medical experiments that were done on prisoners of war at the time. The most disgusting part is that some of the organs and body parts that were removed may have then been eaten by hungry Japanese soldiers. The war had taken a psychological and physical toll on many. Cannibalism was not an isolated incident, and it did not just happen on one island. In fact, there were accounts of cannibalism across the entire Pacific theater during the time, and each instance was more terrifying than the last. After the war, the atrocities of the Japanese Suzuki unit stationed in the Philippines were uncovered. The Suzuki unit was deployed into the Bukidnon region of the southern Philippines at the beginning of the war. Their mission was to combat any American or Filipino resistance forces in the region. Every day was hot and humid. The Japanese soldiers hiding in the jungles of the Philippine mountains would lose large amounts of water through sweat each day and expend vast amounts of energy just trying to hold their position. It was a brutal environment, and one that likely drove many soldiers crazy. The bugs would constantly be biting, and diseases would make life absolutely miserable. When the Suzuki unit had been deployed, they had only enough rations and resources to last them several weeks. But as the fighting continued and supply routes were cut off, they found themselves foraging for food and stealing from local villages in the mountains. As they continued to fight Allied forces, more and more Japanese soldiers started dying from malaria and dehydration from diarrhea. It was determined by doctors in the unit that the only way the men could stay healthy enough to keep fighting was if they had a constant source of protein. Unfortunately, this was hard to come by in the dense jungles of Bukidnon. The Japanese had killed and eaten local farmers' pigs, livestock, and chickens, and now the only source of protein left were bugs and other humans. The Japanese started to eat the bodies of prisoners who died from illness or injuries. There were also cases of POWs being executed for trying to escape and then immediately being flayed and cooked to feed the Japanese troops. In testimonies by Japanese soldiers, they described in detail how they would sometimes have to sneak into nearby Filipino villages in order to find the victims to cannibalize. In the cover of night, Japanese soldiers would enter a village. If there was someone out alone, they would come up behind them and render them unconscious with the butt of their gun before they could alert others in the village that something was wrong. The soldiers would then bring the victim back to camp, where they would cut meat from their skeleton and eat it to obtain the protein they needed. The human flesh would often be boiled with vegetables. Other times, it would be left out in the sun to be cured. The Suzuki unit's cannibalistic activity was likely done exclusively to stay alive, although surrendering might have been a better option in hindsight. When American forces captured the Suzuki unit and entered their camp, they were horrified at what they found. The human flesh was still in the process of being cooked, and human skeletal remains littered the ground. It became clear very quickly that the Japanese soldiers had been surviving off of human meat for some time. When the remains were examined, it appeared that many of the humans who had been consumed were Filipinos. 9 members of the Japanese unit were sentenced to death for their actions. However, many more likely ate human flesh at the time to keep from starving to death. Surrender was not an option for the Japanese, as they would rather fight to the death than surrender to the Americans and dishonor their country. This was true even if it meant hiding in the jungle and living off human flesh for years. Before World War II officially broke out in the Pacific, Japanese forces had been securing as many strategic points as possible. One of these places was Papua New Guinea. Japanese troops were sent to the region relatively early on in the conflict to establish airfields and naval ports to make attacking Australia possible. The Japanese captured soldiers from India, Singapore, and other parts of Asia who were aiding the Allied forces, many of which were then forced to build the wartime infrastructure Japan needed in Papua New Guinea. As Allied forces started gaining ground in the region, Japanese forces retreated further and further into dense jungles. They would take their prisoners with them to aid in building new encampments. Again, surrender was not an option for these Japanese soldiers, so they continued to fight even though the territory was all but lost. They eventually became cut off from supply lines, and no reinforcements would be able to reach them. As food ran out, the Japanese soldiers looked for other sources of protein. They originally tried hunting the Aboriginal people of Papua New Guinea, but quickly found out that they were too hard to capture since they knew the land better than anyone. They also tried killing Australian soldiers as a source of sustenance, but this proved to be too difficult as well, so they turned to the prisoners under their control. The Japanese needed them for manual labor, but the intense hunger pains began to overpower any rational thoughts. One Pakistani corporal who survived being a prisoner in Papua New Guinea recounted that toward the end of the war, Japanese soldiers were killing and eating one prisoner a day. The horrifying thing was that this lasted for around 100 days. It's highly likely that over 100 people were eaten by the Japanese soldiers in Papua New Guinea alone. But it gets worse. The other prisoners would watch each night as one of them was selected to be sacrificed so their Japanese captors could satisfy their hunger. The survivor said that whoever was chosen would be taken to a small hut where their screams could be heard echoing through the jungle. It appeared that they would be flayed alive. Those who survived having parts of their legs and arms cut off would then be thrown into a ditch, where they would bleed out as they prayed for death. When the Japanese soldiers were questioned about their decisions, some startling information came forth. The cannibalism was most often done for survival reasons, but not always. During one soldier's trial, he said that when he had killed and eaten an Australian soldier, it was for two reasons. The first was because he was starving, but the second and more sinister reason was that he had an intense hatred for the enemy. As horrendous and vile as these accounts are, it's important to remember that not every Japanese soldier was engaged in cannibalism. These were isolated incidents. On top of that, most would never have eaten another human if they were not dying from starvation. Early on in the war, intense bombings and fighting occurred within Australia and the surrounding region. The Japanese first attacked the mainland of Australia in February of 1942, when they bombed Darwin and Broome. By the next year, the Japanese had conducted 97 different air raids on the country. During this time, Japanese midget submarines were also entering Sydney Harbor and shelling the suburbs surrounding the city. The Australian military would capture the midget subs every once in a while, but whenever they opened the hatch, the two Japanese soldiers inside would be dead from self-inflicted gunshot wounds to keep them from being captured. It was when the Australians started pushing the Japanese back toward Asia that they uncovered the cannibalism of their own people. Australian troops would advance from one island to the next, making sure they were clear of any enemy presence. When they came to the larger islands of Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, they were met by heavier resistance. It was also here that they would come across abandoned Japanese encampments with human remains scattered around. Oftentimes, the bones showed signs of being butchered. Toward the end of the war, the Japanese soldiers that were left to fend for themselves became desperate. It's in the camps of these soldiers that more signs of cannibalism were found. As Australian soldiers and other Allied forces worked their way through the Pacific Islands and came across Japanese camps, they noted that several contained the remains of captured Australian soldiers. However, the only thing left of them were their hands and feet. Everything else had been eaten. So it would appear that cannibalism was happening all throughout the Pacific theater by groups of Japanese soldiers. It wasn't done by everyone, but some soldiers who were desperate to survive turned to cannibalism as a means to an end. As crazy as it sounds, eating another human was a better option than surrendering to some Japanese soldiers. That being said, the Japanese were not the only ones who engaged in cannibalism during World War II. When it comes to survival or death, people will do almost anything to stay alive. At the siege of Leningrad, starving people were seen eating the remains of the dead. It was cold, nothing would grow, and no supplies could enter the city. The only way to survive at that point was to eat anything that contained nutrients, including humans. There were even accounts of people cutting off their own flesh and consuming it, as hunger overcame rational thought. Another example happened after the Battle of Stalingrad, where around 100,000 German soldiers were captured. They were sent to Siberia and Central Asia, where they were held in POW camps. The Soviets had very little sympathy for the Germans and didn't provide them with enough food or water. This led to the Germans resorting to cannibalism of their fallen comrades in order to make it through the brutal winters while locked up in the Soviet camps. To paint a picture of how dire the situation was for the Germans, out of the 100,000 that were captured, only around 5,000 survived until the end of the war. In the independent state of Croatia, which was set up and ruled as a Nazi puppet state, a number of concentration and death camps were established to carry out Hitler's final solution. It was here that the fascist Ustasha organization committed genocide against the Serbs and countless Jews to advance the Nazi agenda. It was recorded that when the Ustashas would slash the throats of their victims, they would hold a cup up to their neck to collect blood as it flowed out of the wound. The members of the Ustashas would then drink the blood in a ritualistic fashion. This brings us back to the point that not all cannibalism during World War II was for survival purposes. There are some that believe there might have been a cannibalistic cult-like understanding between certain officers in the Japanese military. There are several accounts given by different Japanese soldiers that said they were forced to consume human flesh and liver by their superior officers. In these situations, the men were not starving, and if they refused to eat the flesh of their enemy, they would have been chastised by their superiors. In extreme circumstances, soldiers were even physically forced to eat the human meat. It was said that officers who made their soldiers eat human flesh connected it back to the Sino-Japanese War that had taken place years earlier. Many of the imperial troops would regularly consume the flesh of their enemies to make them invincible in battle. Some of the higher-ups who were forcing their men to eat human meat in World War II had fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War, which had begun in 1937. And if you don't believe the Japanese and Allied soldiers' accounts of the events, there's a very blatant line of evidence that makes it clear cannibalism was a problem during World War II in the Pacific. A secret Imperial Army order was given on November 18, 1944 that directly addressed the problem of Japanese troops engaging in cannibalism. You might think it would directly condemn them, but that's not quite the case. In the address, the Imperial Government of Japan informed the troops that cannibalism was punishable by death. The caveat here was that cannibalizing an enemy was completely fine. The government was not promoting cannibalism as the order mentioned eating humans as being the worst human crime, and that it was due to a lack of thoroughness and moral training. However, as long as it was the enemy being eaten, it was not punished as a crime. At the end of the war, many Japanese soldiers and officers who were found to have engaged in cannibalism were tried for war crimes and sentenced to death. The Japanese government does not allow this part of Japanese history to be taught or discussed in public as it's deemed too sensitive. Scholars who wish to publish information about the atrocities that happened during World War II have to leave Japan to do so. This is why several Japanese historians have sought jobs in Australia and at other universities around the world so they can accurately write about this time in history. It also cannot be overstated that cannibalism by Japanese troops was not the norm. There might have been a cult among certain military leaders that incorporated the ritualistic eating of the liver, but that has not been proven. Most soldiers who did engage in cannibalism did so to stay alive, just like many people have done throughout history in dire situations. The Japanese people were never a society of cannibals, and the atrocities that happened in World War II were never part of the Japanese culture.
Hitler had his concentration camps, Stalin had his gulags, and North Korea has its dreaded labor camps. Every evil dictatorship has historically had a place to send any dissidents or perceived enemies of the state. And while many horror stories have circulated about the cruelty and brutality of North Korea's prison camps, exact details have been hard to confirm due to the secretive nature of the Hermit Kingdom. Yet as more North Koreans escape the brutal regime, never before heard details paint a grim picture of life inside one of the most hellish places on Earth. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're going to remind you to be grateful that you live a comfortable first world life as we answer the question, what do we know about North Korean labor camps? For most of our viewers, watching our show is nothing but an afterthought. But did you know that in North Korea, watching the Infographics Show can get you sent straight to a labor camp for 10 years? Not just our show, of course, but anything on the public internet. In fact, just owning a computer can be offense enough to warrant a trip to a labor camp, as computer ownership requires explicit permission from the government itself. And if you want to cruise the internet, you'll have to make do with a state-operated intranet, with internet access afforded only to government personnel. Anyone caught circumventing this ban is going to earn themselves a one-way trip to the modern gulag. But don't worry, because you won't be lonely in your new prison home. And that's thanks to North Korean founder Kim Il-sung's belief that evil could only be expunged from a family if you punished 3 generations of that family. So if your dad gets sent to a prison camp, then you're going right along with him, along with your sister, mom, and any immediate family, even if you're the model North Korean citizen. Then if you have a child in prison, that child will live out his or her days in that prison as well. But what is life like inside the prison camps? And what do they do exactly? Well, as many dictators have found throughout history, locking up dissidents is a pretty okay solution, and executing them outright is even better. However, why just lock them up or kill them when you can capitalize on the free labor that a prison population affords? Stalin most famously put tens of thousands of gulag prisoners to work in the Soviet Union in a bid to modernize his nation. In fact, Soviet political prisoners built much of modern Russia's infrastructure.
to include the famous Moscow Canal, which was built by 200,000 prisoners, many of which died from the extreme conditions. Today, you can even take a romantic cruise down the Moscow Canal, literally sailing over the buried remains of slaves and on waters tamed by pure human misery. Just the thing to really set the mood. For North Korea, free labor is a very appealing prospect, especially since the nation is so economically impoverished. Prison laborers are often used in North Korea's mining industry, working without power tools and usually just pickaxes and shovels, and with absolutely zero safety regulations. Prisoners also farm food which is sent to Pyongyang, though of course they're not allowed to eat any of it, and if caught, they can be shot. Many camps include consumer goods such as furniture which goes on sale in Pyongyang department stores, while others create building materials to be used around the country. While this free labor pool must seem like a pretty convenient system for North Korea's dictators, the reality is that study after study shows that slave labor is far more inefficient than paid labor, and in actuality often costs more both in direct cost of security and in lost revenue due to inefficiency. Russia's famous Moscow Canal is estimated to have actually cost Russia millions of rubles due to the poor workmanship and slow progress of slave labor. So what are the conditions actually like inside the camp? Thankfully, the flood of North Korean defectors has revealed the secrets of these literal hells on earth. First, the camps resemble villages more than actual camps, with guards and their families living next to the camp itself. While some are fenced, many are not, and the extreme remoteness and hostile terrain coupled with the terrible nutrition of its prisoners is often enough to keep people from trying to flee. Then there's also the fact that guards will shoot on sight if anyone even appears to be running away, and if they can't catch you, they'll kill your family members which are left behind. Though guards are extremely motivated to catch prisoners because often if a runaway succeeds in escaping, the guards themselves will be executed, all in the name of preventing the secrets of forced labor camps from escaping the country. Guards themselves routinely physically and sexually abuse prisoners. Rape is rampant, and much like in the Soviet Gulag, female prisoners may trade sexual favors for a few bits more to eat, or simply be forced into the act by a guard. Prisoners are routinely beaten for even the most minor infractions, though the abuse isn't limited just to the guards. Because the families of guards often live at the camps themselves as well, family members happily get in on the abuse. One prisoner at a mining camp explained how family members of prison guards would order miners to kneel before them with their mouths open, and then they would spit phlegm directly into their mouths. If a prisoner spit it out, they would be beaten. But this prisoner said that you would gag immediately upon receiving a big wad of mucus in your mouth, which would be excuse enough for the tormentor to beat you. Sometimes though, the beatings come from your fellow prisoners. One prisoner recounts how she and several other prisoners were forced to sit in the lotus position and not allowed to move or stretch their limbs. After several hours of this, someone would inevitably move, which prompted the guards to order the other prisoners to beat this person. Grateful for the opportunity to stretch their own limbs, the prisoners would beat the offending prisoner mercilessly, knowing this was the only exercise they would get. Letting prisoners punish themselves is a favorite tactic for prison guards, and often prisoners would be punished as a group for the offenses of just one prisoner. One former prisoner explained how guards would withhold food, or in winter would not provide heating, nor allow the prisoners to build a fire. The stressed and angry prisoners would then vent their frustration on the offending prisoner, often beating them to death. Sanitation is all but non-existent in the camps, and running water is not available at all, even for the plumbing. One prisoner explained how prisoners would collect their own urine, which they would then use as water to soften their hardened stool, which they rubbed and pressed by hand. Then, they would roll up their clothes and hammer the softened stool down the drain, and after which would have to use the remaining urine to wash the stool off their hands. This would inevitably lead to rashes and infection, and many died from the unsanitary conditions. The lack of sanitation extended to field work as well, with one prisoner explaining how they were forced to take their own diarrhea and use it to fertilize the corn they grew. However, the guards insisted that they do so with their rice bowls, which they ate off of. They would only have ditch water with which to rinse their bowls in, and then at lunchtime would have to eat off that same bowl. Not that there's much food for prisoners to eat anyways. Prisoners are served 3 meals a day, but meals typically consist of around 150 corn kernels that are lightly salted. Prisoners will then supplement their diets any way possible, and one prisoner recalled how despite the unsanitary conditions, there were no rats or insects to be found inside the prison because the prisoners ate them all. Dragonflies, butterflies, and pretty much anything that flew into the camp was caught and eaten, with pregnant rats being a delicacy because of the fetuses the rats carried inside it. Sometimes prisoners will light small fires with which to cook their caught rats or lizards, but if caught, they could be severely beaten by the guards. Therefore, most prisoners simply ripped their meals apart with their own hands and let the meat dry, then ate it raw. The forced labor in a camp typically consists of a 16-hour workday, matched by a quota that each prisoner was expected to achieve. This could be anything from pull X amount of weeds or mine X amount of coal, and if quotas were not met, then prisoners would forego food. Without food, prisoners would grow weaker, and thus new quotas would be even harder to achieve. Eventually, prisoners would simply starve to death. For prisoners, labor starts as young as elementary school age, and children to send into the mines or harvest lumber are in no short supply, thanks to the 3 generations rule. While on the job, injuries are common, with medical treatment completely non-existent. If you weren't cured by a folk remedy, then you would likely die, and injuries were no excuse for slacking off. Quotas would not change depending on your health, and thus starvation also adds to the cause of death for injured workers. After 16 or more hours of hard labor, prisoners can expect 2 hours of recreational time, during which their recreation consists of memorizing and reciting the camp's rules and regulations. If a single prisoner makes a mistake or fails to memorize the rules, his or her entire section is forced to start from scratch and continue until everyone can recite the rules perfectly. This cuts into sleep time, and with labor starting as early as 5 a.m., sleep is a precious commodity. Yet one prisoner who fled to the south explained how nighttime was the worst time of all. Prisoners were stuffed into small cells, 20 apiece, and sometimes you didn't have enough room to stretch your legs. Men and women were separated, though mothers were allowed to nurse babies. Prisoners would wail in pain as their bodies broke down from starvation, and women could be heard screaming, as nighttime was when the guards would come to round up women to be raped. Not just women though, children would also be rounded up for rape and torture, all as part of entertainment for the prison officials. Pregnancies were sometimes brought to term, with the baby growing up a prisoner, but often pregnant women or girls were simply beaten until they had a miscarriage. If prisoners misbehave or dare to rebel, they're severely punished, not just with beatings, which are routine, but with far worse punishments. One prisoner recalls how his camp had a special area for those being punished by the guards. This consisted of a specially tiny cell, where a prisoner could hardly move. The prisoner would be forced to sit in cold, muddy water for days or weeks at a time. If they survived the ordeal, prisoners would leave with their flesh rotting off their body. North Korea's labor camps are a blight on the face of humanity entering the 21st century, hellholes of human rights abuses. They're a reminder that despite the gleaming societies of the glowing list of first world nations, there still exists medieval dictatorships built on foundations of pure evil. The Kim family is but one of many of humanity's most vile dynasties, but these chubby, overweight dictators are a true blight on a world that has worked hard to leave its barbaric roots behind. If you ask us, Kim Jong-un needs to choke on a cheeseburger and leave this world behind already. How would you survive in a North Korean labor camp? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video, A Day in the Life of North Korean Dictator Kim Jong-un. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.